Hello everyone, if you're new to my channel, consider liking and subscribing. It will make me feel wonderful if you do that. Thanks. By the way, I also have another Naruto and Luffy fanfiction channel. If you are interested, link is in the description. The Devil Wears White. The ASL trio have been kidnapped, taken to a place that people only see in their nightmares. Children are tested on and lives are thrown away carelessly. How will they escape? If they do, who can they trust? And what's with these strange new powers? Now this is the season 1 of this fanfiction. It will have a season 2 where the same Luffy starts his adventure as from East Blue like in canon, but stronger and experienced. I don't own anything, adios.
The next day Ace and Sabo found it extremely hard to keep Luffy from running off to the island first thing. As much as they all wanted to go to the island, they still had to eat breakfast. Not to mention, check in with Whitebeard to see who was being assigned what today. Marco had promised they would be free to go exploring today, but sometimes it was inevitable that they had to be pulled in to do something, whether they had plans to explore or not. Breakfast seemed to drag on for Luffy, who was a bundle of excited energy. He ate quickly, finishing his many plates within minutes, but even then he knew he still had to wait. Ace still had a couple more plates to go and Sabo had barely finished his first plate. It was practically excruciating for the boy to sit at the table, just waiting to go explore the awesome-looking forest on the island. The commanders and Whitebeard watched with knowing smiles, all of them waiting for the moment that Luffy's patience would give out and the young teen would rocket himself over to the island, regardless of the procedure they had on the Moby. Ace and Sabo, however, didn't want to let that happen and were instead focusing just as much attention on eating as they were to keeping Luffy in his seat, one of them grabbing the youngest's hands every time he attempted to bolt off and out of the galley. As funny as it would be, it would also mean that they would lose Luffy to the forest of the island and it would be much too difficult to find him, even with their enhanced senses. Eventually, everyone finished and the crew gathered out on the deck, waiting to hear what Whitebeard would say. Luffy, of course, was bouncing where he stood in between Ace and Sabo, waiting for the second Whitebeard stopped talking to run off to the striker. Even if he couldn't power the boat himself, he was sure he'd be able to figure something out if he was desperate enough. Whitebeard announced that they had everything they needed and that today was a day of relaxation. Anyone welcome to go to the island if they wanted. When he finished speaking, Luffy cheered, grabbing Ace and Sabo's hands and dragging them towards the stairs to head toward the striker. "Nay, Luffy," Marco called, stopping them from progressing and causing Luffy to groan. "Marco, you promised," Luffy whined as he turned to look at the first commander. The man was smiling and Luffy could feel the amusement coming from him, telling the team that he was finding something funny. "You're right, I was just going to say have fun, and be safe, yoy. No getting into trouble," Marco said, sternly at the end, though still light-heartedly. Luffy blinked while Ace and Sabo laughed, and then the youngest beamed, nodding. Tell Thatch to make a big dinner for when we get back," Luffy called as he began dragging Ace and Sabo once again, not even waiting for a response. Once they were below deck, it didn't take too long for the three to prepare the striker and be on their way. Like yesterday, they beached the striker, though this time they did it much closer to the trees than they had yesterday. They planned on spending a lot more time here today, the whole day most likely, so they didn't want to take any chances in losing the striker. Once that was done, they were off, the three of them charging off into the forest. While those on the Moby who were coming to visit the island were only just leaving, the brothers were already beginning their adventure in the giant expanse of forest. Luffy, of course, was adamant about finding the tallest tree. In the journey to find said tree, however, he was content to run around and explore with Ace and Sabo. Most of the island was trees, the town to the west being the only other thing they'd seen so far. The forest was dense and even Ace had difficulty seeing much further ahead than where they were already standing. Everywhere he looked his vision was blocked by another tree, but that didn't deter them. If anything, it made them all that much more excited to explore the unknown forest. Luffy managed to scramble his way up to the top of his current tree, and once he had a better vantage point of the forest. He wasn't able to see the ocean, they were now too far into the forest for that, and the tree he had climbed wasn't the tallest by far, many of the surrounding trees towering over his. Undeterred still, Luffy jumped over to another, taller tree and climbed that one. "Oi, Luffy, don't go too far ahead, alright?" he heard Ace shout to him from his tree below him. He turned and gave a thumbs up that he knew Ace would see while telling Sabo he wouldn't go too far. Even if he could just follow his brother's waves right back to them, he wouldn't go and get himself lost on purpose. Even if that tree over there looked pretty tall, his new tree was tall, taller than his last, but yet again, not the tallest. He had promised he wouldn't go too far ahead though, so he waited for Ace and Sabo to catch up before jumping over to the next tallest tree that he could see. And so it went for the next few hours. Luffy, on the hunt for the tallest tree, jumped from tree to tree, each one taller than the last, yet not the tallest of them all. Eventually, Sabo called up to him and told him they should take a break for lunch, and by taking a break, he meant go and hunt. This was fine by both Ace and Luffy, the two scrambling down their trees simultaneously towards their blonde brother. The thought of hunting was always tempting to the three brothers, especially since it reminded them of easier, Better days back on their home island, hunting giant animals in their jungle. The animals on this island were tiny in comparison, easy to defeat, but their meat tasted the same. With a practiced routine, the brothers took down animal after animal, though were careful not to kill too many so as to deplete the forest's natural predators and leave the townspeople here without food. Starting a fire proved more difficult than they thought it would, seeing as they were surrounded by such a dense forest. There was no clearing that they could find that was big enough to safely start a fire, and because of that, the trio had to make their own clearing. Between exploring, hunting, and clearing their own patch of land, the brothers had worked themselves into a ravenous hunger. The second an animal was cleaned and cooked, it disappeared in one of the trio's mouths, barely filling their bottomless appetites. The three sat around the fire, eating animal after animal, and before they knew it, the food was gone and they were satiated. It was nostalgic as the three laid on the ground, all of them around the fire that they were letting burn itself out. Looking up through the surrounding trees' leaves, they could see the bright blue sky, a few clouds dotting it. Bones were scattered around them, as well as the remains of the trees they'd knocked down, and each of them had stomachs full of delicious meat. It brought back memories that they hadn't thought about in a long time. With the whole facility thing, the trauma, being constantly hunted by the Marines over something that they had had no control over, they hadn't had much time to just sit and enjoy the peace and calm of being out, being free. Sure, over the year of being with the Whitebeards crew they had had times where they could reflect back, where they could realize they were truly out, but it hadn't ever felt real. All of their sessions with whiskey had been in an attempt to get the brothers to see that the doctors, the Marines, had no control over them anymore. The only ones who could control them were themselves, and that had been the hardest lesson for the brothers to learn. Sitting there in the forest, only the three of them, no one there to tell them what to do, it finally sunk in for them that they didn't have to let the memories of the facility hold them down. "Wanna spar?" Ace asked quietly, not wanting to speak too loud in case he accidentally broke the quiet, peaceful air around them. "Yeah," Luffy cheered, obviously not as concerned about being quiet as Ace was. That would be, smiling softly as he spoke. Ace smiled as well, taking in the now fleeting peace while he could, before sitting upright. "Luffy, go take some of the bark off that tree over there. And take this," Ace said, tossing Luffy the dagger he always had strapped to his belt. Luffy caught it easily and nodded, heading off to one of the upright trees and stripping the bark off of it before unsheathing the dagger and carving into the tree. Sabo stood slowly, taking his time as he brushed the dirt and leaves off his clothes. He unstrapped his pipe from his back and twirled it between his hands a few times before eyeing Ace. "You didn't want to spar with Luffy first?" he asked with a grin, to which Ace rolled his eyes. "When he's got that much energy, nah, I'll let you fight him first," Ace said as he walked to go sit where Luffy had finished carving their initials into the tree, lines dividing them up evenly. "So you're a jerk and you're lazy," Sabo teased, noticing that Ace had had Luffy draw up their scoreboard for him. "Like I said, too much energy." He was happy to do it, right Lou? Ace asked, nudging Luffy who nodded, still beaming. "Alright, you know the rules still, right Luffy?" Sabo asked as he crouched down into a fighting position. "Yup," Luffy chirped, also lowering in preparation. "On my mark," Ace announced, watching as his brothers tensed in anticipation. "Go," he shouted. Luffy was the first to attack, drawing his fist back and flinging it Sabo's way. The blonde blocked it with his pipe though, sending it recoiling back to Luffy instead. It was a stark contrast to their past spars on their home island where Luffy could barely aim straight, much less handle his own punches' recoils, but now he did it without even blinking, sending another flurry of attacks at Sabo, though never gaining much ground against his older brother. As Ace had predicted though, Luffy had too much energy for his own good and he very nearly managed to win a few of his fights against Sabo. It didn't matter though, because all of the fights were his loss, Sabo being the inevitable winner of the two each and every time. Ace handed the dagger over to Sabo who took it, sweating a bit after his fights with Luffy. "We can't let Luffy get this much pent-up energy again," Sabo vowed, dropping to sit against the tree. Ace snickered at his brother before facing Luffy who still looked ready to go, not even sweating in the slightest as he stood at the ready, waiting for the sparring to resume. With all that had happened in the past few weeks, and this being the first island they docked at since Thatch's attack, it was understandable as to why Luffy would have too much energy that he needed to get out, but that was also why they were doing this. "Well, that and sparring was fun. On my mark," Sabo announced now, pipe lying across his lap. "Go," and off the two went. Luffy just as enthusiastic as before as he belted attack after attack at Ace. Like always, Ace still had the upper hand amongst the two, and no matter how hard Luffy tried he continued to lose fight after fight. "Come on Luffy, you can do better than that," Ace teased as he ducked under another one of Luffy's kicks. Luffy's face grew more serious as he tried even harder to get just one win against his brother, but as he tried throwing another punch, Ace blocked it with his arms, covered in haki, and charged towards him, kicking him and flinging him into a tree. "Looks like another win for Ace," Sabo said from the sidelines, carving the win into the tree under Ace's initial. "Ah, another one," I'll beat you for sure then, Luffy whined as he stood up from the tree, looking as if he hadn't even felt the bone-crushing impact of hitting the tree, and honestly, he hadn't. You know the rules, Luffy, 50 fights each, Ace said. Maybe next time, Sabo said as he walked up, ruffling Luffy's hair. Luffy pouted, but eventually conceded, taking the dagger from Sabo and heading to the tree where he sat, ready to keep score. Of course, the fights between Ace and Sabo were much more evenly matched, and as Luffy gave the go-ahead for each new spar to take place, it became evident to him that his brothers were still too evenly matched. At the end of it all though, Ace managed to pull out a win, putting him 5 ahead of Sabo much to the blonde's disdain. Damn, every time, Sabo said, strapping his pipe back onto his back. Ace grinned triumphantly, fists flying into the air. Yes, still the undefeated champion, Ace called out, fist pumping the air as he gloated. Sabo rolled his eyes while Luffy laughed, enjoying the happy feelings coming from both of his brothers, even if Sabo looked like he wasn't that happy. Yeah, rub it in, why don't you? I wasn't that far behind, Sabo said, crossing his arms over his chest. Whatever helps you sleep at night, man. Ace said, tone gentle as if he was speaking to a child. Sabo glared to his brother but decided to ignore the last comment, turning his attention instead to Luffy. Alright Luffy, let's go find that tall tree of yours, Sabo asked, reminding the youngest of his earlier endeavor. Yeah, let's go, Luffy cheered, climbing back up into the tree and leaving their clearing. Ace was quick to follow, still gloating loudly about his win, while Sabo made sure the fire was really out before following. They didn't wish to accidentally be the cause of a giant forest fire after all. After having determined already that there was almost always a taller tree than the previous one, Luffy decided that the much better idea was to rocket himself straight up from the top of his current tree. Of course, he did this without running the idea by Ace and Sabo, so the two nearly had a heart attack as they watched their youngest brother fling himself straight up into the sky. He was fine, he was rubber after all, but that didn't mean there was a split second in the brothers' thinking where they believed Luffy was a normal human who was going to be seriously injured falling from that height. We need to teach him not to do that, Ace said, eyes wide as he watched Luffy carefully with his enhanced vision. Good luck with that. Luffy does what Luffy wants, Sabo said, though his eyes were just as wide and his heart was beating fast. Hey, you guys, I think I saw it. The biggest tree, Luffy called as he began falling back down. Before they could worry about whether Luffy was going to attempt to save himself from falling to the ground, they watched him stretch his arms, grabbing onto the top of a nearby tree and flinging over to it. Luffy, don't go flinging yourself into the air like that, alright? Sabo called over to him in a vain attempt to save them from future heart attacks. What? Why? Luffy asked in confusion, not understanding why he couldn't do it. It had given him the desired results. He knew where the tree was now, and he hadn't gotten hurt, so what was the issue? Just tell us next time you're about to do something like that, alright? Ace called over instead, still not sure why this was a big deal. Luffy shrugged and agreed before heading off towards the tree. Oh yeah, I think I saw a clearing too, too bad, 'cause we made our own. Luffy called back to his brothers who weren't too far behind him. Really? That's cool. Was it big? Sabo asked, launching himself from branch to branch. Yeah, I couldn't really see it, but it looked big, Luffy said, only having gotten a fleeting look at the clearing, more focused on the tree he had been looking for. We could go check it out before we head back to the Moby if it's not too far away, Ace suggested. The brothers agreed to the idea, and soon enough Luffy was climbing what he proclaimed to be the tallest tree in the whole forest. Ace, Sabo, look at me, I'm so high up, I can see the whole island, Luffy said in awe as he looked around, hand shielding his eyes from the bright sunlight shining on him. Oh, there's that clearing I was talking about too, Luffy said, pointing off towards said clearing. Ace and Sabo looked, and even though they weren't in the same tree as Luffy, they were to see it as well. Huh, it looks like there's something in it. A building? Ace asked, more to himself as he inspected the clearing. A building? That far away from the town? Sabo asked in confusion. I don't know, that's what it looks like. It's pretty big, but the trees around it are bigger so I can't really see it that well, Ace said with a shrug. The brothers shared a look before it was decided that they would go check it out. Traveling atop the trees was a much faster way of travel, and within minutes they were close enough for Sabo to hear voices coming from the building, telling him that it wasn't abandoned. There are definitely people there from what I can hear. Lots of them too, Sabo said, eyebrows scrunching in concentration. Getting closer and closer, the sounds cleared until Sabo was able to hear well enough to understand what was being said. As he took in the many conversations taking place, Luffy became increasingly uncomfortable, frowning and hesitating in his swings between trees. Bad feelings, Luffy said simply, shivering as he felt the sudden onslaught of dark feelings coming from the building. It ranged from sadness and fear to even the darkness. What kind of bad feelings? Ace asked. Unbeknownst to him, Sabo was growing paler, eyes widening and dread filling him. People there are scared and in pain and sad, and some of them have the darkness too, Luffy said, stopping completely in his movements, not getting any closer to the building. Ace and Sabo stopped as well, Ace glancing back and forth between Luffy and the building. "Why you guys, I think that building is a facility," Sabo said, voice soft and eyes still wide. Ace and Luffy's eyes both grew wide as well, dread now filling all three of them as they turned to look at the building. "They're talking about tests and test subjects and calling out numbers. I can hear screaming too, and people in pain," Sabo explained, not wanting to jump to conclusions, but feeling an eerie sense of déjà vu listening in on this building. It sounded all too familiar to their own facility. "There's more than one facility?" Ace asked in disbelief, gripping the tree branch he sat on tightly, nearly snapping it in his hands. "I don't know, I don't even know if this is a facility. Maybe it's like back at Fishman Island, where we thought it was a facility and it was just Shirahoshi, but this is almost exactly what our facility sounded like," Sabo said, the fear beginning to creep up on him now. He tried to keep it under control because he could already see that Luffy was breathing much too heavily for his liking, most likely on the verge of a panic attack. Okay, we have to. We should." Ace was at a loss. All their sessions with whiskey, all the time they spent trying to get rid of the facility's control on them, and here they were, finding out there were more than one of the horrid buildings. "Pops. We should go tell Pops," he said after taking a deep breath. Sabo nodded in agreement, but the two were quick to realize that Luffy seemed to be in a state of shock, unresponsive. "Luffy? Oi, Luffy, come on, we're gonna go back to the Moby and tell Pops about this. He'll know what to do," Ace said gently, placing a hand on Luffy's shoulder in an attempt to snap him out of it. It took both Ace and Sabo coaxing the boy for him to finally snap out of it, blinking and breathing heavily as he looked at the two. "It's alright Lou, come on, we're going back to the Moby to tell Pops about this, alright?" Sabo asked soothingly. Luffy nodded, and slowly but surely the three climbed down from the trees, all of them not trusting themselves to not fall out of them. And it had been such a good day too. The walk back to the beach happened in such a blur that the brothers weren't even quite sure how much time had passed. All of them were lost in both their thoughts and their feelings to notice something as fickle as the passing of time. Eventually, though, they were stepping out of the dense forest and onto the soft, uneven ground of the sandy beach, the striker resting exactly where they had left it earlier that day. Like their walk through the forest, getting the striker in the water and beginning their return to the Moby could have taken minutes, or even hours, and the brothers wouldn't have had any clue. When they finally reached the massive ship, however, that blur of time finally broke, and it was as if they were waking up. "Hey, you guys are back earlier than expected," one of the shipwrights said as he continued prepping boats, most likely for anyone who wanted to visit the island they just numbly left. "Do you know where Oyaji and Marco are?" Sabo asked for the brothers, noticing that Luffy still looked in no shape to even be standing and Ace was still too lost in thought to speak. "Yeah, I think they're both out on deck still. The nurses were hounding Pops about resting in his room, but I'm pretty sure he ignored them and is still in his chair. Marco was helping groups that wanted to go relax on the island get sorted and ready to go," the shipwright said, pausing in their work to examine the brothers some more, his eyebrows furrowing in a mixture of confusion and worry. "You three alright? You don't look so good," he said, taking in their pale skin and almost haunted looks. "Why yeah, we're fine, we just need to talk to them about something is all," Sabo replied weakly, and it was obvious his ship brother didn't agree, but he nodded nonetheless, still looking skeptical. "If you say so," he said before returning to his work, eyeing the brothers as they began making their leave. The walk to Whitebeard was made in silence, and even though they passed many of their shipmates, many of which greeted and welcomed the brothers back, they merely ignored them in favor of getting to their father figure faster. They didn't mean or want to be rude, but with the revelations they just had on the island, being rude paled in comparison to the worries they had. Reaching the deck, Ace was quick to spot Whitebeard, sitting in his chair as the shipwright had suspected, and he immediately headed his way. Sabo and Luffy followed behind their eldest brother wordlessly, both of them still processing what they'd seen, heard, and felt. "Welcome back, my sons," Whitebeard greeted as they walked up to him, but within moments his warm smile was turning into a frown of worry once he took in their appearances. "Is everything alright?" he asked. A few of their crew members were watching them, having noticed the brothers' strange demeanor as they walked up to Whitebeard, but once they saw that their captain was handling it they turned away, leaving the brothers to their semi-private conversation. Really though, it could only get so private when you were standing on an open deck with hundreds of pirates milling around you. "Oyaji, Sabo trailed off, his mind not connecting correctly to his tongue, making it difficult to tell Whitebeard everything on his mind at that moment. "We found something. On the island." Ace spoke up instead, voice steely and hard as he clenched his fists tightly, nails biting into his palms and sending spikes of pain through his hands, which he promptly ignored. "What was it?" Whitebeard prodded gently, taking notice of how much this thing the brothers had found was affecting them. "It was a building, out in a clearing opposite of where the town is and surrounded by the forest. We got a little closer to see what it could be and—" Ace stopped speaking, not trusting his voice to continue at that moment. Taking a deep breath and forcing himself to calm down as much as possible, he continued. We think it might be a facility. Ace finished, voice low and quiet now, as if someone might overhear, which was possible out on the deck. Whitebeard's frown deepened, and suddenly the brothers' demeanor made sense to him. Why they would return to the ship hours earlier than they had planned to, why they looked so pale, and most of all why they looked so terrified. The one thing they hated the most, feared the most, could lay on the island they had been exploring only moments earlier. You're sure that is what it was? Whitebeard asked, not because he didn't believe them, but because he wanted to be sure. Not entirely, Sabo said now, his voice also quiet like Ace's had been. We got close enough that I was able to hear what was going on inside, and from the sounds of it, it's definitely a facility, but we weren't close enough for Ace to see anything, Sabo explained. I could feel the bad feelings too, like sadness, and fear, and darkness, Luffy added meekly, eyes trained on the ground as he tried letting Whitebeard's warmth push away all the bad feelings he was experiencing. It didn't help that he was inadvertently letting in both Ace and Sabo's fear and worry as well, only further influencing his own emotions to an unmanageable extent. This is troubling news. We'll have to make sure that this building really is a facility, and if that's the case we should try and help any children who may be inside. Whitebeard said, looking to be thinking deeply now. Luffy, would you mind getting Marco? He's on the upper deck. Whitebeard said, gesturing towards the area he knew the commander to be in. Luffy nodded and immediately headed off, following Marco's scent to find him faster. While Luffy did this, Ace and Sabo stayed with Whitebeard, still trying to deal with the idea that there could be more than one facility. The thought had crossed the brothers' minds back on Fishman Island all that time ago, but they had been proven wrong at the time. Hopefully the same would happen this time. What's going on, Yoi? Marco asked as he and Luffy walked up. He looked worried, which made sense seeing as not only were the brothers back early from the island but now they were also having a powwow with Whitebeard. It seems there could possibly be a facility on this island, my son, Whitebeard explained with a sigh. Marco's eyebrows raised in surprise, glancing at the brothers and suddenly understanding. I see, he replied, thoughts moving a mile a minute. Yes, we don't know for sure, however, the brothers here have strong suspicions about it. I believe we should send a small group to go and scout this building. If it turns out to be a facility then we will try and rescue the children that may be held inside, Whitebeard told Marco. Of course. I can go get Ruta and Izo, they would be best for scouting. Maybe Jiru as well, Yoi. Marco said, thinking out loud. It would be best to bring a small group along to avoid suspicion and their chances of being caught, and those three were the most inconspicuous of the commanders. That's a good idea. Why don't you go and round them up? Whitebeard suggested, to which Marco nodded and headed off to do just that, leaving the brothers with Whitebeard again. I understand that this may be difficult for you three and I also understand if you don't want to, but with your abilities, it would be best if you went along as well, Whitebeard said to the brothers, watching them carefully as he spoke to gauge how they were handling all of this. He would never ask any of his sons or daughters to do something they truly didn't want to do without reason, and the brothers were no exception. I'm going. Even if these aren't the same doctors from our facility, it'll still feel good to punch them in the face. Ace growled out, fist still clenched tightly at his sides that it was nearly drawing blood now. I know that the facility is a big source of distress for you three, and you have every right to want to get even a bit of revenge, but you're going to have to put that aside for now. There are children here that need your help, just as you needed ours all that time ago. See this situation, my sons. Whitebeard said gently. It was asking the three a lot, to put aside their trauma and think of someone else instead, but it was necessary if they were going to join the recon group. The children there couldn't defend themselves like they could. They needed their help, and if they went in thinking only about revenge, it could put the children at more risk than they were already in. We understand, Luffy spoke up suddenly, shocking both Ace and Sabo. They had thought Luffy would have a hard time deciding if he wanted to go or not, especially since he'd been in shock since they saw the possible facility. But there he stood, tall and determined as he looked Whitebeard in the eye and agreed to the captain's words. I assume that means you're going as well, my son, Whitebeard said with a warm smile to the youngest. Luffy hummed in acknowledgement. It took another second of processing before Sabo sighed. I'm going too. Someone has to keep an ear on these two, he said, pointing his thumbs to his brothers on either side of him. Ace gave him a look of indignance as if he couldn't fathom the idea that he caused any trouble, while Luffy laughed quietly to himself, owning up to the fact that he had a tendency to cause trouble. In his defense, he didn't mean to get into trouble, most times at least. At this point, Marco was returning with the other three commanders, each wearing various faces of worry or seriousness. Marco says there might be a facility on the island? Jiru asked, wondering if Whitebeard would confirm the words. It seems so, yes, Whitebeard answered with a nod. I'm sending you four, as well as Ace, Sabo, and Luffy to go and scout out the building. Figure out whether this building is really a facility or not. If so, your priority is to get any children inside out and back here to the Moby. On the off chance that this is a facility, I'll have the Moby moved closer to this building. Whitebeard explained to the group. "I've got my mini den, yoi. If this is a facility I'll call and ask for reinforcements to help clear the building out," Marco said, pulling out the small, sleeping snail from his pocket. "Good. I'll make sure the nurses are informed and ready for possible patients." Whitebeard continued, glancing around the deck and working out who he was going to have perform what task. They would need groups to be ready to fight if this was a facility, as well as groups ready to help escort children to the infirmary. If the children were anything like the brothers had been, they would need all the help they could get. He would also have to have the chefs get started on a large amount of food for the children. It was going to be a lot of work, but they'd done it once without any foreknowledge, and they could do it now. "Stay safe, my sons," Whitebeard said to the group, who nodded in response. "We'll do our best, Oyaji," Izo affirmed before they all began leaving, heading to the boats that would take them back to the island. As the group walked away from the captain, they were watched closely by their surrounding crew members. Many had picked up on the fact that something seemed to be happening, especially with how the brothers had returned to the ship, and naturally, they were curious. The group ignored them, knowing that someone would explain it to them eventually. Once below deck, the brothers all piled back onto the striker while Izo, Haruta, and Jiru got into one of the boats. Marco opted to fly ahead in his phoenix form to scout the forest nearby the beach on the chance that someone may have seen the brothers earlier and followed them back. The brothers had been too out of it before to even think about the idea that they could have been spotted and followed. Ace fired up the striker, and off they went, the other commanders following behind. When they all reached the beach, Marco returned, informing them that the nearby forest still seemed to be empty, indicating the brothers hadn't been spotted. When the boats were pulled up safely away from the water, they began to devise a plan on how they were going to return to this building. It was decided that Ace and Marco were taking the high ground, Ace sticking to the tops of the trees and staying on the lookout for anyone roaming the forest, while Marco flew above the trees in his phoenix form and helped keep a lookout from there. Luffy would stick to moving through the trees, though he'd stay in the lower branches and use his sense of smell to make sure no one had come by recently. Apparently, according to Luffy, it was easier for him to smell from the trees instead of being in the group with the others where their scent would distract him. Meanwhile, Sabo, Jiru, Izo, and Haruta would stay on the ground while Sabo kept an ear on Ace, Marco and Luffy in case they found something. Plan set, the group split up, Ace, Marco, and Luffy heading upwards while the rest began walking to the dense forest ahead. Luffy stuck to the lower branches, barely visible to the group, but Ace and Marco were gone from their vision the second they walked into the thick of the trees. At first, they walked in silence, everyone tense with the possibilities of what they could be walking into, but eventually someone, Haruta namely, spoke up. "So, how are you guys doing? You know, after finding out there might be another, facility." Haruta questioned hesitantly. He hadn't been around when the brothers got back, hadn't seen their pale, terrified faces, so he had no clue if they were handling this well at all. "We're managing," Sabo answered after a moment of thought, glancing upwards to Luffy, who continued on a bit ahead of them, not hearing the conversation. "I mean, this isn't exactly something we were expecting, but," he trailed off, gaze focusing back to the trees ahead rather than looking at anyone as he tried processing what he was feeling. No one pushed him to continue, all of them understanding this was a difficult time for not only him, but Ace and Luffy as well. If they didn't want to talk about it, they wouldn't force them to. "Well, honestly, I'm not really sure how I feel at the moment. I guess I could ask Luffy, he'd probably know, but that's a little strange." Sabo started, eyebrows furrowing at the thought. It was a strange concept, that someone else had the ability to know his own feelings more than he did. But Luffy was a strange person, abilities or not. That makes sense, given the history you have with the place. Regardless of whether this really is a facility or not, it doesn't mean it didn't bring up bad memories or feelings in you three. Izo assured. He'd had his own share of traumas in the past, almost all of the crew had. Whether it was the passing of a crewmate, a family member, or just a friend, whether it was witnessing a devastating fire, or watching a corrupt government like the Marines allow people like the Celestial Dragons to take people and make them slaves, they'd all had something they'd lived through that was difficult for them to get past. Sure, those traumas weren't exactly on the same level as the brothers' 7 years of torture, but they were traumas nonetheless, and they knew how fickle triggers could be, how debilitating they could be. "When we first realized that this building might be a facility, we all kind of went into shock, I think," Sabo admitted to the listening commanders. He knew from his experience with whiskey that talking through things like this could be helpful, and he knew for a fact the brothers would have plenty to talk about at their next session with the nurse. "I'm not even sure how long ago it was that we found the building. Time just kind of stopped. I don't even really remember getting back to the Moby. Luffy was the worst of all of us, and I'm a little surprised he wanted to come along. Ace and I had to snap him out of it once we realized we should tell Oyaji about the building," Sabo said, once again looking towards his brother with a mixture of worry and wonder. "He's always been fairly resilient," Jiru commented, also turning to look at the yun that the crew had gotten to know the brothers. They noticed that all three of them had a tendency to bounce back from things, Luffy especially. "Yeah, he's always been like that. Truthfully, I'm a bit jealous of his ability to take things in stride all of the time. The blonde said with a light chuckle. He's an enigma. I don't know if the world's ready for someone like him quite yet. Izo said with a sigh, knowing of the youngest's dream to become the Pirate King. It had come up in conversation more than once until eventually the whole crew knew of their ship brother's plan to leave them at 17 to form his own crew. Many of them were a bit bummed out at the idea that Luffy would leave them, but Whitebeard had merely laughed and told them that all children had to leave the nest eventually. The rest of them were just late bloomers. That had almost caused a riot, one in which their captain did nothing but laugh about. The group grew silent again after that, the only sounds around them being those of the animals hiding in the trees or the rustling of the leaves and branches as Luffy jumped from tree to tree with practiced ease. It took about a half hour of walking for them to finally be close enough. Sabo heard it seconds before Ace was telling him he could see it, and hearing the sounds for a second time just cemented the idea for Sabo that this was a facility. Hearing numbers being called, tests being announced, crying, screaming. It was almost too much to handle. He was given a bit of reprieve as the sound of Luffy, Ace, and Marco descending distracted him from the muffled sounds coming from the building. We're close enough now. Marco and Ace are coming down. Sabo told the group. Luffy sat on the lowest branch, visible to everyone now as he waited for the two to reach them. What's it looking like? Jiro asked the two commanders as they appeared from the trees, landing safely on the ground. No one around from what I saw, Marco said, arms flaring as they returned to two human arms rather than the flaming blue wings they'd been previously. I could see the building through the taller trees. It looks to be about 3 stories tall. Ace informed them, glancing towards where he knew the building to be. Now that he was back on the ground he couldn't quite see the building anymore, too many trees blocking his line of sight. There were big glass windows on the front of the building from what I could see. It was on the first floor so it was too low down for me to see what was in there. The windows got smaller as they went up the floors. The second floor windows weren't nearly as big, just regular sized. But the third floor windows were so small that I don't think I'd be able to see in them that well. Ace commented, thinking back to how tiny the top floor windows had looked in comparison to all the other windows. If you were closer, do you think you'd be able to at least see through the bigger windows? Haruta asked. They needed a way to know what they were walking into, so it would be helpful if this were the case. Yeah, definitely. I think those windows took up the whole wall of the first floor. Ace said with a slight scoff to his words. I might even be able to see in the second floor windows too, but the third floor is a no-go, he continued. In that case, why don't you get as close as necessary and try and see as much as you can? You would get a better vantage point from the tops of the trees, but don't stick out of the top, Yoi. That way it'll be more difficult to spot you. Marco told Ace, to which he nodded. Sure, I'll tell Sabo anything that I can see, Ace said before jumping back into the trees. Sabo took this time to sit down against a tree and focus on listening, not that he hadn't been before, but this time primarily on Ace. The sounds from the facility were still there, buzzing in his ears, but he tried once more to block those sounds from registering, instead listening to Ace's every movement. I can feel the bad feelings again, Luffy uttered quietly, shivering almost unnoticeably. He'd had to deal with Ace and Sabo's worry and fear on the way here, along with his own mixed emotions on this, but now that they were close to the possible facility again he was getting an onslaught of negative emotions that he didn't like one bit. What kind of bad feelings? Izo asked him in concern, all of them knowing the effect bad emotions had on Luffy. Like the sad ones, and the scared ones, and even the darkness, the youngest said, voice still low. How dark? Marco asked. Not as dark as Teach or the weird devil fruit, but like a lot of people with gray colors, Luffy said, trying to put the feeling into words. It didn't feel like just one person's darkness, it felt like a multitude of them, all combining into one mass that made Luffy more and more uncomfortable as he felt it. Nay, Luffy, remember that time Curiel accidentally made that smoke bomb? Haruta suddenly asked, confusing all of them with the sudden change of subject at a time like this. Luffy looked just as confused, eyebrows furrowed as he both tried recalling the situation as well as tried to figure out why Haruta was bringing it up. Yeah, it smelled really bad and made my nose hurt, Luffy said, face scrunching up at the memory. And he bought you that bronze figurine of a ship at the next island because he felt so bad, Haruta said with a smile. Luffy laughed, smiling as well. And he asked Thatch to make me cupcakes. Those were so good, he said, mouth salivating and stomach rumbling at the thought of the delicious baked treats. It's a good thing we brought Ruta along, Izo said with a smile as he realized just what the young commander had been up to. He's surprisingly good at distracting him. Jiro agreed, watching as the two somehow turned the reminiscing into an excuse to play a weird version of tag in the lower branches. Of course, Haruta had difficulty even getting into the tree, which made Luffy laugh gleefully as he jumped away from the commander and safely into the nearby tree. Oi, that's not fair. Get on the ground and run like a man. No way, running through the trees is better. Not long ago Ruta was the youngest commander. Besides, he's always been the more childish of us all, so it really is no wonder he and Luffy get along so well, Yoi. Marco observed, smiling as well as he watched the two. From where he sat on the ground, Sabo smiled as well, happy that someone had been able to distract Luffy, even if it was only for a moment. The two continued playing for another few minutes, but once Sabo announced that Ace was getting close enough to the building, they stopped, returning to the others as they all waited for Sabo to relay Ace's words to them. Almost there. Okay, he's made it. He says he's not at the edge of the tree line, but he's close enough that he can see in the bottom floor windows. Apparently, it looks like a waiting room or something catered to children. There's toys on the floor and chairs against the walls and a desk facing the door that looks like a receptionist's desk. Sabo said, listening to his brother's words carefully before relaying them. He says that he was right about the third floor windows. They're made of frosted glass and are too small anyways for him to see anything. A lot of the blinds are drawn on the second floor windows, so he can't see inside of them. Oh, he found one that wasn't closed all the way. He can't see clearly enough though, so he's going to get a little closer. Sabo relayed, all of them listening with rapt attention. He was silent a moment as he listened to Ace shuffle closer to the building, praying his brother was being careful to stay out of sight. Even if he was hiding in the tops of the trees, there was still a chance someone might look out a window and spot him. He's closer now. He can't see the whole room, but he can see a desk and some filing cabinets. There are a lot of papers scattered around the desk and someone just walked into the room. He can only see their feet at the moment. Another minute of silence. They're getting closer to the window. Re-wearing a doctor's coat and holding a file in their hands, but he can't see their face. They're sitting at the desk now with their back to Ace and opening the file. The papers inside are out of his view, so he can't see what they say. Okay. They're picking them up and he can see some of the words over their shoulder. Sabo settled further against the tree, taking a deep breath as he heard the beginnings of what Ace was seeing. Hearing the dark growl to his brother's words as they both realized what the eldest of the trio was seeing. Subject number 29343. Status: terminated. Cause of death: cardiac arrest. Test last administered. Number 897281. They're turning to a new page. Test number 897281. Objective: brain enhancing serum. Goal: to enhance the user's natural intelligence to that of someone beyond comprehension. Number of times tested: 27. Number of successes: 0. Number of failures: 27. Effects upon failure: subject's brain goes into overdrive, which in turn forces the heart to work harder until it can't anymore, resulting in a fatal stopping of the heart. Sabo spoke through clenched teeth as he came to the conclusion that this was definitely a facility. With the things he was hearing, the things Ace was seeing, and the things Luffy was feeling, there was no more question in his mind. I think that was all the evidence we needed, Haruta said softly, eyebrows slanted and a faint look of disgust on his face. Ace thought so too. He's on his way back right now, Sabo said, taking another deep breath and standing up, dusting the dirt from his clothes as he did. I'm going to call Oyaji and tell him about this, Marco said, walking off a bit further into the trees as he pulled out his mini den. It didn't take long for Ace to return to them, only a few minutes, and by the time he did, Marco was returning as well. Oyaji says the Moby's almost close enough to anchor, and once that happens he'll send the reinforcements our way, Yoi. He has the nurses ready and groups prepared to help bring the children back to the Moby. Marco told them. So what's the plan? Barge in and start kicking the bastards' asses? Jiru asked, arms crossed and frowning. It might have to be, Yoi. Ace, did you see any other way we could enter the building? A back door or a side entrance maybe? Marco asked. No, I didn't see anything except the big glass doors in the front, he said, shaking his head. He made sure to do a quick loop around the building in search of just that, but he'd only seen windows. In that case, we'll have to go straight in the front. In your facility, you were being held in the basement, Izo said, trying to figure out what their plan of action should be once they were inside. True, but our building hadn't been 3 stories tall. It had only had the ground floor and then the basement, Sabo pointed out. You think the children are on the upper floors? Haruta asked, pondering the idea. Most likely. Like I said before, the windows on the top floor were too small, and they were high up too, almost as if they were at the top of the wall. Not to mention they had frosted glass. It didn't look like that was someplace they'd put their offices. Ace said, arms crossed over his chest as well as he thought back to everything he'd seen. I can smell for sweaty people. We'd be able to find him that way. Luffy piped up from where he sat on his tree branch, feet swinging in the air. Sweaty people? Izo questioned, eyebrow raised. Luffy nodded. When we were in the facility we got all sweaty and smelly because we couldn't take baths. I could smell for the kids that way. Luffy said, face not showing any of his emotions. Good thinking, Lu, Sabo praised, smiling to his brother who returned it. Then we'll head in the front and Luffy will smell for the kids, Yoi. We'll most likely need to find stairs, so we should keep an eye out for those. Our first priority is to clear the building of any doctors or security that might be inside, Yoi. That way we can get the kids out without having to worry that they'll get hurt on the way out. When it's safe we'll start getting all of them out into the Moby. Marco explained, all of them nodding and understanding. When we get to the second floor though, we might want to check it out. If what Ace saw is the same for all the other rooms on that floor, it might be where they keep their information. We can check it out and maybe get some answers on what the facility's purpose is and why the Marines allow them. Haruta added. True. Alright, Ruta and Sabo, you two will go and check the second floor once you reach it and gather as much information as you can. Luffy, you'll guide everyone to the kids. Ace, Izo and Jiru will go with you. Yui. I'm going to stay outside and lead the reinforcements to the building and then join you all after. Marco said. Once they all understood the plan, they began making their way closer to the building, making sure to stay behind the cover of the trees as they got closer. It'd do them no good to be spotted now and have anyone inside prepare for their attack. Once they deemed themselves close enough, lying just on the outskirts of the clearing, each of them hiding behind their own tree, Marco gave the signal indicating that they could begin. At once, they began charging towards the building, Marco turning into his phoenix form and heading towards the Moby instead. Reaching the giant glass doors, there was no hesitation before Ace was kicking them open with a loud bang, shocking the receptionist at the desk so bad that they literally fell out of their chair, eyes wide. Where to Lou? Sabo asked his brother, the youngest's nose scrunching in discomfort at the sudden blast of the medicine and alcohol smell that greeted him the second they entered the building. Under the intense, strong smell, however, was the smell he'd predicted. The smell of a lot of sweaty, bloody, dirty children inside the building. That way, he said, pointing to a door on the wall behind the receptionist's desk. Sabo nodded, but before they headed that way, Ace looked to the receptionist who still sat on the ground in a mixture in shock. Hey, you, where are the stairs in this place? Ace growled out as he glared at the man. The man lifted a shaky finger, pointing to the door Luffy had pointed to before. Be back there, first D door on your right, he said shakily. With all the information they needed, they all charged off into the door without hesitation. I'm so getting fired for this, Sabo heard the receptionist say, and only seconds after an alarm was blaring in his ears, making him wince. It had been loud and sudden, but as it continued blaring he tried to dull it, ignore it in favor of listening to the many footsteps he could hear running their way. For all intents and purposes, the first floor seemed to be completely empty sans the receptionist in the front. Every door they passed they made sure to check inside, but each one was as empty as the last. The entire left wall was covered in doors, while there was nothing on their right like the receptionist implied. The hall looked like a classic hospital hallway, stark white walls, and linoleum tiles, and each room they peeked into looked like a room where a child would stay. They were painted with light pastel colors and had some toys in them, yet there were no children inside. They also passed what looked like a staff room of sorts, but again, no one was inside. It seemed that the hallway wrapped around a central block in the center of the building and would eventually lead back to the waiting room in the front, which they determined when they made the only turn they could to the right and saw that down the hall was another turn to the right. They didn't need to worry about that though, because on the right wall, there were two doors. That one's the stairs, right? Jiru asked, pointing to the door closest to them. Either that or a trap, Izo replied, ready for either option. I'm guessing stairs. We're about to get some visitors, Sabo said, grabbing the pipe off his back in preparation for the people he could hear behind the door. Realize everyone else got into battle-ready stances, and just in time too. The aforementioned door burst open and a crowd of people dressed in what looked like security or guard outfits all ran out. It took the crowd only a second to spot them, and once they did they immediately charged toward them. Izo stayed put and began firing shots off at the crowd while the others ran forward to meet them before they could get any closer. It was a flurry of punches, kicks, and headbutts as they took down man after man. After looking at their auras, Luffy felt absolutely no remorse in doing so once he saw the mass of gray and dark gray colors. The darkest it got was a shade lighter than black, which made him a bit grateful there were no black auras but annoyed at how they could all be such bad people. Once they had mowed down enough guards to get by, they ran to the doors. Izo stayed close, shooting at anyone who tried following them, and soon enough they were reaching the stairs and closing the door, blocking those outside of it from getting in. You guys go on ahead, I'll stay here and take care of these guys and meet up with you after, Izo said, holding the door that the guards were now banging on in an attempt to get open. They agreed, knowing Izo could handle himself and believed he would be fine before running up the stairs to the second floor. This is our stop, Haruta said, looking to the door on their left as they reached the top of the first flight of stairs. I can hear Marco and the others on their way here. They should get here within a few minutes, Sabo told Ace, Luffy and Jiru, all of whom nodded in understanding. Sabo walked up to the door, looking to Haruta for a second before pushing it open and swinging his body behind the door, pushing it forward and slamming it into a guard's face who had attempted to run into the stairwell. Sabo's head poked around at them from behind the door, grinning. We should hurry up, the rest are headed this way. This guy had the misfortune of being ahead of them, Sabo explained, gesturing to the fallen body. Haruta grinned as well, wishing the three still in the stairwell luck before running off with Sabo, the second floor door closing behind them. Sounds of a fight could be heard from behind the door, but they didn't have time to waste, so the group of 3 began making their way up the next flight of stairs. Once at the top, they were met with a door right in front of them. No more stairs, no forks in the hall, just a singular door and the option to either open it or turn around and go back. Of course, they were going with the former option with that one, which was why Ace moved carefully towards the door, none of them knowing what to expect once they opened it. "Kids are here. Smell is stronger." Luffy tapped to them, just in case someone was close enough to the door to hear them. All of the commanders and Whitebeard himself had gotten accustomed to using the silent language in times like this and were just as good at reading the taps as the brothers were. Sometimes there was a word or two they didn't know, but the brothers made sure to teach it to them whenever that was the case. With Luffy's information, Ace pushed the door open ever so slightly, holding it tightly in his hand to keep it from swinging open too far. Once there was a barely visible crack, the fire user peeked through it, trying to gauge the situation behind the door as clear as he could before they went out there. "Lots of doctors here. I think all the guards are downstairs. Wait, no, there's a few here. Like the first floor, doors on the other wall and the hall goes left and right. Luffy and I can take the right, Jiru you go left and we'll meet once we clear the halls." Ace tapped. Agreeing to the plan, Ace stepped back from the door a step before raising his foot and kicking it in much the same way he'd kicked the glass doors. It shocked the scrambling doctors enough that Jiru was able to slip through the door and to the left, all while knocking out the dumbfounded doctors watching. Ace and Luffy, as planned, went right and did the same as Jiru, knocking down doctor after doctor, as well as the occasional guard. It was safe to assume that most of the guards had gone to the lower floors in an attempt to stop them before they got this high up, and because of that there was a severe lack of them up here. This being the case meant that the 2 brothers were fighting the defenseless doctors as easily as taking down rookie pirates from the blues. As they made their way through the hall, they slowly met back up with Jiru, who was finishing off his own group of doctors, narrowly avoiding getting hit by a bullet thanks to his haki and knocking out the guard who had attempted to shoot him. "All good?" Ace asked him as they finished fighting, all of them barely even panting. "Yup. You?" he asked, looking over the brothers for any injuries, even if they were just scrapes. "Same. Time to start getting these kids out," Ace said, changing the attention to the kids who were all watching them through tiny windows on their metal doors. The doors lined the entire left side of the halls, and in all of them, there was a tiny child, standing on their tiptoes as they watched the carnage happening outside their rooms. "Right. I'm sure everyone else is here by now if Sabo was right in his estimate, but just in case I'll head down and make sure the way is safe to bring them down," Jiru said, turning to head back to the stairs. "If you see Marco, tell him to get the groups that are helping escort the kids out," Ace called to him before he turned the corner and disappeared. "Alright Lou, time to get to work," Ace said, turning to the first metal door and inspecting it carefully. I'll get the other side," Luffy told him, leaving his brother just as he warned a kid to step away from the door, kicking it down once they did as told. With the 2 brothers working together, they made quick work of opening the doors, each using their monstrous strength to kick the doors down once they made sure the child, or even children, inside was safely out of the way. This facility was, despite its tall exterior, smaller than the brothers' facility had been. Even though this building was 3 stories tall while theirs had been one with a basement, most of this facility was wasted space. The entire first floor was completely empty and the second floor was. Well, Ace and Luffy didn't know because they hadn't seen it, but even the third floor was smaller than their basement had been. Where their facility had easily housed about 30 kids, this one barely reached 20, most rooms having more than 1 kid to them. Another difference was the rooms themselves. In place of the cold, empty, damp, dark basement they'd had, these kids had rooms with windows and beds with pillows and blankets. Sure, the beds looked crappy, the pillows looked flat and the blankets were ratty with holes, but they were small comforts that the brothers had been denied in their cells. Even the window was a luxury that Ace felt himself envying. To know when it was morning, when it was night, the passing of time. They hadn't had that. All they'd had was the meal times giving them a vague idea of what time it was, and even then they could have been fed breakfast at midnight and not known any differently. It had been insanity-inducing. As Ace helped child after child leave their room, he couldn't shake the part of him that wished he'd been given these same luxuries. 7 years in that hell and they hadn't even been given proper clothing while these kids were given decked-out rooms he would have killed for. Of course, he knew how crazy it was to feel this way, to be envious of another tortured child's cell, but he couldn't help himself. Forcing himself to focus on the kids and not the rooms, Ace swallowed that envy down, knowing that if Luffy felt his emotions he would ask questions Ace didn't want to answer. Their ship brothers were here now, helping escort the children to the stairs and to the Moby while Luffy and Ace did one last check of the floor to make sure no one was any children they missed. Because of this, they found the lab where no doubt the kids were taken to be tested on. They also found a room with giant tanks filled with water, but Ace was quick to shut that door before Luffy could peek in, telling his brother it was empty instead. Just towel storage. Luffy felt his lie, and Ace knew he did, but the youngest didn't ask about it and instead, they moved on to the other rooms. Meanwhile, before Ace, Luffy, and Jiru had started the process of saving children, Sabo and Haruto were finishing up the guards on the second floor. "Man, that was a good workout," Haruto said, stretching his arms as the last guard crumpled to the ground in front of him. Sabo smiled to him, strapping his pipe to his back again. "That's for sure. Ace, Luffy, and Jiru have started fighting on the floor above us and reinforcements came and are helping Izo clear the first floor. Marco's heading up towards us." Sabo relayed to Haruto since the commander didn't have his hearing. "That ability of yours is still so cool," Haruto said with a sigh, shaking his head as he moved to the door closest to him and opened it, peeking inside. "It's got its perks, that's for sure," Sabo agreed as he went to his own door. Knowing no one was inside any of the rooms, Sabo didn't hesitate as he walked in, taking in the room that looked as Ace had described it. The far wall had windows on it with filing cabinets underneath it and a desk in the front of it. Bookshelves lined the wall beside the door and there was an armchair in the corner with a lamp beside it. Papers were strewn all over the desk and cabinets and there were books aplenty on the shelves. It was going to take a while, but Sabo was determined to find out what information this place held. He and Haruto worked together strategically to check every paper, every book, every note, trying to get any information on this place that they could. And information they got. Test notes, subject details, even doctor and guard information. It was all extremely recent and there wasn't a paper Sabo could find that dated back more than a couple of days, but he was learning more about the facility from these 2 days of papers than he'd learned in his 7 years stuck in his prison. At some point, Marco had joined them and Sabo could hear everyone else going to the third floor to help get the children to the Moby, but Sabo paid that no mind, instead scouring the pages in front of him. He sat cross-legged on the floor, piles of papers in front of him as he read over each one as quick, yet as thoroughly, as he could. When Marco walked in he barely even looked up to greet him. "Ace and Luffy have gotten all the kids out of their rooms, Yoi," Marco told him, standing in the doorway and watching as Sabo poured himself over the notes in front of him. "That's good," Sabo said shortly, grabbing another page to read. "There were about 20 of them from what I gathered," Marco continued, eyebrow raised now as he continued watching Sabo. "Oh, smaller than ours," Sabo noted, again, keeping his sentences short. Marco couldn't help but smile slightly as he walked further into the room. "Find anything interesting, Yoi?" he asked, thinking Sabo might talk more if it was about what he was so obviously invested in. "Huh? Oh, yeah. There's a lot of notes here on the tests they were doing for the past 2 days, but anything before that I don't know. There isn't a single paper in here or any of the other rooms that I checked that date back further than 2 days ago," Sabo said, glancing around the room for any papers he might have missed. "When we checked your facility we couldn't find anything. Maybe they get rid of their information systematically, Yoi," Marco suggested, thinking back to when they'd saved Ace, Sabo, and Luffy from their facility. No matter how hard they'd looked, they hadn't found a single paper that talked about what they did in the place, but here it was if the place was brand new. "Maybe," Sabo mumbled in agreement, grabbing another file and opening it up. From the front label, it was another doctor file that detailed who worked here, but Sabo was having trouble figuring out exactly what he was seeing in these files. There were too many abbreviations he didn't understand, like SST and FST, which were always followed by numbers, some smaller than others. Each file had a picture of the doctor and a number next to them. Most of the doctors he'd seen in here had the number 293 besides their picture, but occasionally he saw a number 670 or 351. Opening this new file and glancing at it, his whole body froze up. Marco was quick to catch the change in demeanor and was immediately worried. "Sabo, Yoi. What's wrong?" Marco asked, trying to look at the file Sabo was staring at. Swallowing was hard, but Sabo managed it, still not looking up. "Hey, Marco?" he asked, voice deathly quiet and void of emotion. Marco gave him a questioning look, still trying to understand what was happening. "When you got us out of our facility. When you fought all those doctors," Sabo started, and still, Marco was confused. Did Sabo couldn't find the right way to express his question. After all, it had been a year ago and to Marco and the rest, they hadn't realized the significance of who they'd been fighting. "Did you fight this man?" Sabo asked, pulling the paper-clipped image from the file and showing it to Marco. The first commander's eyebrows furrowed, but he looked at the picture, trying to remember back to if he had seen him at the time or not. He didn't look familiar, but it had been dark in that basement and there was a possibility someone else had fought him instead. "I couldn't say, Yoi." "Why, who is that?" Marco asked curiously. If possible, Sabo got paler, looking sick, and honestly, Marco was worried he was going to hurl right then and there. It's Haru, and according to this file he was working here 2 days ago." Marco blinked slowly, processing what Sabo was telling him. Even though he only knew of this man, he still knew the significance he held to the brothers, all the horrible things he'd done, and to learn that they hadn't taken him down for good back at the brothers' facility gave him mixed feelings. "It says he was here 2 days ago and left yesterday. I still don't know what these abbreviations mean, but he's got the highest numbers I've seen so far next to SST. 1924. The highest I saw before that was 100. Sabo said, voice strained and quiet as he spoke, looking back down at the file with wide eyes. Does it say SSH? Sabo suddenly shushed him, slamming the file closed and hiding it on the bottom of the pile of papers in front of him. Before Marco could ask what was going on, Ace and Luffy walked into the room just as Sabo put on a smile that looked as forced as it was. Sabo, we fought all these doctors up there, and all the kids are what's wrong? Luffy stopped in his recounting of what had happened upstairs the instant he felt Sabo's emotions. The dread, the fear, the anxiety. It was the same way he'd felt when they'd found this facility, only now it was 100 times worse, and it made Luffy step back from his brother, not liking the feelings. Seeing Luffy move away made Sabo's smile fall a little, but he forced it back up. He wasn't oblivious to Ace watching him closely either, a look that told him he wasn't buying the smile on Sabo's face. It's nothing, I saw something was all. Bad memories, Sabo said, as truthfully as possible so as to not tip Luffy off. This seemed to appease the youngest, who looked at him in understanding, and Ace seemed to buy it too once he saw that Luffy believed him. Oh, I saw scary stuff too, but I'm gonna tell Whiskey about it later. You should too, or you can tell me or Ace about it, Luffy offered with a cheery smile as he tried comforting the blonde. Sabo's smile was a little less forced now at his brother's words, and he nodded. I know. Anyways, did everyone get out? He asked, trying to avoid the temptation to grab Haru's folder and read it more. Yeah, Ace and I punched all these doctors and then we kicked these metal doors open, and they had nicer rooms than we did too, with beds and everything, Luffy said with a pout, Ace nodding his agreement, and Sabo could see in his eyes that the eldest was jealous despite his attempts to hide it. Sabo couldn't help but feel the same but forced himself to ignore that. Huh, wish we'd gotten beds. Hey, could you guys go tell Ruda I finished this room? I had to get the non-important papers out of here, Sabo said, patting the pile of papers. Ace and Luffy gave the pile a grimace before nodding. Sure, we'll help carry that stuff back to the Moby after, Ace said, noticing that every door on this floor was open with similar piles of papers on the ground in them. Thanks, that'll be a big help, Sabo said truthfully, glancing at Marco, who had remained silent this entire time. Conversation over, Ace and Luffy left the room and Sabo let out a relieved breath, peeking back over to Marco. They can't know about Haru. He told him once he knew for sure Ace and Luffy were out of hearing range. Marco nodded. I kind of figured that, Yoi. Don't you think they have a right to know though? Marco asked, watching as Sabo pulled the file out and opened it, giving it another quick once over before placing it in a pile closer to him, covering it with a few more papers. Right or not, it's better they don't know for their own safety. Knowing Ace, he'd go out on a manhunt to find him, and Luffy wouldn't be able to handle it. Not yet at least. We may be getting better, Whiskey's sessions have helped ensure that, but we're far from healed. If Luffy saw this, he'd take it hard. Just seeing this facility again put him in a state of shock that Ace and I had to shake him from. Knowing Haru's still around, and working in facilities no less, it would be year 6 all over again, but worse, Sabo said, eyebrows slanted with worry at the thought. He can't know about it. Ace either, he repeated. Marco watched him for a minute in silence before sighing and nodding. Alright, I think you should tell them eventually, but I agree, Yoi, now isn't the right time. Marco relented, standing with Sabo. Thanks, Marco. Welcome back, my sons. Whitebeard greeted as the trio, along with Marco and Haruto, returned, each holding their own stack of paper. Hey, Pops. Luffy greeted back cheerfully. He nearly waved to the man before remembering he was holding something and stopped. Why don't we put these in the library before you lose those, Luffy? Haruto asked, having noticed Luffy's near catastrophe. With the wind blowing, those papers would surely have flown into the ocean had the youngest dropped them. Luffy hummed in agreement, following Haruto to the library they had on the Moby. Ace, Sabo, and Marco were about to follow as well when Whitebeard spoke up, making them pause. There's going to be a commander's meeting to discuss the facility once Whiskey's done checking over the children. Sabo, you and Luffy are welcome to join, seeing as this pertains to the two of you as well, Whitebeard told them. We'll ask Luffy if he wants to join, but knowing him he might be more inclined to bug the chefs in the kitchen, Sabo said with a small smile, Ace shaking his head beside him. Whitebeard smiled as well, laughing as he nodded. Yes, you're probably right. I thought I'd offer regardless, the captain said. With that said, the three headed to the library where Haruto was beginning to organize the stacks already there, and Luffy was sitting in one of the chairs at the table, humming a made-up tune as he watched Haruto work. When they walked in, his humming stopped and he beamed to them, seemingly in a cheery mood despite having been in another facility only a half-hour ago. Ruda, Luffy, there's gonna be a commander's meeting about everything that happened once Whiskey's done with checkups. Pop said you and Sabo could go to Lu. Ace told the two. Haruto looked up, acknowledging that he heard, before returning to his work. Luffy tilted his head, seeming to be deciding whether he wanted to go or not, before shrugging. Nah, meetings are boring, Luffy said matter-of-factly, smiling again. Ace and Sabo laughed at their brother while Marco shook his head, smiling as well as he placed his stack of papers beside where Haruto was working. "Well, in any case, I'll be going. Just make sure you don't get into too much trouble without us," Sabo said, knowing that Luffy alone, without any commanders or he or Ace to keep an eye on him, probably meant trouble on some part of the ship. Even though there were hundreds upon hundreds of people on this ship, Luffy had a tendency to rope anyone who wasn't a commander or his brothers into going along with his strange plans or ideas. "Right," Luffy agreed, still smiling, and the two older brothers didn't know if he really understood what they were asking or not. "Anyways, what are we gonna do with all this paper?" Ace asked as he looked at the multiple stacks sitting on the table. It was a lot of information and the library on the Moby was already pretty full. "I was thinking we could put most of them in the offices, but I wanted to put some of the more less important ones in here so I didn't take up all of the space in there," Haruto explained as he began creating more piles, one being the important office papers and the other being the not so important library papers. Meanwhile, Luffy, who was growing bored of this conversation, decided that he wanted to go do something else instead. It was easy to slip out of the room unnoticed. He'd done it plenty of times before, so when he heard the conversation continue on as if he was still there, he counted it a success. He wasn't really sneaking off, it's not like he had to stay in there, but he wasn't exactly making his departure obvious either. Walking out onto the deck, he glanced around, trying to figure out what he wanted to do. Everyone was ready to leave the island, Whitebeard having decided that would be best to do before any Marines came by to investigate the ruins of another facility. This reminded Luffy of what they had done though. They'd saved children like he had been, like Ace and Sabo, from another facility that the government was allowing to exist, was running even. Luffy didn't know much about politics or the government itself, but he knew enough to know that a place like the facility was the opposite of what the Marines prided themselves on. Fighting for justice? For freedom? The facility was neither of those things, and yet they let those places be built, let children be taken, let doctors do horrible things to them. Taking a deep breath, Luffy focused instead on the fact that they had saved those children, helped them get the freedom the Marines had taken from them. He could still smell the underlying scent of sweat, blood and dirt coming from the infirmary where the children were at, and he felt a spike in his curiosity. Even though he and Ace had been there, opening those children's doors and letting them free, he hadn't paid much attention to the state they were in. He knew it wasn't good. A lot of them had barely been able to walk into the hall on their own, and so he decided he would go and check on them. When he, Ace and Sabo had been brought to the Moby, they'd all been cautious and scared of everyone. Of course, they'd had good reason. Ace and Sabo hadn't been awake to know that the pirates had saved them, and after 7 years trapped in hell, they didn't know who to trust. These children, unlike them, probably hadn't been there longer than a month. After all, life expectancy for normal children was only 3 weeks at the maximum. Luffy hoped that by visiting them, he might be able to cheer them up a bit. He could relate to what they'd gone through, and he could quite literally feel their pain. Mind made up, Luffy began making his way to the infirmary. Like before, everyone was too busy getting ready to set sail to pay the youngest of the crew much mind, so Luffy made it to the room without being stopped. Now that he stood outside the door, though, he hesitated. He could feel the children's confusion, their fear, their pain, and found that maybe it would be best to leave them alone until someone better at explaining things could talk to them. Like Marco or Sabo, or even Whitebeard. No, he could do this. He just wanted to make sure they were okay, and if he didn't want to stay anymore, he could leave. Opening the door slowly, he peeked in. Nurses were moving around the room quickly and methodically, helping each child they passed, giving them bandages or water, but never a shot. After dealing with the brothers, they knew that the children wouldn't react kindly to the needles, and they most likely wouldn't even be able to safely inject them. Luffy was quick to spot Whiskey among the many nurses, holding a clipboard in her hands and taking down notes as she walked around, probably for that meeting that Luffy wasn't going to. Knowing better than to sneak into the infirmary without Whiskey knowing, Luffy made his way straight to her. He'd rather not get in trouble with the head nurse. As Luffy walked over to her, Whiskey looked up, putting her clipboard at her side as she moved to greet him. "Hello, Luffy. Did you need something?" she asked him, smiling gently to him. Over the year, the three brothers had become good friends with Whiskey. After all, it was bound to happen with how much of their trauma they shared with her weekly. "No, I just..." Luffy didn't even quite know what he wanted. Now that he was here, his idea to try and help the children seemed harder than he'd originally thought. Outside, he'd had other emotions to muffle those inside the room, but now that he stood here among them, it was almost overwhelming. It reminded him of those days locked in a cell of his own, constantly surrounded by pain and sorrow and terror. "Wanted to visit?" Luffy said, more of a question than a statement. He could feel Whiskey's confusion, quickly replaced with understanding, and she nodded. "All right, but you have to stay out of the other nurses' ways. Understood? All of the children here need immediate medical attention, and if you get in the way of that, they can and will kick you out," Whiskey told him in a stern voice. Luffy nodded, serious as he agreed to not cause trouble for the nurses. "Good. I have to go to a meeting right now, but I'll be back in an hour at most. Oh, and before I forget, with how busy the infirmary is right now, I'm going to have to bump your session until the end of the week. If you need to talk sooner though, Just let me know. Whiskey told him with a gentle, reassuring smile. Luffy returned the smile with one of his own and nodded, watching as the nurse left the room. Turning to look around, he took in the many children, all in beds and covered in dirt and grime that contrasted harshly against the crisp, clean, white bed sheets. Some of them looked to be in more pain than others. Not quite sure what to do now, Luffy decided to just go sit at one of the few nurses' desks in the room so he'd be out of the way. A few of the kids had given him odd looks once they realized he was there, but Luffy could feel their curiosity and ignored it. Again, sitting at the desk, Luffy didn't know what to do. He opted to watch the kids for a bit, watching the nurses give them medical treatment, but that got boring quickly and he found himself playing with the paperclips on the desk instead. Time passed in what felt like hours but was surely only a handful of minutes when Luffy felt a sudden spike of fear nearby. He had to take some calming breaths and remind himself that it wasn't his own fear, just someone else's that was influencing him. When he was calmed down, he turned to see what was happening. Throughout his time in the infirmary, there'd been spikes in emotions here and there, mostly fear whenever nurses got too close to the children, but this one had been such a strong spike that it shocked him. Looking, he found the source to be a small girl, probably around 10 years old, and a nurse, Marguerite, standing by her with a worried look, needle in hand. "I know it looks scary, but there's nothing to worry about. You need this medicine to help you get better," Marguerite told the child gently, trying to calm her down. The girl was on the verge of tears as she shook her head rapidly. The two had garnered the attention of all the other children in the room, all of them looking just as scared as they looked at the needle. "It's not going to hurt you, I promise, it's only meant to help you," Marguerite tried explaining again, but the girl wasn't having it. To Marguerite's credit, she wasn't getting frustrated, only worried, and Luffy could tell from the nurse's emotions that this girl desperately needed the shot she was refusing. "Hi," Luffy suddenly said, not even realizing he'd crossed the room and was beside the girl's bed now, talking to her. Marguerite and the girl both looked at him in surprise, both of them not having realized either. "Hi," the girl said timidly, shying away from Luffy and inadvertently closer to Marguerite. "I'm Luffy. What's your name?" Luffy asked with a bright smile. He could feel a slight irritation coming from Marguerite and hoped she wouldn't kick him out just yet. Kara. Kara replied, still extremely timid, like a rabbit that had been seen. All eyes were still on them, even the nurses, seeing as Luffy had stolen their patient's attention. "Luffy," the young teen immediately cut off the nurse, which earned him a glare. "Oh, that's a nice name. Have you ever wondered what you'd name yourself if you could? Maybe something cool like Rocky, 'cause rocks are tough and stuff. Or maybe Brock, 'cause that's almost like rock," Luffy rambled. Gradually, as Luffy spoke, Kara looked less scared and timid of him. "Oh, or Rex, like a T-Rex," Kara offered quietly. Luffy's smile widened and he nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah, Rex, from now on, you can call me Rex, and you'll be Lion, CVE, Luffy said after a minute of thought. "I'm not brave," Kara replied, looking down at her hands. "Sure you are, Lion, everyone here is super duper brave, you know, 'cause you had to be near the mean doctors all the time," Luffy said with a grimace at the mention of the facility. "Me and my brothers had to be near mean doctors too, for a long time," Luffy continued, voice quiet but still holding every child's rapt attention. "Are really?" Kara asked with wide eyes. Luffy was frowning now, but he'd started this conversation, he couldn't stop now. They took me and Ace and Sabo when we were little, like you, and we didn't get out for a long time," Luffy said, flipping his wrist and showing her the number tattooed there. Kara's eyes widened in shock, timidly reaching out and running her fingers over it. "I got that too, I'm 29,366, Kara said quietly, a swell of distraught coming from her that made Luffy's frown deepen. "No, you're Lion, not that stupid number on your wrist. I'm Rex. We don't have to worry about those mean doctors anymore because we're safe here on the Moby. These are nice nurses, they don't want to hurt us, they want to help us," Luffy said, gesturing to Marguerite. And Kara immediately shied away from her, this time shuffling closer to Luffy. "They helped me and my brothers get better after we were rescued too. We were scared of shots, actually, I still kind of am, but we need to get them to get better so we let them," Luffy explained, omitting the part where they hadn't actually gotten their first shot until months of being on the ship. But they hurt, and they're scary," Kara said in fear, eyeing the shiny needle again. Marguerite had been watching the two closely this entire time, not interrupting once she realized what Luffy was doing. If anyone could relate to these children, it was him and his brothers. "Sometimes, yeah, but these are the good shots, the ones we need to get better. Hey, why don't I show you a trick?" Luffy asked, a smile on his face as he got an idea. "A trick?" the girl asked in confusion. "Yeah, a way to not be scared of needles anymore," Luffy said, looking to Marguerite, who understood and left to get the necessary supplies. "Are you lying?" she asked suspiciously, and Luffy looked offended at her words. "What? No way, Rex doesn't lie, that's not cool," Luffy said, crossing his arms and pouting as he looked away from Kara. The girl smiled a little at the antics as Marguerite came back, another needle in hand and some cotton pads and a bottle of rubbing alcohol in the other, as well as a band-aid. "Watch," Luffy told Kara, smiling to her again. The girl looked scared again, this time for Luffy as she watched him sit in a chair close by, the nurse setting the supplies beside him. Still, every child was watching them, all in either wonder or fear. "First, I don't look, 'cause the scary part was watching it happen for me," Luffy said as Marguerite grabbed a cotton pad and got some rubbing alcohol on it. She rubbed it on his arm and Luffy looked away from her, towards the wall instead. "And then I sing my favorite song so that I don't think about it," Luffy continued, still smiling widely as Marguerite got the needle ready. At this point, Luffy began to sing about the islands in the north and south, all while the nurse began injecting the liquid in the needle into his arm. Before Luffy could even get to the verse about the North Island, she was announcing she was done, cleaning the area again and placing a band-aid over it. "See? Not scary or painful at all," Luffy told Kara, looking at her with a bright smile. "Marguerite's really nice, and whiskey too, and Shirley, and brandy, and sherry, and I think she gets the point, Luffy," Marguerite said with a smile, putting the supplies away. "So, Lion, think you can get the good medicine?" Luffy asked Kara, who hesitated. She looked between Luffy and Marguerite, who was still holding her needle before swallowing hard. "Why yeah," she said, still obviously scared. "I'll teach you my favorite song. That way you can sing it anytime you need to get the good shots," Luffy told her, standing on the opposite side of the bed from where Marguerite was, preparing the shot. "Really?" Kara asked. Luffy nodded enthusiastically, still feeling the girl's fear. First, it goes, the islands in the south are warm, Pina Pura Peru," he said, the girl smiling as she recited the words back. "Good, and then, their heads get hot, and they're all idiots," Luffy continued, and once again Kara began reciting the words back. "All done," Marguerite said, once again beginning to clean up the supplies. The girl blinked in shock, turning to look at first the nurse, then her arm which had a similar band-aid to Luffy's. "See, Lion, not scary at all," Luffy praised with a laugh. Kara was still looking at her arm in shock before she too slowly smiled, Luffy feeling her fear drift away. The other children all watched in amazement, the nurses smiling. "Who else needs a good shot? I'll teach you guys the song too," Luffy said, turning to look at the other children. There was a hesitance, but one of the oldest looking boys in the room, maybe 12, slowly raised his hand and Luffy smiled to him before going to do the same as he'd done for Kara. The nurses were pleased to have the help and Luffy systematically made sure that any kid who needed a shot got one without any of the fear they'd had before. When every one of the nurses were done giving medical treatments, they told them they were going to send for one of the chefs to bring their food, seeing as Thatch was in the meeting, and for now they could just rest. All of the children were enthralled with Luffy though and wanted to talk to him. He complied, of course, because that's why he'd come here in the first place, to cheer these kids up. He told them stories about hunting back on his home island and all the adventures he'd had with the Whitebeards. He told them about the day he, Ace and Sabo were rescued. He told them about Makino. He told them about Fishman Island, anything he could think of. At some point, the kids realized he had powers, namely his devil fruit abilities, and one of them suddenly spoke up. It was a girl who looked around 7 who had, for the most part, been quiet. Is it bad to have powers normal people don't have?" she asked. Luffy could feel her apprehension and fear, so he continued smiling to her, shaking his head. "Nope, not at all. I've got lots of powers normal people don't have," Luffy admitted. "Really? Like what?" she asked in awe. "Well, I've got my gum powers, but I also have a really strong sense of smell. I can smell things in people from days ago. I can also feel people's emotions too and see colors around people," Luffy told her, leaving out the memory thing. It was still a sore subject for himself, even after all this time. "Because of the bad doctors?" she asked, timid now. Luffy frowned, because that was the truth, and the truth brought back painful memories. I got the bad shots that made me hurt and I got my powers because of them," Luffy affirmed, now all too hyper-aware that the smell of the infirmary was achingly similar to the facility. The bad doctors. They gave me powers too," she finally said after a minute of silence. "Really?" Luffy asked, now in a similar state of awe the girl had been in minutes ago. They gave me the bad shots too, and then when I woke up I could move things," she said meekly, and Luffy gave her a baffled look. "Move things?" he asked, because couldn't everyone do that? The other kids looked just as confused until suddenly a pen from a nearby desk flew right into Luffy's lap. He looked at it in confusion, wondering how that had happened until he realized, and a smile bloomed on his face. "Sugoi, that's so cool," Luffy cried in unbridled joy. The girl shifted on the bed nervously, a smile slowly forming. "You think so?" she asked, Luffy nodding rapidly. "Yeah, I wish my powers were that cool," Luffy added, imagining all the meat he could eat without even having to use his. The ice was broken and the tension was gone. A new conversation erupted over Luffy and the girl, Joyce's new powers, and everyone wanted demonstrations, which Luffy was happy to give, After a bit of persuasion, Joyce agreed as well, and soon enough, they were entertaining the entire infirmary, nurses included. In the meeting room of the Moby, all of the commanders, Whitebeard, Sabo, and Whiskey all sat at the large table, ready to discuss the events of the day. Whiskey had her notes with her, and Sabo and Haruta had brought some of the more important files they'd found while searching the offices. With everyone present, the meeting began. It started with Marco, Ace, Sabo, Izo, Haruta, and Jiru all recounting their reconnaissance of the facility, describing how they were cautious and made sure they knew this place was a facility for sure before they attacked. They explained the paper Ace had read through the window, how that cemented the idea this was a facility, and how they divided up to take everyone in the facility down. They mentioned Izo stayed on the first floor while Sabo and Haruta had the second, and Ace, Luffy and Jiru went to the top, all while Marco guided everyone else to the building. Ace explained the condition of the rooms the children were locked in as well as the other rooms he and Luffy had seen in an attempt to make sure the top floor was empty. He brought up the tanks he saw, the lab, and the other various rooms filled with equipment that no doubt were used for bad intentions. Izo mentioned that after he and the reinforcements took down everyone on the first floor, they did another scan of the rooms, deciding they were most likely decoys for anyone who happened upon the facility. The hospital rooms were all clean and pristine, but not a single child or doctor was in them. There was a staff room that seemed well used and another room filled with toys and books for children, but even that looked unusually clean and unused. Marco spoke about how he did a quick scan of the first and third floor before joining up with Haruta and Sabo on the second, and that was where most of their information began. Sabo and I found tons of notes and files on the kids being held in the facility, and even the doctors themselves. Haruta began, pulling files out of the pile they had and opening them, placing them in the middle of the table for everyone to see. There are 3 types of files: doctor files, test files, and children files. Doctor files have pictures of the doctor themselves, as well as a number next to their picture. We're not quite sure what the number there means yet, but they all have them and they're only 3 digits long. A lot of them are the same, 293, but there are a few others too, such as 670 or 351. Haruta continued, pulling out examples and showing everyone. Actually, I have a theory about that, Sabo spoke up, leaning forward. Whiskey, did the children happen to have similar wrist tattoos like us? Sabo asked, showing his own number still bold on his wrist. The nurse nodded. Yes, I was going to mention that. They all started with 293, much like how you, Commander Ace, and Luffy all start with 110, she said, glancing at her notes. I suspected as much. I think the numbers next to these pictures is what facility they work with. Most of them have the number 293 because that's the facility number they were assigned to. If we go with that assumption, that means there are more facilities, such as 670 and 351. Sabo explained. This caused some murmurs from the group, and Sabo could see that Ace was clenching his fists in his lap, which was the expected response. Sabo himself was having a hard time with the idea. He'd only gotten it after seeing that, next to Haru's picture, the number 110 was printed neatly. Well, that's one mystery solved, but there are still things we don't have answers to. For example, there are a lot of abbreviations on doctor files, such as SST and FST. All of them have varying numbers next to them, and there doesn't seem to be any pattern or correlation to them that I could find. Sabo? Haruta asked, wondering if the blonde had any ideas. Sabo merely shook his head. I haven't made much headway with that either, he admitted, a bit frustrated that they had such valuable information in front of them but didn't know how to read it correctly. There are more abbreviations, more numbers, but we don't know what those mean either. Next, we've got test subject files, Haruta said with a tone of disdain as he pulled out the children's files. These are a bit easier to understand than the doctor's files. Each one has a child's number. No name, no age, no weight, height, no personal information at all. Just the number they were assigned. Next, it goes into their status, alive or dead, and if the latter, the cause of their death. Each cause seems simple enough: cardiac arrest, water intoxication, suffocation, but factor in that these are children and not all of those are natural deaths by any means. It becomes not so simple. Among the deceased files, it states which test was last administered to them, and then gives a brief explanation of the test itself. Haruta said, reading one of the many children's files, frowning. It gives the test number, the test's goal, its objective, how many times it succeeded, how many times it's failed, and finally, the results in both successes and failures. There's usually more failure than there is success, Haruta continued. On children who are still alive, it goes on to explain what tests they've been given so far, what test they're on currently, their symptoms after a day of testing, and plans for future testing. Haruta finished, sliding the child's file to the middle for them to see and pulling out another. Finally, they have test files. These go more in depth on tests they were administering and tests they were finished testing. Like on the children's files, it explains the goals, objectives, the numbers of successes and failures, and a description. These ones are more detailed though and go on to explain ways they thought they could improve these tests and serums. Some of these files have stamps on them. He held up 2 examples, the first file having a large red stamp saying, failure, and the other saying, success. And are finished getting any data. It's obvious what the stamps mean, and inside of stamped ones there's a note as to why it was deemed successful or a failure. Haruta finished, sliding the files into the middle as well. All of these notes and files date back to 2 days ago at the latest. There's nothing before that, not even a personal letter or note. Marco and I came to the conclusion that they must be systematically getting rid of their notes, or at least sending them off somewhere else. My guess would be the Marines, but there's nothing we found to support that theory, Sabo said. Finished explaining everything they found, the conversation moved on to whiskey, everyone wanting to know how the kids were doing now that they were in the care of their resident nurses. Well, so far, it looks like everyone should be alright with no long-lasting issues. I don't know how long they've been there, but the worst child we had only has to recover from some malnutrition and dehydration. They all have unknown drugs in their systems, but if we can match the numbers on their wrists with the notes in those files we can know how to better treat them. Some need medicine that can only be administered through shots, but it's no surprise that they're all terrified of needles, so we're having a difficult time figuring out how we're going to get them to cooperate, Whiskey said, reading over her notes carefully so she didn't miss anything. What happens if they don't get the shots? Rikuyo asked, worried for the children. For some, not much. They might catch a disease, but there are a few who will undoubtedly grow very sick if they don't get them. Whiskey told them, making them all realize that they needed to figure out a solution to this problem sooner rather than later. Sabo and Ace suggested. He'd stewed in his anger when Haruta and Sabo were going over the files, and now that he'd calmed down he wanted to help the children as much as he could. That could possibly work. After all, you two, as well as Luffy, can relate to them in ways no one else can. After the meeting, we could go to the infirmary and figure something out, Whiskey said, Ace and Sabo agreeing. The meeting began to finish up after that, Whiskey saying a few final things and others asking some questions they had, and once it was finished, they dispersed, Ace and Sabo going with Whiskey while the others went to make sure they were on track to another island. Back with Luffy and the kids in the infirmary, the food had arrived. The nurses were handing out bowls of soup to the children while Luffy twisted into a pretzel and pens spun in circles around him, kids laughing as they watched. This was how Ace, Sabo, and Whiskey found them. What's going on in here, Luffy? And, are those pens floating? Ace asked, eyeing the objects in disbelief. Ace, Sabo, Whiskey, isn't it cool? Joyce has powers too. She can make things move with her mind, Luffy said, returning his body to its normal sitting position with wide eyes and a bright smile. That's surprising, Sabo said, blinking slowly as he tried getting over his shock. After all, he, Ace and Luffy had powers of their own, arguably weirder than moving things with their mind, so it really shouldn't be all that surprising that another child from a facility had something as well. The pens all stopped spinning at once, drifting back over to the desks they belonged to and settling there, unmoving, while a little girl, presumably Joyce, looked over to them shyly. But cool, right, Joyce? These are my older brothers Ace and Sabo. They've got powers too. Oh, and this is Nurse Whiskey. She's really nice, Luffy told the girl as he bounced over to her bedside. Hi, she greeted shyly, waving a bit. The three returned the smile, all waving back. Nurse Whiskey, here are the updated records, Shirley said as she rushed over to the head nurse, handing her some files. Wait, but these are the ones who needed injections, Whiskey said in confusion, flipping through the files and seeing that it clearly stated the children had been given their shots. That's right, Luffy here was a really big help. He helped the children get their shots and even got one himself, Shirley said proudly, smiling to Luffy and patting him on the back. You did? Ace and Sabo asked Luffy in unison, noticing the band-aid on their brother's arm. Normally, whenever they had to get shots, they went as a group. It was the only way they'd been able to cope with it, the three of them distracting the one getting the shot. Yup. I taught them my song about the islands and showed them how I sing it without looking, so it's not scary. I taught Lion how to do it first, cause she was really scared about it, Luffy explained. Luffy did have a habit of singing the ear-splitting song whenever they had to get shots, but it surprised them he'd willingly done it here by himself. Lion? Sabo asked, wondering if that was one of the children's name. It was a strange name, but there was always a possibility Luffy was pronouncing it wrong or he'd come up with a nickname instead. Kara. She's brave, like a lion, so her new name is Lion. I'm Rex, like a T-Rex, cause they're cool, right Lion? Luffy called, turning towards another bed where a girl looked up from her soup to Luffy. Right Rex, she called back with a bright smile. Luffy turned back to look at them, still beaming. A lot of the bad feelings are gone now too, he added, clearly pleased with himself, and he had every right to be. Good job Lou. Ace praised with a smile of his own. Thank you, Luffy, for helping the children. Now we don't have to worry about anyone getting sick on our watch, Whiskey said gratefully as she closed the files in her hands, smiling to the youngest. You're welcome. Hey, Ace, Sabo, come on, You gotta meet George, and Kiana, and Trevor. Oh, and there's also Yuki and Lyle, their siblings too. With all the ease of a baby giraffe, Luffy dragged the brothers off to meet child after child, all of them happy, if not a bit shy, to meet the two eldest brothers. It was obvious Luffy had said a lot about them because they were quizzed on their abilities and whether the nurses here really were nice, to which they assured they were. Leave it to Luffy to bring smiles to children only hours after being released from hell. The next day the Moby was peacefully drifting through the open waters. They weren't quite sure where they were headed, seeing as their nearest protected territory was about a month away, and they didn't think it would be a good idea to keep the children on board that long. Not with the possibility of Marines finding out they'd taken down yet another facility and were harboring the children on their ship. Yonko or not, if the Marines thought they could save face, they would do their best to get these children away from them, even if that meant fighting them. They could land on another island, one not under their protection, but there was no guarantee the civilians there would see these children and want to help them. The Marine propaganda over children with number tattoos on their wrist had reached the entire world by now, the hunt for them still going strong, and if the civilians found out they were harboring said children, they would most likely turn them in thinking they were dangerous. The more Whitebeard thought on it, the more it seemed they were going to have to risk heading to their protected island. The people there would listen to him, understand that this crusade against innocent children was wrong, and help them in any way they could. They may even help the children return to their homes, wherever that may be, but that would be asking too much. There were 20 children here, from all different parts of the world. Whiskey had asked them, and answers varied between the Blues and Paradise, which was a long way from where they were in the New World. He wanted to get the children back home, but there wasn't a feasible way to do it without risking the safety of everyone involved. The children were doing well here on the Moby, which was expected when they were under the care of their top-notch nurses. Whitebeard heard that Luffy had been quite a help in cheering the children up and making sure they got the necessary treatments. It made Whitebeard proud of his youngest son, to see him helping those in need without a second thought. Luffy had told him many times that his dream was to be the Pirate King. It was a dream Whitebeard fully supported, and he knew one day, sooner than it seemed, his youngest would be leaving the ship. He'd only known Luffy and his brothers for a year, but he loved them just as much as he did any other child on his ship. He knew, once Luffy was released into this world, he was going to raise hell. He laughed to himself as he took a swig from his mug, non-alcoholic per nurse's orders, but he wasn't going to let anyone know he spiked it, and hoped that Luffy caused all sorts of trouble for the damn Marines. They deserved it after everything Whitebeard had been learning about them. He'd never been a supporter of the Marines, he was a pirate after all, but when there were pirates in this world that had better morals than the ones who called themselves the good guys, it made him question exactly what was going on in their heads. For them to be so quick to persecute children, innocent children who were victims of the Marines' abuse of power, made him angrier than the time a rookie pirate had knocked their entire supply of alcohol overboard. He took his alcohol seriously, as any pirate should. Sighing, he wondered how he'd even gotten on this subject. Ah, yes, Luffy. He hoped Luffy threw those Marines' false sense of justice right back in their faces. Pops, there's been a ship spotted, musings interrupted. Whitebeard looked to his son in curiosity. Have they been identified yet? The captain asked, taking another swig of his drink. No, Richard's been sent to get Ace. The ship itself isn't too big, but they're headed right towards us, he said. Whitebeard nodded in understanding, glancing at the waters for any sign of this ship. Keep an eye on it. Tell everyone else to start preparing, but keep in mind that this could be nothing, he ordered, his son nodding and heading off to do as told. Whitebeard sat in silence, looking in his mug and realizing with dull amusement that it was nearly gone. And after I went through all the trouble of smuggling that alcohol in it, he muttered, right as a nurse walked over. What was that, Oyaji? Ah, nothing, just the musings of an old man. A ship? Nay, Ace, is it good or bad? Do we get to fight? Luffy asked as he leaned over the railing where he and Ace had been told there was an incoming ship. Sabo was with Haruta, poring over the files they'd gotten from the facility again, and Luffy and Ace had been practicing Luffy's ability to suppress others' emotions. Once they were told there was a ship Ace needed to identify though, the session had been put on hold. I'm not sure, it's got unmarked sails and it doesn't look big enough to put up much of a fight against us. Curiel could probably take them all on single-handedly, Ace said as he examined the ship. Instead of pouting like Ace expected him to, Luffy looked over the railing in awe. A mystery ship, he whispered, eyes wide at the prospect. Ace rolled his eyes at this, bumping Luffy lightly. I don't think so, Luffy. It's probably just a merchant or something, but I don't know why they would be heading our way, Ace said, confused as to why this small, unmarked ship was heading towards them. Was it just a coincidence that this unknown ship was appearing right after they'd rescued children from another facility? Hopefully, because if this happened to be doctors or Marines, Ace couldn't promise to hold back all of his anger. I'll tell Pops. The man who'd told them about the ship said, already heading off to the captain and leaving Ace and Luffy at the railing. Should I get Sabo? Maybe he wants to be here when the mystery ship gets here, Luffy suggested, knowing his brother could be as curious as him about certain things. Mystery ships were definitely one of them. Sure. Oi, Sabo, get your head out of those damn files and come out on the deck. Luffy's claiming mystery ship, but I'm thinking it's a merchant. Come place your bets before it gets here. Ace said aloud, knowing his brother would hear. Luffy pouted, crossing his arms over his chest. I was gonna get him, he whined, confusing Ace. What's the difference if I did it or you did it? He asked, wondering what had Luffy so bummed about not being able to call Sabo over. You didn't make it sound cool. What if Sabo wants to keep reading or whatever because you made it sound boring? He asked, making Ace glare at him in annoyance. You little twerp, he said, flicking Luffy on the forehead with a hint of hockey to ensure his rubber abilities didn't cancel out the pain. Ow, meanie, Luffy said, sticking his tongue out at his brother, to which Ace returned it. Seriously, I can't even leave you two alone for a few seconds, let alone a few hours, Sabo said as he joined them. He started it, Luffy accused, almost habitually. No way, you definitely did, Ace said, offended at the accusation. Sabo shook his head before hitting them both on the head, with hockey. Stupid devil fruit users. You're both idiots. Better? Sabo asked. No one mentioned idiots. Ace said through gritted teeth as he rubbed his head and glared at Sabo, all while Luffy whined, calling them both mean. Oh, is that so? Huh, I guess I must have misheard, Sabo said with an innocent face as he looked off in another direction. Liar, Luffy whined, rubbing his head. Sabo smiled, dropping the act. In any case, where's this mystery merchant boat? He asked, stepping closer to the railing and looking out at the water. Over there. It's got unmarked sails and it's relatively small. Either an enormously stupid group of rookies or bounty hunters or just a randomly passing merchant ship. That doesn't explain why they're heading our way though, Ace said, looking carefully at the ship again for any way to identify it. Maybe they need supplies and are hoping we'd help. Strange that they'd willingly approach a Yonko's ship though, Sabo said with a thoughtful look. The ship was still just out of his vision, only those with spyglasses or enhance at the moment. Whatever was the purpose of the ship, all anyone could do was wait until it got close enough to communicate with. A lot of people were on the deck, all of them wondering just who this mystery ship belonged to and what they wanted with them. There were many possibilities, they were pirates after all, but no one could figure out what was up with the unmarked ship. Finally, it was close enough, and a call from the small ship made everyone curious. Permission to board? It was a man's voice, gruff in its tone, but there wasn't any threat to the tone, just a mere asking. Everyone turned to Whitebeard wondering what his answer would be. Permission granted. He allowed, just as curious as his sons to figure out who this ship belonged to and what they wanted. Many had their weapons prepared, expecting things to go south and wanting to be prepared just in case. Soon enough, there were two people climbing onto the Moby, a man and a woman. Anyone else who was on the boat remained there, and seeing there were only two people here, they became a little less guarded. Looks could be deceiving though, so they would never completely lower their guard. Who are you, Yoi? Marco asked, stepping forward to meet them. One of them, the man, was a fishman, which was curious in of itself. The woman was 100% human with bright orange hair and a smile on her face despite being on Whitebeard's ship. My name is Hack. This here is my colleague Koala. We're here on behalf of the Revolutionary Army. The fishman, Hack said. This surprised them all, wondering what exactly the Revolutionary Army wanted with them. Revolutionary Army. What's that? Luffy asked from where he stood with Ace and Sabo. It's Revolutionary Army, Luffy. You know, the one run by Dragon. Sabo said, as surprised as everyone else that they were here. Was it because of Luffy? Did Dragon want to take his son back after all this time? A peek at Ace told him his brother was probably having similar thoughts as he shifted closer to Luffy, fists clenched. Oh, you mean my dad? Luffy said with a smile, happy to make the connection. Sabo facepalmed, but really, he should have known Luffy would let that little tidbit slip. Yeah, Dragon, your dad. Wait, Thatch said, everyone turning to Luffy, more surprised about this new detail than the fact that two members of the Revolutionary Army were on the ship. Good going, Lou. Ace muttered with a sigh, shaking his head. Your dad is Dragon the Revolutionary? Namur asked, eyes wide at the idea. Yup. Wait, was I not supposed to say that? Oops. Luffy said, laughing at his mistake. Anyways, why are you two here? If it's to take Luffy back to his dad, then you're out of luck. Ace said as he glared at the two, but was quick to note that they looked as surprised about Luffy's slip-up than the rest of the crew. D-Dragon-san had a child? Koala stuttered out, looking at Luffy carefully. I didn't even know he knew. Hack stopped talking mid-sentence, clearing his throat. No, we're not here for dragons. Son. By the way, I believe that is information that should not leave this ship. He said, everyone agreeing with that sentiment. It would bring even more unwanted attention to Luffy than he already had. We're here about the children you recently rescued. We were sent to liberate the facility code 293, but it seems you all beat us to it. Hack explained, making all of them cautious once more. Since when does the Revolutionary Army liberate facilities? Flamenco asked, many having the same thought. They'd never seen anything about facilities being taken down since the brothers all that time ago. Since last year, when those three were pegged as mentally unstable children and given bounties. I guess it makes sense now why Dragon-san suddenly had such an interest in it, seeing as his son had been in a facility. Koala said, speaking the last part to herself. We've liberated a half a dozen facilities in the past year. They're hard to find and even harder to get any information on. They're spread out all over the world, and when you three got out and it was discovered amongst the army as to what facilities were, it tied into our main goal, Hack explained. And what will you do with the children? Whitebeard asked, having been listening silently where he sat. Bring them home. They've been hurt enough and I'm sure all they want is to be returned to their families. Koala said, and Luffy could feel that she was being genuine. Whitebeard and the commanders looked to Luffy, wanting to know the verdict on whether she was lying or not, to which he nodded. She's telling the truth. Koala and Hack gave him curious looks when it seemed the captain accepted Luffy's words as fact. Will the children be given the proper medical treatment they need? Whitebeard asked. Of course. We brought doctors along with us for that very reason, Koala said. Facility doctors? Ace asked suddenly, a dark look on his face as he examined the two revolutionaries. No, just normal doctors. Hack answered this time. Again, there was a small pause as Luffy determined whether they were lying or not. Truth. Luffy felt the confusion in the two, but they didn't say anything about it. I'm assuming you want any information we may have found as well, Whitebeard continued. That would be helpful, yes, Hack said. The captain nodded, turning to Haruta. Could you go and gather the files you've found? I believe it would be best to give it to the revolutionaries. He told him. Haruta nodded before heading off to gather the papers, a little bummed he hadn't been able to read over it all yet. Marco, could you tell the nurses to prepare to transfer the children? Whitebeard then asked the first commander, who also nodded and headed off. It will take some time, so you are welcome to stay on the Moby so long as you do not cause any trouble. Whitebeard told the two revolutionaries as everyone began dispersing, eyeing the two as they left. Thank you for your hospitality, Hack said as he and Koala bowed to the man. With the mystery solved, Ace, Sabo, and Luffy began chatting amongst themselves again. Luffy claiming he was right in his mystery ship assumption while Ace tried explaining that he didn't win anything because they hadn't bet anything. Sabo, tell him he owes me 3 meals. All meat, Luffy demanded, pointing to Ace who looked aghast. What? No way, not with your black hole, besides, we never bet anything, Ace reiterated. Well, a deal's a deal, Ace, Sabo said, hands raised as if he couldn't do anything about it. Ace gave Sabo an incredulous look while Luffy beamed. See, Sabo said, so now you have to, Luffy told Ace victoriously. I hate you. Ace growled quietly to Sabo, making Luffy laugh. Hey, sorry to interrupt. The three looked over at the newcomer's voice, noticing that both Koala and Hack stood there, observing them. What do you guys want? Ace asked, arms crossed as he eyed the two suspiciously. He still didn't trust them, especially now that they knew who Luffy's dad was. We were just curious about something. Well, a few things actually, Koala said. Your dragon's son? Hack questioned, raising an eyebrow skeptically. Luffy could feel that the man didn't believe him and pouted. What's it matter? So what if he is? Ace asked in Luffy's defense, moving closer to the youngest again. Sabo was close to doing the same, still unsure how he felt about the two as well. It's just, Dragon-san is a bit. Well, it's hard to believe he'd have a child is all, Koala said, giving a nervous laugh. We don't exactly have to defend his previous statement. Whether it's true or not has no importance to what's happening right now, Sabo said, trying to get everyone to stop talking about this certain subject. It would be just their luck that the wrong person overhears and Luffy's got another thing held over his head by the world government. But, Koala, he's right. What Dragon does in his, free time is none of our business, Hack said, interrupting Koala who looked very argue with Sabo. Luffy smiled to the fishman, feeling the man's emotions change from disbelieving and skepticism into calm and knowing. Fine. Anyway, how did you know I wasn't lying? Earlier, I mean. And everyone just went along with it. Both Koala and Hack were curious about that, especially because it seemed to be second nature to the crew to look to the boy for confirmation. I felt it, Luffy said simply as if that was common knowledge. Felt it? Do you have a devil fruit? Koala asked, even more confused now than before. Ace and Sabo shifted uncomfortably, wondering why Luffy was telling her about his abilities. What are you doing, Lu? Ace asked him through their silent language. Luffy glanced at his brother's moving fingers which caught Koala and Hack's attention. Both of them had noticed but ignored the tapping, thinking it was just the man fidgeting, but Luffy's attention to it made them think otherwise. Good people. Good colors. Luffy replied, the two watching Luffy tapping now and Ace's skeptical look. Doesn't mean you should tell them all of this. Ace tapped back. Luffy seemed oddly confident in telling the two despite the fact that they knew nothing about them. Yup, the gum fruit. I'm a rubber man. That's not how I knew though, Luffy said, ignoring Ace's tapping. Well then, how? Hack asked. Luffy frowned. I just told you, he said in almost a whine, annoyed that they weren't listening. Despite his worry over the situation, Sabo laughed. What my little brother means to say is that, well, he has the ability to feel people's emotions, which in turn allow him to feel when someone is lying or not, Sabo said, earning a glare and a noise of disbelief from Ace. What? He was already trying to tell them, Sabo said with a shrug to the eldest. Whoa, hold on there, little brother. And what do you mean, has the ability to feel people's emotions? Koala asked in surprise while Hack watched with a mild look of curiosity. Calm down, Dragon's not my father, and neither is he Ace's before you start yelling again. We're not blood related, but we are brothers. And it's as I said before, he can feel your emotions. He can feel everyone's emotions, even mine, Sabo told them. How? Hack asked, oddly calm about it, just curious. Facility. It was all Ace had to say on the subject, because why not? Luffy and Sabo had already let the cat out of the bag and it was no question to these two what the facility was and what they did. At least, he hoped. As much as Luffy wanted to keep talking to the two, they were interesting and the girl made funny faces. A sudden wave of fear from the infirmary made him turn, frowning. Without a word he began walking off, leaving Koala sputtering and Hack more confused than before. Luffy? Ace asked with a hint of worry, having seen the look on his brother's face. The kids are scared, Sabo said in answer to Ace's unspoken question, also turning to follow Luffy. And how do you know that? Koala asked, getting frustrated at everything she didn't know about these three. The Revolutionary Army prided themselves on their extensive knowledge, so the fact that they knew next to nothing about these three so-called brothers made her more annoyed than she liked to admit. She was ignored though as the three brothers walked off, leaving the two revolutionaries to follow after them. They all walked into the infirmary together, Luffy taking the lead, and when they did they saw that many of the children looked scared, Marco and the nurses trying to calm them down. Rex, they said we're gonna go away. I don't want to. I want to stay here with you guys, Kara cried, tears in her eyes at the thought that, just after being saved, they were being taken away somewhere else again. Koala and Hack shared a confused look, Koala mouthing the name Rex to him and wondering who the child was talking to. They're good people, Lion. They're gonna help you and take you home, back to your families. Luffy explained to her, smiling now despite the frown he'd worn only moments ago. But what if they have bad doctors, and you and Sabo and Ace aren't there to help us? She asked him quietly, obviously that being her biggest fear at the moment, most likely along with all the other children. Oi, Bear, do you have any bad doctors? Luffy asked Koala, face serious as he looked at the revolutionary who blinked in confusion. Bear? Koala asked, almost speechless. She looked around, trying to figure out if Luffy was talking to her, and by Ace's snickers and Sabo's exasperated sigh, he was. My name's Koala, she corrected, eyebrows furrowed. She couldn't figure out if she was mad he'd gotten it wrong or understanding because she hadn't really properly introduced herself to him. Actually, the only reason she knew his name was because the two others had said it. Bear, Koala, same thing. Do you have bad doctors, facility doctors? Luffy clarified, thinking better of his choice of words. Someone could easily say they didn't have bad doctors and mean it because they believed their doctors were good at what they did, whether those things were good or bad. No, of course not, she answered easily, trying not to fidget under Luffy's intense gaze. She remembered the earlier conversation, that Luffy could feel her emotions, feel her lies, and realized that must be what he was doing right now. She's not lying. They're going to help you and all the other kids, Luffy assured Kara, the girl sniffling as she looked over to Koala. Taking this as a time to introduce themselves, the two revolutionaries stepped forward. Hi there. Lion-chan was it? Hack asked, having heard Luffy call the girl that, but he'd also called Koala Bear, so there was a possibility that wasn't her real name. Regardless, the girl nodded, eyeing them cautiously. I'm Hack, and this is my friend Koala. We work for an organization that helps save kids like you. He explained, Luffy watching them as close as Kara was. We're going to get you all the help you need and make sure you all get home safely, Koala assured, smiling gently to the child. Luffy could feel Kara's fear start to fade away as she looked at Koala. Luffy smiled to her, ruffling her hair. Nothing to be scared about, he told her, noticing that a lot of kids were listening to them talk. You guys don't have to be scared. They're gonna take you home and get you guys help. Luffy told them, feeling their fears slowly dissipate like Kara's had. They seemed to listen to him. Hag noticed, realizing that where the Whitebeards' first commander and nurses were having difficulty convincing the children, Luffy had merely said a few words and calmed them all down. Luffy has a way with people. Besides, we know exactly what they're scared of, Sabo told him, smiling to his brother. With the children calm and convinced, the nurses were able to prepare transferring the children. Most of them could walk as long as they had assistance, but there were a few who needed to be carried and even a couple that had to be transferred on gurneys. Koala, Hack, Sabo, Ace, and Luffy all took it upon themselves to help, Koala helping two who needed assistance walk while the others gave piggyback rides to those who couldn't walk. It took a bit of time, but eventually all the children had been safely transferred and were resting in the Revolutionaries' infirmary. "Thank you all for your help and cooperation," Hack said gratefully from where he and Koala stood on the Moby. "As long as the children are alright, it was our pleasure," Whitebeard said with a smile. Luffy smiled as well, liking that these two seemed to genuinely want to help people. "You two are good people. I like you," he said to them, many smiling at the words. Hack and Koala didn't understand the significance of the youngest's words, but everyone else did. Hack and Koala shared a look, having noticed that there seemed to be more meaning than it seemed behind the boy's words, and smiled back. "We like you too, Luffy. We'll tell Dragon-san you're doing alright," Koala said, remembering the fact that this was their son. Maybe she should have been more respectful around him. "Hold on, you guys have like, a super secret base, right? No one knows where it is?" Ace suddenly asked, as if he'd just had an idea. The two revolutionaries gave him curious looks but nodded slowly. "Yes, that happens to be the case," Hack said cautiously. "And if you had something, say a devil fruit that needed to stay hidden and untouched, you could make that happen, right?" Ace continued, many catching on to what he was asking. "We could," Koala confirmed. They watched as Ace looked to Whitebeard, the man also seeming to be thinking hard about something. Luffy was frowning now, knowing what they were talking about as well and trying to ignore the dark fruit on their ship. He'd been doing relatively well in ignoring it as of late, but there was always that mass of darkness just trying to have a hold on him. "Would you two mind if we asked a favor of you?" Whitebeard asked, piquing the two's interest. "Depends on what the favor is," Hack said, still cautious. "You see, we had an incident not too long ago now. As a result, we became in possession of what we have good reason to believe is a devil fruit that no one should eat," Whitebeard began explaining. "It's bad," Luffy said, shivering minutely. Hack and Koala watched, curiosity rising as they listened. They'd only known Luffy for a short time, but they knew that due to the facility he had powers they had never worked with before, and everyone else seemed to take his powers seriously, so they probably should too. If he said it was bad, it probably was. "You want us to keep it safe and uneaten?" Hack guessed, Whitebeard nodding. "Yes, if you can," Whitebeard said, everyone watching to see what the verdict would be. Koala and Hack shared another look before he sighed. "We'll have to ask Dragon first," he said, to which Whitebeard nodded again. "Of course. If you cannot do this, we understand," he told them. Hack nodded, pulling out a den and heading over to their own ship, leaving Koala alone with the Whitebeards. "Do you know what kind of devil fruit it is?" she asked Luffy, Ace and Sabo, the closest ones to her. "It's dark," Luffy muttered with a frown, looking over to the doors leading below deck. Koala followed his eyesight, deciding that was most likely where the fruit was being held. "Dark? Like, its powers?" she questioned, not sure what Luffy meant. "The fruit itself is dark is what he means, and no, before you ask, not its color. As mentioned before, Luffy can feel people's emotions, as well as two other emotions we're not entirely sure of. Warmth and darkness. Bad people have the darkness, and this fruit, according to Luffy, has a lot of darkness," Sabo explained. "But wait, it's a devil fruit. He can feel emotions from a devil fruit?" Koala asked. Sabo sighed, shrugging. "We're not quite sure how it works either. We weren't exactly given a manual on our abilities," he said. Koala nodded in understanding before her eyes widened and she turned to face him. "Wait, our abilities? You two have them too?" she asked incredulously, Sabo grinning slyly to her and Ace snickering. "Yes, however, they're not the same as Luffy. We all have different abilities," Sabo told her. "What are they? Is that how you knew the kids were scared in the infirmary?" she asked, but Sabo said nothing on that subject. "Hack is returning," he said without turning, confusing Koala when she saw that the fishman wasn't there. "What do you—" Before she could finish her sentence, Hack's head popped over the railing as he climbed the rope ladder. She narrowed her eyes at the still grinning blonde, annoyed that he was purposely not telling her the information she wanted to know. Sure, it could be brushed off as knowing hockey, but by the look on his face, Koala suspected it had to do with these abilities of his. Ace was still laughing, and Luffy had joined in now too, thoughts of the devil fruit gone. "Dragon has said that he will ensure the fruit stays hidden and uneaten. He told me to tell you he is returning the favor," Hack said, not entirely sure what favor Whitebeard had done Dragon but having a few guesses as he looked over to Luffy. "I understand. Kingdu, would you mind getting the devil fruit?" he asked, Kingdu leaving to do as told. "What are your names, anyway? I know Luffy, but you two have yet to introduce yourselves," Koala said as they waited, talking to Ace and Sabo. The three of them were still grinning at her, but the mischief was gone from them. "You haven't seen our wanted posters?" Ace asked in a tone of disbelief. Most everyone had, and when they had the misfortune of stepping onto an unknown island they were always given looks of fear for being the monsters that they were. "I have, but when I saw them it was before they'd ever put your actual names on them. I've been a bit busy with liberating facilities to keep up with updated bounty posters," Koala admitted. knowing she should have kept up to date, regardless of her work. It was her job to have information on the world, and she was severely lacking. She was still new to this though, even if it has been 5 years since she joined the revolution. Well then, I'm Sabo, and these are my brothers Ace and Luffy. It's nice to officially meet you, Sabo said politely, taking off his hat and gesturing to his brothers as he introduced them. Ace gave a half wave while Luffy beamed and waved enthusiastically to them. Likewise, Hack said with a nod of his head. Here you go, Kingdu suddenly said beside them, holding a small chest in his hands. Luffy's smile dropped as he eyed the box, stepping away from it and closer to Ace and Sabo instead. Thank you. We'll be sure it's hidden away, Hack assured again as he took the chest, he and Koala both noticing Luffy's reaction to it. Finally, it was time for the revolutionaries to leave. Devil fruit, children and information on the facility all retrieved. They readied their small ship to set sail and with a short farewell, they were gone. Luffy stayed at the railing for a while, feeling the darkness that had hovered like a cloud over the Moby slowly drift away. Thatch was safe, they had rescued children from a facility, and the dark devil fruit was gone. Things were looking up despite the fact that with all those goods was the bad. Thatch was safe, but Teach had attacked, the facility was taken down, but that came with the knowledge that there were more facilities out there, and the devil fruit was gone, but now they had no way of keeping an eye on it. With good comes bad, and vice versa. All Luffy could do was be grateful that everyone he loved was still safe. Another 2 weeks passed by slowly on the Moby as they sailed through relatively calm waters. News had spread that, once again, a group of children had escaped a mental facility, all of it orchestrated by Ace, Sabo, and Luffy, which caused an increase in their bounties. It was no surprise to anyone that that was what the Marines came up with to save face, but it didn't mean it wasn't annoying to see the blatant lies and cover-ups. As planned before they had saved the children, the Moby was heading to another island, also not under their protection. They'd hit some rocky waters, and the weather hadn't been particularly nice, which set them back, but now they were nearly there. Despite the bad weather and delays, Luffy had never been happier. The devil fruit was finally gone, and with it, all the darkness that had radiated off of it, suffocating the Moby. The ship was lighter now, and even if there was bad weather, Luffy felt like it was lighter. Now, the weather was cleared up, the waters were calm, and the newest island was in the distance. Docking was being prepared and Luffy knew he should be helping Ace and Sabo were after all, but he was too excited. Every new island, every new adventure, was just as exciting as the last. It would never get old to him, so instead of helping as he should, he sat on the railing, legs swinging off the side of the Moby as he smiled ear to ear and gripped the railing with both hands to keep steady. Oi, Luffy, come on and help, Ace called over, rolling his eyes as he did. Luffy turned to look at his brother, still beaming, and laughed. In a minute, he called back, wanting to watch the island for a moment more. Behind him, Ace grumbled and Sabo told him he should expect this by now, but Luffy ignored them both, basking in the sun, in the happiness, in the light. It took him another 5 minutes, which Ace was sure to scold him for, but he eventually got down off the railing and helped get ready. Whitebeard was radiating his usual warmth as he watched over them all, and that was almost as good as sitting on the railing for Luffy as he walked by the captain. Finally, the darkness was gone from the Moby, both fruit and Teach, and all that remained was the warmth, the love, the happiness. He laughed to himself as he continued working. Luffy's been in a good mood lately, Sabo asked as he and Ace walked leisurely through the small village on the island. It was one of 7 villages on the medium-sized island, each village bigger than the last. They were in the smallest of the villages, deciding that would be best so there weren't too many people scared. You got that right. He's been smiling all day. All week really. Even during that storm. Ace said with a sigh, though he was smiling. It's probably got to do with that devil fruit being gone. There's no more darkness around, Sabo suggested. Ace nodded beside him, the two going silent now as they walked. Ace's division had been sent to do the restocking this time. They were still high in supplies from the last island, so only one division was necessary to grab supplies, and for the rotation, Ace's division was next to do the one-man restocking. Of course, with the facility being liberated they needed more food and medical supplies, but it wasn't anything they couldn't handle on their own. Ace had split up the division into groups, each in charge of getting its own list of things, and he, Sabo and Luffy were in charge of grabbing some more wood for some minor repairs. The Moby was a strong ship, but even she had suffered some minimal damage during the storm they had sailed through. Of course, Ace and Sabo were just fine with gathering the supplies, Luffy too even. However, the youngest had been in such a good mood that he'd rocketed himself off ahead of his brothers, and if it weren't for Sabo's hearing they would have been in more of a rush to chase after him. As it was now, Sabo could hear him talking to a few people from the sounds of it, children, and entertaining them as he waited for Ace and Sabo to catch up to him. Have you talked to Whiskey about, Ace suddenly asked, breaking the peaceful silence. Sabo sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. A little. You? Sabo asked, watching as Ace began kicking a pebble along the path. His brother shrugged, stuffing his hands in his pockets. A little. he said, repeating Sabo's words. Do you want to talk about it now? Sabo asked, wondering why his brother would have mentioned the facility if he didn't seem to have much to say about it. Ace was quiet a minute longer, and Sabo was ready to let the conversation drop altogether before Ace spoke again. I told Whiskey about the rooms the kids were being held in, the ones with the beds and stuff. Ace started with a frown, not looking at Sabo. The blonde nodded, staying quiet to let his brother continue. She asked me how it made me feel and stuff, and I admitted that I was kind of jealous that they had beds and rooms and we had a shitty cell in the floor. Ace continued. As he talked, Sabo made sure that no one was paying too close attention to them, but everyone around them was minding their own business. Which is stupid cause those kids were still hurt and I was jealous they got to sleep in a bed at night. Sabo frowned at his brother's words but again remained silent. Whiskey said that it was alright that I felt jealous or angry or even happy, cause they were my feelings and I was starting to figure out how to pinpoint what I was feeling and why I was feeling it. She told me I had a right to be jealous, that what was done to us, to the other children, was wrong and she wouldn't be surprised if every child that was in the facility with us, our facility, felt the same way as I did. He said, trailing off at the end. There was another moment of silence as Sabo thought over his brother's words, trying to find a response. It wasn't often they talked about these things with each other, even though they knew they could, and he was actually happy that Ace was talking to him rather than keeping all these thoughts and emotions inside. I didn't see the rooms myself, but when you and Luffy told me about them, honestly, I kind of felt a bit jealous myself. It didn't seem fair that, as you said, we got a hard cold floor and the kids there got beds and pillows. Even a window. Sabo admitted, sighing. I think the thing I was most jealous of was the fact that they had windows. I would have killed for one of those in our cell. Sabo said, voice soft now. Ace scoffed beside him. Me too. Of all the things to be jealous of, we're jealous of a bunch of tortured kids getting a tiny window. The eldest said with a dry chuckle. Sabo laughed along with him, smiling now. I'm glad you got me to start talking to Whiskey, Ace said eventually, also smiling slightly. Oh, that's quite a change from when we were arguing to the point that Luffy had to leave the room. Sabo said, though there was no malice as he spoke, merely poking fun at his brother. Ace picked up on this and rolled his eyes, bumping shoulders with the blonde. You should know me by now. I wasn't going to talk to some nurse about the facility willingly. I had to fight about it first, Ace said with a cheeky grin. Yeah, and make my life harder as a result, Sabo replied, bumping shoulders back. The conversation dropped now as they turned the corner and found Luffy there, drawing on the ground with two kids who looked to be siblings, a boy and a girl. And this is the dragon that took the princess, the boy said, drawing with a green piece of chalk. Can it breathe fire? Luffy asked animatedly, obviously enthralled in the drawings. Duh, the boy said, smiling as well as he drew what Ace and Sabo guessed were wings. And the princess was taken to a castle. In the tower where she's waiting for the prince to save her, the girl said, drawing said castle out of purple chalk. A princess-esque drawing inside one of the castle windows. The little girl looked around and the boy couldn't have been older than 6. Well, the prince can wear this cool armor, Luffy suggested, drawing as he spoke. The children watched in awe, amazed at the idea and nodding enthusiastically. Yeah, and he has to have a horse too, to ride into battle, the boy added. And he has to have a crown, because he's a prince, the girl said. Luffy's oddly good with kids. Ace said as he and Sabo watched their brother play with the two who were much younger than him. He's practically a kid himself, teenager or not, Sabo said with a laugh. Luffy seemed to finally notice their presence now, looking up at them and waving. Ace, Sabo. You caught up, Luffy said, the two kids looking up in surprise at the two. Yeah, and how many times do we have to tell you not to rocket ahead of us? Ace asked with a raised eyebrow as he crossed his arms over his chest. But it's fun, and faster. You two are slowpokes, Luffy said with a pout. Either way, we should go and get the supplies now. You said you wanted to go look at the other villages too, right Lou? If we take too long we won't even get to see the nearest one today, Sabo said, Luffy's eyes widening as he realized this. Right, see you two later, Luffy said, standing and waving to the children. Bye Luffy, they said with a smile as they waved back. The three brothers began their walk together now, heading towards the shops they would need to visit. Luffy rambled to his older brothers about Layla and Kane, the two children, and told them that they had been fighting when Luffy landed on the street. He had talked to them and before he knew it they were all drawing with the chalk and making up a story about a princess. They made up a few other stories, but they were more focused on the princess one out of them all. So what did you guys do? Luffy asked once he was done telling them about his mini adventure. Ace and Sabo shared a look before the blonde looked to Luffy again. We were talking about the facility and our talks with Whiskey, Sabo said truthfully. There wasn't any need to hide it from the youngest, so he didn't. Oh, Luffy said, looking to be thinking about something. Hey Luffy, how have you been? You know, since we've been to the other facility? Ace asked gently, slowly. He didn't want to force his brother into talking about it if he didn't want to. But he and Sabo were both genuinely curious. They hadn't been able to figure out how their brother was feeling on the whole situation, and it was disconcerting to them. "Me? I don't know," Luffy admitted, looking to the ground. "I was scared, cause there was another facility, but then I was mad at the doctors," Luffy said, trying to figure out how he had felt. It was hard sometimes for him to figure out what were his emotions and what were other people's emotions. Was he happy because he was actually happy right now? Or was he happy because someone nearby was happy and he just didn't realize it? It was unpleasant to always feel everyone else's emotions as well as your own. "What about afterward? After we got the children out? Now, are you alright?" Sabo asked. "I think so. I don't feel sad anymore, or scared, or angry. I'm happy right now," Luffy told them, thinking hard so he could answer truthfully. "That's good. If you don't feel happy you can talk to Sabo or I anytime. You know that, right?" Ace asked, ruffling Luffy's hair as he spoke. Luffy hummed in agreement, smiling to the two. They smiled back, letting silence take over once more. Another few minutes later they were walking into the main shopping district of the town and made a beeline for the shop they knew they needed to be in. Supplies were purchased quickly, Sabo and Ace knowing exactly what they needed to get while Luffy was there to help carry it all back to the Moby. With each brother holding a box of their purchases they began the walk back to the Moby, chatting aimlessly about the going-ons of the crew, news they'd heard, or what they thought the chefs might make for lunch. There was a small debate over whether they would even be there for lunch, Ace and Luffy thinking it would be more fun to go to the next town and eat there, while Sabo thought they may as well stay and eat on the Moby seeing as it'd be about lunchtime when they got back. All in all, the three had a peaceful walk through the village, and even though they weren't exploring the island and going on adventures, they were still having fun and making memories. The three didn't end up staying for lunch on the Moby. Luffy and Ace had outvoted Sabo and it was decided they would spend their allowances on food at the next village. They wouldn't be staying on the island long, this was merely a supply run and they would probably be gone by tomorrow, so they wanted to get in all the exploration they could. The two villages were relatively close together, and within a half hour, they were within the neighboring village, smiles on their faces and stomachs rumbling in anticipation. As Ace and Sabo began discussing whether they wanted to go to some stalls and eat as they walked or go inside somewhere, Luffy smelled something particularly delicious, his mouth watering at the smell. He hadn't meant to wander off without telling his brothers after all. He'd just gotten in trouble earlier for rocketing ahead of them. He didn't want to get into more trouble, but the smell was so tempting that he found himself changing direction and going right towards it. Ace and Sabo continued walking down the street, unaware that Luffy had just drifted behind them and made a right down a side street, following his nose and nothing else. By the time they did notice, they had already gotten to the heart of the village, and when they turned to get Luffy's opinion on where to eat they were left blinking at the empty spot behind them. "He's like a ninja or something," Ace muttered, slightly surprised Luffy had left without them noticing. "I blame Ruta entirely for that," Sabo said, pinching his nose and closing his eyes as he tried listening for where their brother could be. "Sounds like he followed his nose. Literally. He's in a bar or something, I'm not really sure," Sabo said, walking off in their brother's direction. Ace followed, trusting that Sabo knew where he was going, and laced his hands together behind his head. "Maybe we should put a bell on him. That way you'd hear him walking off," Ace suggested with a chuckle to himself. "Or a leash. He can't walk off at all that way," Sabo said. Ace nodded in agreement at that idea. "Hey, at least he found somewhere we can eat," the eldest said with a shrug, looking at the bright side of things. It could be annoying when Luffy wandered off without a word, but it was just something he did. In another few minutes, they were walking into what was definitely a bar, Luffy sitting in a stool at the bar itself, shoveling a plate of food into his mouth. The bartender was cleaning a glass as he watched Luffy with a raised eyebrow, a slightly amused expression on his face. "Luffy, we just had a conversation on wandering off," Ace said sternly as he and Sabo walked up. Luffy turned to look at them, cheeks full of food as he smiled at them. "Ash, Sabo," Luffy said through his mouthful. Sabo was about to scold Luffy for once again talking with his mouth full, and he and Ace hadn't even sat down when a woman came running out from the back, eyes wide. She caught everyone's attention and they all watched as she scanned the room, which was empty except for them seeing as it was still relatively early in the day. The second she spotted them, Luffy still shoveling in the food, her eyes grew wider if that was even possible and she rushed over, placing a hand on Luffy and stopping him from eating. "How much of this did you eat?" she asked, worry and fear on her face. Ace and Sabo frowned, realizing that something might be wrong with the food, but Luffy looked unalarmed. He tilted his head, thinking. "A lot," he said, moving to begin eating again. "Wait, hold on, you can't eat it," she said, trying once again to stop Luffy, which only made him annoyed. "Why not?" Ace asked, and food carefully, "Because well, the guys in the back, they poisoned it," Luffy told them with such nonchalance it made both the woman and bartender blanch at them. "You knew that? And you still ate it?" she asked in shock, stumbling away from him. Luffy began eating the food again, nodding. "You do know you'll have to see whiskey after this," She'll be pissed if she somehow hears you ate poison and didn't at least go for a checkup," Sabo said with a sigh as he sat beside his brother. There was a wave of burning anger in him at whoever served his brother poison, but he knew it wasn't going to have an effect on him, so he was able to curb it for now. Ace on the other hand, "I'm gonna kill him," the eldest growled out, a scowl on his face as his eyes moved to the door that most likely led to the kitchen. "But they made me good food," Luffy whined in an attempt at stopping his brother. "Food that they poisoned," Ace yelled back to him, giving his brother an incredulous look. "To be fair, we are wanted," Sabo noted, understanding why it had been done, but not liking it either. "Hold on a minute. He's eating the food. The poison," the woman said, pointing to the meal that was nearly gone. "Yes, he is, and he'll be fine. Our brother has a bit of a, iron stomach," Sabo said, searching for the right words. After Luffy's literal death in the facility, he'd grown an extremely high tolerance to poison, and unless the poison itself was extremely lethal, it wouldn't hurt him. Seeing as their bounties were alive only, Sabo was willing to bet that whatever poison the cooks had used, it was non-lethal, and thus wouldn't harm Luffy in the slightest. "Are you sure?" the bartender asked, worry etched into his features as he also watched Luffy eat. "Forget that you're going to have to hire some new chefs," Ace said, bringing the attention back to him as they watched him march into the back. Sabo rubbed his temple but didn't stop him, knowing it would be useless. I wanted more food before Ace beat him up," Luffy said with a pout, shoveling the last few forkfuls into his mouth all at once. "We'll grab more food on the way back to the Moby. How about that? Best we get there sooner rather than later now that Whiskey needs to look you over," Sabo said, both he and Luffy ignoring the screaming coming from the back, as well as the two behind the bar, still staring with wide eyes and dropped jaws. "Yosh, Ace, hurry up. We have more food to eat," Luffy shouted over the screaming. "How much for the food?" Sabo asked the bartender. The man blinked a few times, trying to rid himself of his shock. "And nothing, it's free of charge," he eventually managed to stutter out. "Are you sure? I would be fine with paying," Sabo said, knowing Ace would refuse to pay, and with good reason. "No, I couldn't ask you to pay, not when your food was poisoned," he said, seemingly over the shock now as he denied Sabo's money. The blonde shrugged, patting the pouch of money at his side. "Suit yourself. Come on Ace, we have to go see Whiskey now and it's another half-hour back to the Moby," Sabo called to his brother, he and Luffy both standing from their stools and heading to the doors. "Hold on, I'll be there in a second," Ace called back, and within a few seconds, a man was flying through the door that led to the back, crashing into a table and staying down. Ace emerged after, grin on his face and fire licking his shoulders as he placed his hat back on his head. "Alright, I'm done," he said, looking pleased with himself as he began walking up to them. The bartender and woman watched the three as they began chatting amongst themselves. All smiles and laughs now, as if the littlest of them hadn't just eaten a whole plate of food that had been laced with poison. Remember that report that called them monsters?" the woman asked in a whisper. The bartender nodded mutely beside her. "I think it was pretty accurate," he said, picking up another glass and beginning cleaning it. "Hello boys. How was your trip?" Whitebeard asked as the brothers walked back on board the Moby, sticks with meat on them in their hands. "Good. Luffy got poisoned. I beat up some guys who poisoned Luffy." The responses were simultaneous, and many on deck did a double take at the nonchalance of their words. Wait, Luffy was poisoned," Thatch asked from where he'd been resting, sitting against the rail. "Yup. The food was good though, so it was fine," Luffy said with a shrug, the brothers still walking as if it was no big deal. "Is he alright?" Atmos asked in worry, he and Thatch beginning to follow the brothers in an attempt at getting answers. "Yeah, we never mentioned it before, but Luffy has a high tolerance to poisons. He's fine, but Whiskey'll kill us if we don't let her do a checkup, so that's where we're headed now," Sabo said, the three saying they'd be back soon before they walked into the Moby. Everyone could only stare at the door the brothers had entered in shock. All in all, it was another normal day on the Moby. Staring up at the stars in the night sky, Sabo couldn't help but feel calm. Even with all of the thoughts running through his mind, all the worries and anxieties, the fear. Even with all of that, he still had the stars to keep him calm, keep him grounded. It was the middle of the night, and he knew he should be sleeping. He would regret this in the morning, but his mind was too busy to let him sleep. It frustrated him to the point that he had to go and sit on the Moby's deck for fear of waking Luffy up with his strong emotions, or even worse, causing the youngest to have a nightmare because he was unknowingly and subconsciously influenced by the blonde's fear and anxiety. After everything with the second facility, the memories, the doctors, the sounds, and worst of all, finding out Haru was still around, Sabo couldn't stop the voice in the back of his head telling him that at any minute he would turn around and the horrible doctor would be standing there, ready to take him to another one of his tests. He took a deep breath and tried to push that image from his mind, refocusing back on the stars. The revolutionaries had come and taken both the children and the devil fruit that they'd all been worried about, which was a plus, but with them, they also took all of the information they had on the facility. Well, almost all of it. Sabo wasn't going to let Haru's file go, not even if it meant angering the army Luffy's dad was in charge of. He had Marco keep the file in his room, worried that if he kept it in his own, Ace or Luffy would find it. Of course, it was only a matter of time until they stumbled upon it, no matter how well he hid it, and then they would know Haru was back too. He knew that he should tell them about the doctor, tell them that he was back, but he couldn't bring himself to. It would cause them so much pain, so much unnecessary fear, that he wanted to avoid telling them at all costs. If they found out about Haru from someone else and realized he hadn't told them, that would be just as bad though. What if they managed to find the file, or Marco gives and tells them himself, or, worse of all, they see Haru in person? He took in another shaky breath, trying to ease the shaking in his hands by running his fingers through his hair. It didn't work. Like he had been before, he would ignore it and hope he never had to worry about it. What were the chances that they ran into Haru? Marco was a good man. He wouldn't tell Luffy and Ace without at least consulting him first. And he could hide one measly file from his brothers. How hard could that be? Sure, he'd agreed to tell his brothers eventually, but why couldn't eventually be decades from now, when none of this mattered anymore, preferably when Haru was long dead? One last sigh and Sabo decided that he should at least go and give sleeping another attempt. It hadn't come easy in the past few weeks, but maybe his luck would turn around. Getting up, he waved goodnight to the passing patrol and headed back towards his shared room. He, not for the first time, envied Ace's night vision as he hugged the wall in an attempt to not lose his way in the dark hall. But soon he was opening their door, knowing it was theirs only from the sounds of his snoring brothers inside. Well, brother was more like it. Where were you? Ace asked, and Sabo could tell he'd probably only just woke up, his words all said with a slight slur and his voice groggy. Outside. I couldn't sleep. Sabo replied truthfully, stumbling to the bed without too much difficulty. Nightmares? Ace asked, laying back down from the sounds of it. Sabo took his boots off before getting into the bed and laying down as well. No, thinking too much, he answered, staring blindly towards the ceiling. You're good at that, Ace said with a yawn, rolling over in the bed. The blanket was pulled a little as Ace tugged it, and Sabo tugged back, not willing to lose any more of the warm cover than he'd already had. I'm taking that as a compliment, Sabo grumbled as he rolled onto his side as well. You shouldn't. Months went by and Sabo was able to mostly push Haru from his mind. On some days he was even lucky enough not to think about the man at all. At the beginning of the year the crew had held a New Year party while Ace, Sabo, and Luffy, along with the commanders, celebrated Ace's birthday, and on Sabo's birthday, the 20th of March, there was another similar get-together. Ace and Sabo didn't want big parties or a bunch of presents. Heck, Ace didn't even want to celebrate at all. So just the small get-together was more than enough for them. When it came to May 5th, however, it became a bit crazy. Luffy, the youngest of all the crew members, had a birthday on May the 5th, Children's Day, and of course, Luffy was not opposed to parties one bit. Thatch took it upon himself to bake the celebratory cake, big enough that Luffy was able to have plenty and there would still be enough for the rest of the crew, and some of the crew members would get the team some small gifts. Not everyone did, which was understandable because if every single person on the crew bought Luffy a present it would be overkill and there would be no more space for the brothers in their room, but there were still quite a few who did. With as many crew members as there was on the Moby, it was inevitable that there would be overlapping birthdays, as well as birthdays nearly every week in the year, so it wasn't a surprise that there were 2 other crewmates with their birthdays on the same day. However, they weren't opposed to letting Luffy be the center of attention for the day. They got their own specialized cupcakes from Thatch like everyone always got on their birthdays, and they got congratulations as well as a few gifts from their closer friends and crewmates, but for the most part, the attention was on Luffy. Of course, the youngest adored the attention. He loved being the center of everyone's affection, he loved food, and he loved the gifts everyone would give him. He'd never really celebrated his birthday before. Back on his home island before he met Ace and Sabo he remembered the few birthdays he had in the village where Makino would bake him a cake and give him a present, usually new clothes or shoes, and that would be that. It was small, it was quiet, and honestly, a little lonely. As much as he loved Makino and appreciated those birthdays with her, he could remember being lonely over the fact that it was just the 2 of them. His grandpa was rarely around, much less for his birthday, and none of the other village kids ever wanted to play with him, which meant he'd had no friends. It was lonely, but he still loved the memory of Makino cheering him up. After he'd met Ace and Sabo, they'd only had the chance to celebrate his and Sabo's birthday before they'd been taken, and they'd done it the same way they did every day. Hunted, sparred, and stole money for their pirate fund. Once they'd been taken, they hadn't really been able to celebrate, and they hadn't even been able to keep track of days to figure out if it was even their birth month. They would still tell each other happy birthday when they felt enough time had passed for it to be that time again, but they couldn't know for sure whether they'd even done it in the right season. Now, though, he had all these people surrounding him, he knew for sure it was his birthday, and he could actually enjoy the day for what it was. It was a fantastic feeling, and he enjoyed every second of it. 19. Ace and Sabo were both 19 now. Luffy was already 16. It was the day after Luffy's party, and Ace couldn't quite believe how much time had passed since they had gotten out of the facility. Leaning against the arm of Whitebeard's chair, he watched Luffy catapult himself, mop in hand, to the upper deck so he could swab it, Sabo running after him and yelling at him not to rocket himself when he's mopping the deck. Ace couldn't help but smile as he watched them. Even though Sabo seemed angry, he was smiling soon and laughing the entire time. It was a stark contrast to only a few years ago when they were dirty, cold, hungry, in pain, tired, scared. Focusing on the clouds, Ace stopped that train of thought, knowing it would do him no good to think about those things right now. He and his brothers had done a pretty good job at managing their memories of the facility with Whiskey's help. It was easier to stop themselves from getting sucked into the memories, the emotions. Watching a cloud slowly change its shape, Ace let his mind wander onto other things. In just the short, yet long, amount of time they'd been with the Whitebeards, so much had happened. The brothers were getting help, Ace was a commander, and Luffy was only a year away from setting sail and pursuing his own dream of becoming the Pirate King. He had loudly exclaimed it during his party yesterday when someone asked what his dream was. Unlike when they were kids, Luffy hadn't shouted his dream to everyone he met, so many didn't even know about his goal to become the king, but after yesterday, they did. He'd gone around, all smiley, and announced to anyone who would listen that he was going to leave at 17 and become the Pirate King. He'd even told Whitebeard that meant he would come back and fight him, to which everyone, including Whitebeard, laughed. Ace and Sabo had watched with nostalgic smiles, realizing for the first time that they'd sorely missed Luffy telling anyone and everyone his dreams, even if they did tell him how annoying it was. Watching his youngest brother as he hit Sabo with his mop, soaking the blonde, another fond smile crossed Ace's face. If anyone could become the Pirate King, he knew it would be his little brother. 2 whole years the brothers had been out of the facility, and in that time, Garp had yet to visit. It wasn't surprising, after all. He'd barely visited the brothers when they were on an island, and now that they were on a well-known pirate ship, it made it even more difficult for the man to visit, which the brothers had no qualms with. Honestly, they'd forgotten the man had even promised he would visit, and that was their first mistake. Their second was being out in the open when he did arrive. Where are my shitty grandsons? The 3 hadn't even had a chance to go and hide before their terrifying grandfather laid his eyes on them. There you 3 are. Do you see these bounties? You 3 are notorious criminals? The 3 were barely even listening, the blood pounding in their ears as they watched with wide eyes as Garp held up their posters and marched their way. The spell was broken quickly though, and the first thing they did was run. The crowd parted, not wanting to get mowed down, and they watched as Luffy's arms stretched and he climbed into the rigging, Ace, and Sabo yelling about how unfair it was until Garp grabbed a barrel and threw it at the monkey, knocking his balance off and causing him to fall back to the deck where the chance commenced. And don't think I forgot about all the damage you caused to that port, Ace. I got an earful for that one. Good, maybe if they nag you enough you'll finally drop dead, you old geezer. Is that any way to speak to your grandfather? The crew could only watch or run as the 4 ran around the deck. Occasionally Garp would throw things to slow the brothers, but for the most part, it was running, shoving, and jumping. It wasn't until Garp finally caught the 3 that things calmed down. After he'd punched all of them over the head and lectured them, they were able to have a quiet conversation amongst themselves that no one dared to interrupt. Even though the brothers looked hurt and sore, they still talked to their grandfather and told him about the different things they'd done, one of those things being rescuing another facility. Luffy could feel how proud the man was of them, and he didn't lecture them like he had whenever they told him about their other adventures. He merely laughed, said a quiet, good, and they'd moved on from the topic. They didn't tell him anything about the Whitebeards, such as Teach's betrayal, or anything like that, because they knew their grandfather like Luffy would sometimes blurt things out without thinking, and that could cause them trouble. If it was important enough, like Ace and Luffy's parents, or the brothers' facility gained abilities, they could count on him to keep his mouth shut, but with pirate information, better safe than sorry. Garp only stayed until after lunch, and then he was off, telling them to stay out of trouble and to train harder. It wasn't as bittersweet a farewell as it had been when they'd first gotten out of the facility. It was more akin to the old days, where Garp would show up in the jungle for a bit and then leave without too many words. Maybe they'd be better hidden next time he visited. Ace was off on a mission, alone, and Luffy couldn't help but worry. He sat on the railing like he always did whenever Ace went on missions, and he watched his brothers wave closely. On either side of Ace's wave was Sabo and Marcos, all 3 bright and opaque like Luffy hoped they'd always be. He could feel amusement from those walking around the deck, many finding it funny how much Luffy worried at times like these. Luffy didn't mind, he knew it was a bit much, but he couldn't help it. Even though he knew Ace was strong, whenever the eldest went away he couldn't help but worry that his brother would get in trouble and he and Sabo wouldn't be there to help him. Whiskey told him it was because of how they'd grown up, how Ace, Sabo, and Luffy had never left each other's sides, and if they had it was never for a good reason. In the facility, if a brother was alone in the testing room, that meant bad news, And Whiskey told him that was why he was worried over Ace now, because, even though they were out of the facility, Ace being gone was associated with the eldest getting hurt. The two of them were still working on getting him over this, because not only was it unhealthy for Luffy to need someone to keep tabs on him lest he start skipping meals unknowingly, it was also necessary if he was going to leave the Whitebeards one day. If he wanted to become the Pirate King, he couldn't sit at the railing of his own ship for days on end and watch the three waves in front of him at all times. He knew he had to stop this, but he couldn't help but do it every time. "Come on Luffy, just for a half hour, and then you can come back," Whiskey urged quietly beside him. He frowned, gripping the railing tightly in his fists. "But what if he gets hurt?" Luffy asked, eyes not moving from the bright red wave. "Ace is strong Luffy, and even if he does get hurt he has his fast healing, remember? And if worst comes to worst, he knows that basic first aid that Whiskey taught us all," Sabo said from his other side. Whiskey had told him it would help if Luffy could at least keep one brother in view during the time he wasn't watching the wave, to make it a little easier on him, and Sabo wanted Luffy to get help so he agreed without hesitation. "I can come right back, after a half hour?" Luffy asked after a minute of silent thinking. "Yes. We're going to go eat in the galley and talk to the others, and then when you're done, you can come right back here," Whiskey assured. It took another minute for Luffy to think it over before he was hesitantly getting off the railing, eyes darting to the red wave as he did. Even though he could see the wave no matter where he was, it was easier for him to concentrate on it when he had no distractions, like when he was just watching the ocean. Going in the galley, eating, talking, he wouldn't be able to pay much attention to the wave, and that was the goal of this whole exercise. "Good job, Lou. Hey, I heard Thatch made lots of meat today, and some of those rolls that you like," Sabo said, nudging Luffy gently with his elbow, a small smile on his face. Luffy hummed noncommittally, letting the waves slowly fade away as he paid more attention to walking Y and Sabo. "And did you hear that he was even thinking about making dessert today?" Whiskey asked, smiling as well. Luffy looked at her, eyes widening. "Really?" he asked, suddenly invested in the conversation. "Oh yeah, I heard he was going to be making some of that chocolate ice cream again," Sabo confirmed with a nod. Luffy had stars in his eyes as he left the two side, running into the galley and straight to Thatch. Sabo and Whiskey smiled. "Well, it's a start. Every mealtime we should get him to go to the galley himself rather than bring him food to the railing. If he absolutely refuses, or Ace's wave gets dimmer, we might have to make exceptions, but otherwise, we can't let him continue letting himself waste away over there," Whiskey said. Sabo nodded at her side, listening carefully so he could help in the future. "We should try and get him to take baths too, but I'm not worried about that just yet. Maybe the next time Ace takes a mission. For now, meals are our goal," she finished. "I think we can manage that," Sabo agreed. "Come on Marco, please." "Yeah Marco, please," Marco sighed in exasperation as he rubbed his forehead. "Ruda, you're a bad example, Yoi," Marco said in annoyance, trying to ignore the two. "What do you mean? I'm teaching Luffy here valuable life skills, like persuasion, and how to hit moving targets," Haruda said, gesturing to Luffy who was grinning beside him. "Yeah, so come on Marco, please, 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 please." "It's still no, so stop asking," Marco interrupted, not wanting to figure out long Luffy could repeat the same word. He didn't doubt that it would be a while. "Ah, but why?" Haruda and Luffy both whined simultaneously, visibly deflating in front of him. He rolled his eyes at the Theatrix, crossing his arms over his chest. "Because why would I want to fly around so you can have Luffy try rocketing at me? Not only are we in the middle of the ocean right now, where you would more than likely land, but I'm also not fond of the idea of having a human projectile coming at me, Yoi," Marco said, trying to walk away so he wouldn't have to hear the two whine anymore. "But Marco," I said, "no, stingy." "Marines," Ace confirmed, Luffy cheering beside him and Sabo smiling. It had been a while since their last marine fight, so when Ace confirmed the incoming ship was a Marines, it made them all a little excited. It didn't take long for the Marine ship to reach them, and once it did, like always, they sprung into action. Marines boarded the Moby and the pirates boarded the Marines. This fight was no different from the hundreds they'd had before it, and the Whitebeards were going to be the obvious victors once again. Whitebeard watched over every fight from where he sat, not interfering, but prepared to if necessary. The commanders were all leading their divisions and helping crew members when needed. Like always, the trio of brothers stuck together, fighting in unison and watching not only their backs but their ship brothers as well. The fight was in their favor. They had the larger crew and more experience compared to this marine crew that was clearly only here because the captain thought this would be an easy fight like many before him had. Luffy hadn't seen the captain. He'd only briefly heard him yelling about taking Whitebeard's head, so when he did catch a glimpse of him and saw the dark color surrounding him, he instinctually shrunk back from the man. The black aura wasn't as bad as Teach or Haru. He didn't think he'd find anyone else who had colors that dark, but this captain didn't have a speck of gray either. It was a thick, slimy, black that oozed off the man and practically crept towards Luffy, threatening to taint anything in its way. "Luffy, Ace asked, checking on the youngest quickly as he ducked under a sword. He'd noticed Luffy's sudden pause in the fight, Sabo as well, and they were concerned about what had happened. Captain has black color, Luffy told them, peeling his eyes off of the man and back to his brothers. He did his best not to look back at the man, but he couldn't help but look back every few seconds. Ace and Sabo's faces grew more serious at the news and they nodded. Ace immediately broke from them and moved towards the captain instead, telling anyone he passed that the captain had a black color so that others would be more cautious around him. Sabo stayed with Luffy, the two of them keeping away from the captain, while Ace and some of the other commanders went to take care of the captain. It had happened a few times now that an opponent would have the darker colors, and when that was the case Luffy would tell them and the commanders would go and take care of it, everyone keeping a careful eye on whoever had the color to ensure no one got hurt around them. More often than not, the person with the darker colors was more vicious than the rest of their opponents. It wasn't that they were all that much stronger or scarier, but they didn't seem to have the same regard for human life than normal people did. Whereas a normal, good person would want to try and keep casualties especially of those on their side to a minimum, people with darker colors had a tendency to not have such a regard. They were the type to use human shields, even if that shield was a friend. So long as they got the desired result in the end, they didn't seem to care who they used or what they did. This was the case with the captain as well. The second he realized he was going to have company in the form of three commanders Ace, Marco and Atmos, he called his crew to come and cover him while he fired a gun from behind them. Sabo and Luffy continued fighting their own group of Marines, Luffy trying to focus on them rather than the commander's fight with the captain. He brought up Marco and Ace's waves, but he wasn't able to pay much attention to them while he was fighting. He tried to keep them in the corner of his eye though as he fought, watching for any translucence to them that would indicate someone was hurt. Ever since Marco and Luffy had created a wave together, the team had noticed that, whenever Marco got hurt, the wave would only flicker momentarily before becoming opaque once more, as if nothing had happened. It showed Luffy that, even though the man was getting hurt, he was healing just as fast. This happened to be the case now as well. The few times Marco would get hurt, Luffy would notice the flicker in the wave, but was reassured soon after when he looked closer and saw the bright azure blue still going strong. Ace's wave was taking a little damage, but it usually did during fights. Even Sabo's wave was fading just a tad, but it was nothing to be worried about yet. The fight continued on this way, Sabo and Luffy sticking together before moving on to fight with others from their division, all the while Luffy was watching the waves for any sign that there was trouble. Everyone was finishing up their fights, all divisions clearing up the Marines they'd been attacking, and Sabo and Luffy had just knocked out the last 3 Marines in their group when Luffy noticed that, at the same time a gun went off, Marco's wave flickered. He watched, waiting expectantly for it to heal and go back to normal, but seconds passed and it remained the same. His eyes went wide at this and he turned to where the commander was fighting, noticing he was no longer in his phoenix form flying in the air, but rather on the deck, holding his shoulder with bright blue and yellow flames coming from beneath his hand. Ace and Atmos looked unhappy as they continued trying to get to the Marine captain, but every time they tried there was another Marine in their way, blindly shielding their captain without any hesitation. Sabo had noticed Luffy's attention to the fight, realizing that something might be wrong, so he wasn't surprised when Luffy began running towards Marco, instead deciding to follow along. He'd heard the shot, but they were in a fight. Shooting wasn't exactly uncommon at the moment. "Marco?" Luffy asked as they grew closer, worry in the teen's voice. "Don't worry Luffy, Yoi, I'm fine. Sea stone bullet," Marco said, lifting his hand to show the two that the wound wasn't healing like it normally would. "I don't want it to heal over the bullet so I'm not letting it, sorry for worrying you," Marco said to Luffy, giving him a smile as he did. Luffy frowned, eyes flickering to the Marine captain that Ace and Atmos were finally getting closer to. Rikuyo and Flamenco had joined the fight now as well, having cleared their own Marines. "Let's go have whiskey take that out," Sabo said with a frown, looking to Luffy to see if he was paying attention. Marco nodded his agreement and the three began to leave the deck, Luffy still watching the fight carefully until it was no longer possible. At that point, he began watching Ace's wave. He didn't want to leave the fight, he wanted to stay and help too, but he knew they were going to be fine. They would take down the Marine captain easily, so he was fine to go with Marco and Sabo, even if the infirmary did smell. A fight, nurses were busy getting wounded the treatment they needed, everyone rushing this way and that as they did. When the three walked in they were quickly taken to a bed where Marco was told to wait for whiskey. Sabo updated them on the fight outside while they waited, telling them as more and more of the Marines were taken down until, finally, the captain was down as well, ending the fight. The Marine ship was raided before they let it drift off, any wounded on their side was being helped to the infirmary and it didn't seem like anyone was hurt too bad. When whiskey finally reached them she already had the necessary tools to take out the bullet and within minutes, it was out. Marco's flames burning brighter and covering the wound until they flickered out, leaving a healed patch of skin. "All good, Yoi?" he asked Luffy with a smirk. Luffy would know even better than whiskey in this case whether Marco was fully healed or not, and a quick check of Marco's wave told him he was just fine. Luffy hummed, grinning. He was happy everyone was alright. Even Ace's wave was healing up, his brother's fast healing being put to work. Good. If you'll excuse me, I have more patients to take care of, Whiskey said to them with a smile. Come on Lou, let's go help bring the injured here, Sabo suggested, stretching. Luffy agreed, Marco telling them he was going to speak to Whitebeard, and the three left the infirmary, all of them healthy. What are you, chicken? You scared we'll actually get you? Haruda teased, waggling his eyebrows while Luffy grinned beside him. I'm not chicken, I just don't want to give you two the chance to break something and blame it on me. I've heard enough out of Blenheim and Fosa this week, I don't need you two getting me in more trouble with them. Jiru said defensively, arms crossed as he looked away from the two, not letting himself get baited into joining the game these two wanted to play. Please, we need a target, Luffy urged, eyes big and a small pout on his face. Jiru nearly hesitated at the look but held strong. No way. Not happening, Jiru said, turning around completely now so he couldn't be tempted. It's just a little target practice, Jiru, you being the target of course. We want Luffy's aim to get better, don't we? What better way than by using a moving human target? Haruda asked, walking in front of Jiru's face again. I think I hear my division looking for me. Sorry, I'll talk to you two later, Jiru said, walking off quickly before they could stop him. Ah, Luffy whined, Haruda pouting beside him. Sabo walked through the town at a slow, calm, peaceful pace. It was evening, the sun was beginning to set on the horizon now, and Sabo was by himself, enjoying the peaceful air. Ace and Luffy had headed back to the Moby already, wanting to be the first ones to dinner since Thatch was making a feast today, so Sabo was left to meander back to the ship by his lonesome. He didn't mind, his brothers could be a bit much, so to have some time to himself in the sleepy town was nice. There was minor chatter around him as those that inhabited this small town talked amongst themselves, some buying last-minute items from the closing markets and others having idle conversations with their neighbors. He didn't focus too closely on any one conversation, he didn't like eavesdropping, so he didn't really know what anyone was talking about. He laced his fingers together behind his head, walking at a relaxed pace and looking up at the sky. Ever since the facility, he'd never taken the endless expanse of space above him for granted, and every day he found himself taking in the freedom of the sky, the warmth of the sun, the cover of the clouds. He smiled, enjoying the breeze that blew past him, trees swaying in the wind around him. He didn't think he'd ever get over the sensation of freedom from walking under the sky. Sabo! A voice broke him from his thoughts and he turned in confusion, wondering who was calling him. The voice was vaguely familiar, but he couldn't quite figure out how. Once he saw them though, he remembered, eyes lighting up in recognition. Koala, what are you doing here? He asked, not sure if he should be on guard around the woman or not. She was a part of the Revolutionaries, a group no one had much information on, but she had helped them in the past, as well as the children they'd saved from the facility. I'm not exactly at liberty to give that information to you. It's got nothing to do with you though, it just happens to be a coincidence that we're meeting again, she said with a smile, and Sabo wished Luffy was here to tell him if the woman was lying or not. Oh, it's coincidence that we're meeting on this random island in the New World again and it was all unplanned? Sabo asked with a raised eyebrow, skeptical. Koala puffed her cheeks, crossing her arms over her chest and looking away from Sabo indignantly. Fine, don't believe me, it's not like I care or anything, she said, and Sabo could only watch her, blinking in confusion. Finally, he broke the silence, laughing at the way Koala was acting, but that didn't seem to make the situation any better as the woman turned to glare on him. Sorry, anyways, you can't tell me why you're here then? That's too bad, Sabo said with a smile, knowing that if he'd paid more attention to his surroundings he might have heard Koala talking sooner and might have more of a clue as to why she was here. That's right. Where are your brothers, Ace and Luffy? She asked, looking around the street for them but not seeing them. Back on the Moby. I was actually heading back there myself. Where's Hack? Sabo asked in return, also not spying, nor hearing, the fishman anywhere nearby. Not here. I was sent on this mission alone. Koala answered, fixing her hair as she spoke. Ah, that must be pretty lonely, Sabo said, trying to think back to the last time he'd really been alone. He was a part of a giant crew so he was never really alone, and before that, he was with Ace and Luffy in the facility. He'd always had them with him, and he wondered if there would ever be a time where neither were there with him. Not really, I'm used to it. Why don't we go get some drinks? We can talk about all the trouble you three have been up to. Koala suggested, hand on her hip as she did. Oh, were you keeping tabs on us? Sabo asked teasingly, smirking to the redhead, her cheeks puffed out again in annoyance as she glared at him. So what if I was? You three are in the papers all the time, she said defensively. Yeah, but when we met you didn't even know our names, and we were in the papers just as much then. Sabo pointed out, making her huff and cross her arms again. Whatever. Do you want those drinks or not? She asked, already beginning to walk off. Sabo followed, laughing all the meanwhile. Hey, Namur. No, Haruda and Luffy shared a look of confusion at the fishman's answer. What do you mean no? I haven't even said anything yet, Haruta said, looking at the commander now. I've heard from the others about how you two are trying to rope someone into being a target. The answer's nope, Nomura explained, not even looking up from his task. But why? Haruta and Luffy asked in unison. Why was it so difficult to get someone to cooperate with them? Because I don't want to be responsible for all the bad that's going to come from this, Nomura said, gesturing vaguely to the two as he spoke. Nomura, buddy, think about it. Luffy, our youngest ship brother, will be leaving us in just a short while. We won't be there to help him, so we should all do our best to make sure he's prepared. That involves helping him improve his aim, with a moving target no less, Haruta said, pulling Luffy into a side hug and gesturing to the teen. Nomura looked up briefly at the explanation, frowning. He looked between Haruta and Luffy slowly, and the two could practically see his resolve breaking. What happens if he meets someone like Kizaru? That man is literally light, he can see. We've trained up his haki for those kinds of situations, but it's useless if he can't hit the target because you didn't want to help him practice. Haruta continued. Luffy remained silent, feeling the confidence from Haruta and the dilemma within Nomura as he listened to the commander's words. Nomura sighed and Luffy didn't think he'd ever seen Haruta smile so wide before. We've liberated a total of 12 facilities since we started doing this. They're hard to get information on, even for us, and even with the information it's hard to find the actual buildings. Koala admitted with a sigh, chin resting on her hand, elbow propped on top of the bar they were sitting at. How many do you think there are? Sabo asked somberly, staring at his glass in front of him, frowning. Koala matched his frown, sighing. Honestly, I've got no clue. None of us do. There isn't exactly a list of all the facilities for us to check off. Every time we take one down we always hope it's the last one, but then we get a lead on another and we have to try and find it before too many children are lost. Koala said in a hushed voice so no one would overhear her. It was risky sharing just this much with the blonde, but she was hoping that he'd keep this between them and not spread the information around like gossip. She liked her job, she liked helping people, and it would suck if she lost it because she trusted the wrong person with the wrong information. Damn. Sabo cursed quietly, sighing heavily. The two talked amongst each other for a while, Sabo learning more and more about the different facilities the Revolutionary Army had found and liberated while Sabo even shared a bit of information on what it had been like living in a facility. Eating garbage soup for 7 years and then finally having the chance to eat real food? I think that was one of the best experiences I've ever had in my life. Sabo said with a reminiscent smile, thinking back to the near tears he'd shed after eating real food again. Cheers to that, Koala muttered, raising her glass. Sabo raised an eyebrow at that, picking up on the implied agreement. Koala seemed to realize this and frowned, giving a sigh as she put her drink down. I may have had a similar experience in the past. I wasn't in a facility, and I'm not going to tell you what happened, but when I was a child, let's just say there was a period where I was only eating scraps if I was lucky, she told him. Sabo frowned but nodded, understanding it was a sensitive topic that Koala wasn't going to share with just anyone. Anyways, we got gross soup every day, every meal, and nothing else. 1 glass of water with each meal too. Testing usually started every day after breakfast. A doctor would come out, call the numbers that were to be tested that day, and we'd be taken to the testing room, or lab, or whatever it was called, and be strapped to these uncomfortable wooden chairs or even worse. The tables. Sabo told her, and he wondered if he should stop there. Maybe it was the 2 glasses he'd already had, or maybe it was because Koala was practically a stranger that made it easier to talk to her. She did know a lot about facilities already, so that could be it too, but he had no hesitance in telling her what he and his brothers had gone through. Some things he obviously wouldn't share, because after all, she was a stranger, but for the most part he was alright with talking to her like he would to whiskey. We watched a lot of kids die, he admitted, taking another sip of his drink as he thought about the hundreds of children he and his brothers had seen come and go. I'm sorry, Koala said softly, but Sabo waved it off. No need for you to apologize, you had nothing to do with it. It's all the damn doctors, the government's fault. Sabo said with a scowl, finishing his drink. Koala was about to speak, but Sabo looking to the bar doors stopped her. Ace and Luffy are on their way here. If you want, you should leave now. Koala frowned at the information, trying to use her haki to find the two, but found nothing. How do you know that? She asked in confusion. Sabo's previous scowl was replaced with a smirk and she suddenly remembered when they'd first met. Abilities. They said at the same time. Sabo happily while Koala said it with a hint of annoyance. Right. One of these days you'll tell me what those abilities are. Koala said as she stood from her bar stool, placing money down for her drinks. Sabo copied her, still smirking. That implies that we'll see each other again. However, as I recall, this only happened by mere coincidence. Sabo teased, making Koala puff her cheeks again. It was a coincidence, she said, knowing it wouldn't have any effect. Sabo laughed at her and she huffed, thoroughly annoyed. Then I'll look forward to the next coincidence, Sabo said with a small bow, taking off his hat. Koala rolled her eyes at the theatrics but smiled. Yeah, see you later Sabo, Koala said, waving as she left the bar. Sabo was in no rush to leave, knowing that in only a few minutes, his brothers would be entering, no doubt to question him on what he was doing. He may as well buy himself another drink. And what, do tell, made you think that letting Luffy, a devil fruit user, rocket himself at you while you swam in the ocean was a good idea? Sabo asked Namur with a raised eyebrow as Ace yelled at Luffy beside them. Haruto was laughing loudly, clutching his stomach and falling to the deck as he did. I know, those idiots persuaded me, Namur grumbled, already annoyed with himself that he'd even let Haruto's words have an effect on him like they'd had. Seriously, do I have to listen to everyone here 24/7? Sabo asked, more to himself as he gave an exasperated sigh and pinched his nose. I don't care how cool or how much fun it was stupid. But Ace, did you see it? I went, Foo, and I got Namur too. That's not the point, idiot. Over the years that the brothers had been with the Whitebeards, they had yet to stop their sessions with whiskey. Every week, like clockwork, they would go to the upper deck and each take turns talking to the nurse. Sometimes sessions would have to be postponed due to missions, fights, or everyone was just too busy, but they always made sure to reschedule. Time and time again the brothers could see the improvement that talking with whiskey had on them. Nightmares weren't as frequent, strangers weren't as scary, and they were able to tolerate doctors they'd never met before relatively well compared to before where they'd had a near phobia of them. Needles were easier to handle as well, easier with each checkup they went to. They'd told whiskey a lot, more than they'd told each other, and the nurse felt like a safe person they could tell anything and everything to. It was nice to have that kind of person in their lives, they needed it. The journals that whiskey had had them write in so long ago were filled with every nightmare they'd had since then to the point that they had to get new ones, which they'd also filled rather quickly. They each had a total of 15 different notebooks, 14 of them filled with writing on every page and the last one still in progress, but with how far in between they had nightmares, they no longer filled the pages as quick as they used to. Even after all of this time talking to whiskey, there were some things that they'd yet to talk about, and for Luffy, that was the matter of seeing people's memories. Seeing people's memories wasn't exactly a scary topic for Luffy, but he still didn't like talking about it. He didn't like the idea that, at any time, he could will himself to see any one person's memories whenever he wanted. It felt like an invasion of privacy, like he was prying into something that he, nor anybody else, should be able to see. Memories were precious, and they weren't something that Luffy liked to even think about peeking in on. The fact that he could see anyone's memories whenever he wanted made him extremely uncomfortable, so he tried his best to forget that he even had that ability. He didn't let the idea cross his mind, didn't let the temptation to look into someone's memories overtake him. He hadn't looked into anyone's memories since back at the facility. Sitting in front of whiskey now, talking as usual about different topics, the topic of seeing memories came up. I know it's not something you particularly like talking about, but what are your thoughts on seeing memories? Have they changed since we talked about it last? She asked. Long ago they'd briefly talked about it, but Luffy didn't want to say much and whiskey let the topic change quickly after. I don't know. Luffy started with a frown, shifting a little now. I don't like looking at people's memories, so I don't, he said bluntly, looking to the ground. Whiskey nodded in front of him. I understand. What about it makes you not like it? She asked him gently, her voice always the same during these sessions. She never pressured them into saying something, never urged them to go on when they were uncomfortable. She only spoke calmly, gently, letting them speak on their own terms, on their own time. Memories. Memories are private. They're people's treasures, and I don't have a right to look at them. Luffy said after a bit of thinking, face scrunched as he tried thinking of the right words to use. And what if someone said it was alright to look into their memories? Say, for example, I gave permission for you to look. How would you feel about that? She asked, and now Luffy was confused. He'd never thought about that before. Everyone on the crew didn't even know about his ability to see memories, only the commanders, Whiskey, his brothers, and Whitebeard, so the idea that someone would want him to look into their memories confused him. Why would they want me to do that? He asked in confusion, face still scrunched. Whiskey's smile widened and she laughed lightly. Who knows? This is more of a hypothetical situation, an imaginary situation. So if someone gave permission, how would you feel about that? She explained, asking the question again afterward. Luffy stopped talking to think about it for a moment because he'd never thought about it before. What if someone wanted him to see their memories, told him it was alright for him to do so, would he be alright with it then? I think it would be okay then. If they wanted me to, he said slowly after much thought. Whiskey nodded again, writing something down on her notepad. And what if you didn't have permission, but looking into someone's memories would, say, save someone else's life? How about then? She asked, trying to find the limits of Luffy's comfort levels revolving around seeing memories. Luffy had to start thinking again, and Whiskey could visibly see the effort it took for the team to think over her question. He wasn't shying away from the questions and was taking them all seriously, which was a good thing. They helped her know where she needed to help him and where she needed to work on. If I had to, if someone would live because I did, I think I could do it. I wouldn't like it though. Luffy told her, tacking on the last bit to let her know. That's understandable, Whiskey told him, finishing her writing on this subject. I heard the plan is for you to leave here soon, is that right? She asked him, changing the subject. Her job as the brothers' nurse was to get them as healthy as she possibly could, both mentally and physically, and with Luffy leaving soon, she wanted to make sure she helped in every way she possibly could. I want to set sail when I'm 17, so Pops told me we're gonna have an early birthday party for me and then I'm gonna go back to my home island and set sail there. That's where I would have set sail if I hadn't been taken. Luffy told the nurse with a smile, excited for the future. In just a couple of weeks, he would be leaving the Moby and becoming a pirate captain of his own. The idea of it made him jittery with excitement and happiness, but he reined himself in, focusing back on Whiskey. That's a good plan. Seems like we're going to be ending our sessions soon too if that's the case, she said with a fond smile, proud of how far Luffy had come. Yeah, but you taught me lots of stuff, like writing in my journal and how to calm down when I'm scared and how to not be too scared of needles, Luffy said happily, feeling the pride from the nurse, but also a bit of sadness. That's right. I want you to take a mini den with you when you go, though. I'm sure Oyaji or Marco, or maybe even Ace or Sabo, might have already brought up that idea, she said, Luffy nodding in agreement that had happened. All of them had made the suggestion to him at one point or another, Ace and Sabo because they wanted him to be able to call them if needed, and Marco and Oyaji for mostly the same reason. It would help if you need someone to talk to or you want to have a session like this with me but we're not together. If you ever have a question about your, or anyone else's, health, mentally or physically, you can give me a call. Anytime, Luffy. You hear? She asked sternly, pointing her pencil at him. He nodded, laughing at the nurse's seriousness, making her sigh. In any case, I think that should conclude our session for the day. I'll see you next week, she told him, standing. Luffy did the same, giving a farewell before running off to talk to Thatch about his upcoming party. The brothers' time with the Whitebeards had been extremely helpful for all of them. They'd learned important skills like hockey and fighting techniques, gained better control over their senses, learned how to cope with their traumatizing past, and had made good friends, a family. However, Luffy would be leaving soon, and Sabo was beginning to think that maybe he would too. Talking with Koala back on that island not all that long ago, he'd found that he still held a hatred for the government that he couldn't quite F. The Revolutionary Army seemed nice, helping people, freeing facilities like the one he'd been trapped in, and taking down the corrupt government that was the Marines. It was appealing, and more Sabo found himself thinking that he might want to become a revolutionary himself. It was just an idea he had. He wasn't quite sure if he wanted to follow through with it yet, but the more he thought about it, the more he wanted to do it. Being a pirate was fun, freeing, and the exact opposite of being a Marine, which was a plus, but he wanted more. He wanted to make a difference, and the Revolutionary Army seemed to be able to make that possible. He hadn't talked to anyone about this yet, and with Luffy leaving so soon, he felt more inclined to stay here on the Moby with Ace. He, Ace and Luffy had never been separated before, and the thought of all of them separating at once was a bit scary, but it was bound to happen eventually. He loved the Whitebeards, he was eternally grateful to them for everything they'd done for him, and it felt wrong to leave them. At the same time though, he knew they would understand if this was something he truly wanted to do. It was going to be a hard decision for him to make, but he felt confident that everything would work out in the end. Whitebeard sat in his chair, watching as everyone went on with their day. Amongst them was Ace, Sabo, and Luffy, the three brothers laughing with Thatch and Izo. Whitebeard smiled fondly at the group, thinking back to when the brothers had first arrived and they'd barely even come out on deck. Now they had opened up and become family just as everyone else on this ship had, and it made him a proud captain to see this. In just a couple of weeks, his youngest son would be leaving him, and that was a big step for everyone. Not only would Luffy be off on his own, but his brothers would also be without him. The three of them had never truly separated before, and Whitebeard wondered how they would take it once they finally were. He was pulled from his thoughts as he noticed Marco walking his way, and from the look on his face, he wanted to speak to him about something. Oyaji. Marco greeted as he came over, leaning on the arm of Whitebeard's chair, arms crossed as he watched the crew with the giant. How are things, my son? Whitebeard asked him with a gentle smile. So far everything's going smoothly, Yoi. No doubt someone's going to have some sort of issue sooner or later. The commander answered with a shrug. Whitebeard nodded in agreement, knowing that was probably going to be the case. He had a lot of sons and daughters on this ship. It was inevitable that some would have issues at some point, and it just so happened that many went to Marco when it came to their problems. That is true. Was there something else you wanted to speak with me about? Whitebeard asked, looking at Marco out of the corner of his eye with a knowing look. Marco had been a part of his crew long enough that he was able to identify the man's emotions pretty well based off of his looks, and right now he looked like he was just waiting to talk about something. Marco seemed to know this as well, frowning as he looked at Whitebeard before sighing and shaking his head in defeat. Not really, Yoi. I just keep wondering if Luffy's ready to go off on his own yet. Marco admitted, uncrossing his arms and letting them rest at his sides. Whitebeard hummed in understanding, waiting for Marco to continue. He's strong, I'll give him that, and all three of the brothers are progressing well in their hockey, but they still have a lot they need to work on. Not to mention that there are still things they haven't completely healed from yet, yoi. Marco said, voicing his concerns. Whitebeard continued listening silently, nodding along to show he was listening. Whiskey says they're doing better than they ever have before, but that doesn't mean they're healed, that they won't have setbacks, yoi. What if Luffy's on his own and has a setback, and we're not there to help him? Marco asked, finishing his mini rant. We can't force him to stay here forever. I understand your concerns, son. I have some of my own, but we're helping him all we can. We've already convinced him to take a mini den with him, and if he needs us he can call and ask and we'll do what we can. Even if he's not here, he's still family and we help family when they need it. Whitebeard told Marco calmly, watching Luffy now as he spoke. You're right, Marco said with another sigh, nodding. You know, I thought Ace or Sabo would be worrying more over this than they are, yoi, Marco said, looking to the brothers now as he spoke. I'm sure they are, they're just handling it differently than we are as all. Everyone deals with their own emotions differently, and those three have a tendency to handle many things differently than we normally do. Whitebeard said with a smile. His words weren't an insult, merely an observation after having dealt with the brothers for the past few years. Marco scoffed, crossing his arms again. You got that right, yoi, he said, smiling himself now. Seeing as he had been watching the brothers, he and Whitebeard were both able to witness as Luffy grabbed onto the rigging above them, Ace, Sabo, Thatch, and Izo yelling something at him, but it was too late as the teen went flying upwards. And into the water. I take back what I said, yoi, Marco said in exasperation, pinching his nose as someone jumped in to save their youngest crew member. Whitebeard only laughed. You want to join the Revolutionary Army? Ace asked, eyebrows furrowed as he repeated what Sabo had just told him. I've been thinking about it, yes, Sabo said from their desk chair. Luffy was sitting on the bed, listening, while Ace was taking off his boots. Gotta say, I wasn't expecting that, Ace said honestly, throwing his boots toward their closet, not caring if they made it there or not. I haven't exactly decided if I wanted to or not, but I'm thinking I might, the blonde said, finishing putting things away in the desk and turning in the chair to face his brothers. If you leave too, you better take a mini den like Luffy, Ace said sternly, taking the news much easier than Sabo had expected him. He raised an eyebrow at this, wondering what was going through his brother's head. I planned on it. After all, what if Luffy wanted to call me instead of you? Sabo teased instead, knowing that Ace wouldn't voice his worries if he didn't want to, and the best way to distract his brother from said worries was to make fun of him. Why would he want to call you over me? Tell him, Luffy, you'd rather talk to me instead, right? Ace asked Luffy, the two looking at the unsuspecting boy who only blinked owlishly at them. Why can't I talk to both of you? He asked in confusion, tilting his head as he spoke. Because that's not what we're talking about, Ace said plainly, which only made Luffy laugh and Sabo smile. Nay, Sabo, does that mean you'd be working for my dad? Luffy asked, completely ignoring the previous conversation and moving on to another. Ace sighed in annoyance but was intrigued by Luffy's question, turning to the blonde. I guess. I talked to Koala a little but not too long and she was telling me about how everything works. She couldn't tell me a lot, super secret operation and all, but the gist of it is that Dragon runs everything which we already knew, Sabo said with a shrug. Would you be like a ninja then? 'Cause they're all sneaky and stuff too? Luffy said, stars in his eyes at the thought that his older brother would become a ninja. Sabo laughed at this while Ace snickered, Luffy feeling the amusement coming from them and smiling as a result. Sure, Luffy. I'd be a ninja, Sabo agreed, despite knowing that wasn't the case. Whoa, ninjas are so cool, but not cooler than pirates. Pirates are the best, Luffy said as if struggling with whether he liked ninjas or pirates more. Sabo shook his head, standing from the chair and stretching. Alright, let's get some SWAS making pancakes tomorrow, the blonde said with a smile, noticing that Ace had gone quiet but not saying anything on it. Thatch's pancakes are so good, Luffy said dreamily, licking his lips at the thought of them, getting into his spot on the bed. You've only ever had Thatch's pancakes, Luffy, Sabo noted, also getting into the bed. The room was dark once Sabo turned out the oil lamp on their bedside table, and despite how excited he knew Luffy was over the idea of tomorrow's breakfast, the teen fell asleep rather quickly after saying his good nights. Sabo wasn't able to fall asleep immediately. He hadn't been for a while now ever since he'd first thought about joining the Revolutionaries, so it wasn't surprising for him to still be awake a half hour later, still staring at the ceiling. What was surprising was Ace speaking up from the other end of the bed. Sabo? The eldest asked, nearly making him jump from the voice all of a sudden. He'd thought Ace had gone to sleep too, but that obviously wasn't the case. Ace, I thought you were sleeping. Nearly gave me a heart attack, Sabo told him, taking a steadying breath, heart pounding heavily in his chest at the scare. Sorry, Ace said, but he didn't sound it at all. If anything, Sabo guessed his brother was smiling right now at his expense. He sighed. What's up? He asked, wondering what Ace had wanted in the first place. It was quiet now, Ace not speaking. Sabo waited patiently, not letting himself believe Ace had finally fallen asleep lest he be caught by surprise again. "You better stay safe. You and Luffy, and if you need us, call," Ace said, voice hard again, and Sabo knew his brother was worried. He was too, worried for Ace, for Luffy, even himself. All of his childhood he'd wanted to be free, and then he'd met Ace, and then Luffy, and his dream changed to that of being a pirate. When they were taken by the facility, that dream was changed again, back to wanting that freedom he so desperately wanted as a kid, and when they got out, became pirates. It had been amazing, but there was always something that didn't feel right. Sure, he was free, he was a pirate, everything he'd ever wanted, but the facility was still there, still holding him back and making him feel as if he wasn't truly free. Joining the Revolutionaries, he would be able to actively fight against the facility. He would be able to rid the world of those horrible buildings, and once that happened, he would truly feel free. "I will. Hey, if you ever want to talk, just call me. I don't care what it's about," Sabo told him honestly. Ace had gotten better at expressing his emotions to others, but that didn't mean he was always the best at initiating conversations with others about said emotions. "I'm holding you to that. I'll call whenever I want to complain about Curiel leaving his dirty socks everywhere. Or Kingdu taking all the fun in fights. Oh, or when Marco yells at me for putting off my reports till the last second," Ace said, and Sabo could hear the smile again. "As long as you don't call to tell me about Thatch complaining that he's never in our adventures. I've heard enough of those to last me 2 lifetimes." Sabo groaned. Sometimes super hearing sucked. Especially then. Ace snickered. The room grew silent again, the two not speaking anymore. Sabo continued staring at the ceiling, and he had a feeling Ace was doing the same, not having heard him shift. After some time passed, Sabo found himself falling asleep, not even realizing he'd closed his eyes. Things were changing, and soon nothing would be the way it used to be. The morning light was bright, birds were chirping cheerfully above them, and the sky was a clear blue that only added to the picturesque day. It wasn't too hot out, and a light breeze was blowing, helping cool down anyone who needed it. Luffy's birthday was still 2 months away, and Sabo's was only a few days away, but today, they were celebrating the both of them. Sabo had finally decided on joining the Revolutionary Army, telling Whitebeard as much, and it was decided that he would leave along with Luffy. Because Luffy wanted to set sail on his 17th birthday back on their home island, they would be leaving today after lunch to ensure they got there slightly before, or on, his birthday. Ace, Sabo, and Marco would all go along with him, and once there Sabo would be picked up by Koala while Luffy went off on his own and Marco and Ace went back to the Moby. Of course, they were going to make sure to say hello to Makino, and even Dayton, while they were there. Although many had wanted to come along on the journey, Whitebeard had decided Marco would be enough, much to many of the commander's disappointment. Both Luffy and Sabo were highly encouraged to bring along mini den-dens, everyone insisting they just needed to call if they needed help. Despite Luffy's adamance that he would be having his own adventure and how he wanted to do things his own way, without help, he still ended up conceding and packing the mini den-den with a similar mustache to Whitebeard in his bag. Sabo hadn't put up any fight, telling everyone that asked that he would bring one along as well. He'd already been planning on doing so, so there was no reason for him to argue otherwise. The bell for lunch began going off, everyone making their way into the kitchen where there was a giant feast laid out. Thatch and the chefs were going all out, because not only was this an early birthday party for Sabo and Luffy, but it was also their going away party, and according to him, he wanted it to be not only perfect, but memorable. Ace and Luffy charged into the galley, the two bickering over who could eat the most, while Sabo watched them with a smile, following at a much more lax pace, in no rush. There was plenty of food for everyone, and even if there wasn't, Thatch was sure to make more. Luffy and Ace began piling food high on their plates, many cheering them on and placing their bets on who would win the contest. After Sabo got his food, he opted to not sit at the table where his brothers were flinging food, instead going towards the commander's table and sitting with them. "Ah, Sabo, welcome to the civilized table," Izo greeted with a smile. Sabo chuckled as he sat in his seat, plate in front of him. "You don't want to sit with Ace and Luffy?" Vista asked with a smile. Everyone took a quick glance, watching as a bone flew from the table his two brothers were occupying and flying across the room. "You know, I really like this shirt and I'd rather not get it dirty sitting over there," Sabo said, everyone turning away from the table. "Ah, Sabo, I can't believe you two are leaving already. It feels like just yesterday we were welcoming you aboard with open arms," Thatch said dramatically as he walked up to the table, arms open wide as he began smothering Sabo in a hug. "Act Thatch gotta breathe," Sabo said, pushing on the chef's chest in an attempt to get out of the hold. "Thatch, let him go, yoy," Marco said with a sigh. "But Marco, you're only saying that because you get to go drop them off. This is the last time I'll see him in a while, and that means I have to get all my hugs in now," Thatch told the first commander with a pout, hugging Sabo harder. "I'm not rubber like Luffy," Sabo squeaked, practically feeling his bones getting crushed beneath Thatch's grip. "Thatch," Jozu said with a hint of worry, concern on his face as he watched Sabo's face begin to go purple. "Oh, fine," Thatch said, finally letting go of Sabo, who gasped for air. "Geez, Thatch, are you trying to kill me?" Sabo asked in a joking manner, but only barely. "Of course not," Thatch said in a slightly offended tone, sitting across from Sabo now. "Could have fooled me," Haruta muttered from his spot. "Hey, I'll have you know, no, Luffy, just because you eat the plate too doesn't mean you get bonus points. Don't do that." Sabo called out to Ace and Luffy, interrupting Thatch. "Ah." Luffy whined but was quick to dig back into his food, not wanting to fall behind. There were a few whines from the crowd watching the two, probably from the ones rooting for Luffy, and Sabo shook his head, turning his attention back to the commanders. "It'll be weird to not have your all-hearing ears listening in everywhere," Haruta told Sabo, propping his elbow on the table and resting his cheek in his hand. "I thought you hated my ability to overhear you come up with new betting opportunities," Sabo said with a smirk, Haruta glaring at him. "Only because you told Marco every time and he shut it all down before I could even start," Haruta accused. Sabo began eating, putting on an air of innocence. "What do you mean? I never told Marco anything. Just because Luffy just so happened to overhear me talking to Ace about it, and then he told Marco doesn't mean I did it purposefully," he said, still smirking as he ate. "I can't wait for you to be gone," Haruta said, still glaring, which only made Sabo laugh. "I'll miss you too," Sabo told the commander, deciding to stop teasing now. It was bittersweet, knowing this would be the last day with the Whitebeards. He wasn't sure if Luffy was feeling the same way or not, but he was sure he was at least a little sad that they would be leaving. Not only would they leave behind the pirates they'd been a part of for years, but they'd also be leaving Ace behind, their brother that they hadn't separated from all their life. For the most part at least. Sabo pushed away those thoughts. There was still another 2 months until they were truly going to be apart, so for now, he should enjoy the festivities while he could. Ace and Luffy's contest went on until Ace had a narcolepsy attack, knocking him out and allowing Luffy to get ahead of him. Ace fought about how that was unfair, and before a true winner could be declared the two had dissolved into a fight amongst themselves on who was the rightful winner. Ace arguing that even if Luffy won, it wasn't a true win, to which Luffy argued it was. In the end, it became a stalemate, everyone who had bet on one or the other losing their money to those who had bet on the two ending in a tie. Meanwhile, Sabo had actual meaningful conversations with the commanders and Whitebeard, all while eating peacefully. Sure, he could hear the arguing going on behind him, but years of training allowed him to ignore it and let the two handle it themselves. Until they dragged him into it, that is. "Sabo, tell him, I was winning fair and square," Luffy said, pointing to Ace accusatorily as he shouted to Sabo from the table he sat at. "No way, Sabo, tell him I can't help that I fall asleep, so he should have stopped and waited till I woke up," Ace shouted, pointing to Luffy in the same way the youngest was doing to him. Sabo pinched his nose, the commanders smiling, and some even laughing, as they watched. "You both lose," Sabo told them, making them gape at him. "What?" they asked in surprise. "Yup. You both stop eating at the same time. You both lose," Sabo told them, not even looking at them. Honestly, he didn't even know if that was true. He hadn't been watching, but he was just fine with telling them that. Luffy wouldn't feel a lie either, because for all he knew, it was the truth. "Rematch," the two yelled in unison, getting cheered on by both the losers and the winners of the previous betting match. With that announcement, another food eating contest commenced, Ace and Luffy going in full force as they shoved and elbowed each other, each trying to out-eat the other. Sabo shook his head at his brother's antics but went right back to actively ignoring them. Lunch went on, and all the while the Atmos and light. It was a party after all, so there were plenty of drinks being had which only elevated the mood more. Ace and Luffy continued to have their contest until both were too full to continue eating anymore. Another argument starting on who won that round, starting while those who had bet on them argued with each other as well, all of them wanting to be winners. Sabo and the commanders, as well as Whitebeard, all listened on with smiles and laughs, not getting involved in the drama of the betting tables. Overall, it was a fun-filled afternoon, everyone eating, drinking, laughing and having fun despite the arguments. Once the majority of the room had finished eating their lunch, Thatch and a few other chefs disappeared into the kitchen, Sabo already knowing why. He stood from the table and went over to Ace and Luffy, sitting in between them and pushing them apart. "Alright you two, calm down," he said, confusing the two with his sudden appearance. Sabo, "Hey, you were listening, right? Tell him I won," Ace said, getting over his confusion rather quickly as he remembered what he had been arguing about moments ago. Sabo sighed, and before Luffy could pipe up with his own argument, he spoke. "Actually, I wasn't listening, I was ignoring you two children. Besides, I'm not here to settle your argument," Sabo told them, once again confusing them. "What? But why not?" Luffy whined, obviously thinking that Sabo should be the one to do so. "Not only because it's not my issue, but also because Thatch and the others seem to be bringing out the cake." Luffy cheered happily, smelling the sweet treat coming his way, eyes widening as he turned to look for it. Sabo smiled at that, nodding. "Yes, cake. he said, not even mad his excitable little brother had interrupted him. Ace seemed pleased with the idea of the dessert as well. Argument forgotten as even he turned to watch the cake being brought over to their table. It was tall, had many layers, and was artfully iced and decorated with 2 hat toppers that looked like Sabo and Luffy's hats, along with a big happy birthday spelled out on the front of the cake, candles decorating the many layers. Immediately the galley was singing the familiar tune of Happy Birthday, Luffy basking in all the love and happiness in the room while Sabo smiled and accepted that there was no getting out of having his name thrown into the song. He, like Ace, had never been too fond of his birthday. He'd always remember his days of being trapped with his parents in stuffy parties that were too uptight and being smothered with expensive gifts. Here, though, there was no stuffiness, or expensive gifts, or snooty looks as everyone watched your every move. Here, it was only filled with love, and well wishes, and maybe a few inexpensive gifts here and there. As the song came to a close and the cake was set on the table in front of Sabo and Luffy, the two stood, each taking half as they blew out the candles. Applaud rang throughout the room and more drinks were gotten as everyone celebrated. "I hope you two made your wishes," Thatch told them, beginning to take the candles off so he could slice the cake. I made the best wish ever, Sabo. Did you make a wish too?" Luffy asked, smiles stretched wide on his face in his typical D fashion as he looked to the blonde. "Of course. Remember, Luffy, you're not supposed to tell your wishes or they won't come true," Sabo said, accepting a plate of cake from Thatch. "Right," Luffy said firmly, determined not to say his wish aloud now as he also accepted a plate, a much larger slice of cake on it. Even though he'd been full from lunch only minutes ago, he was ready for more and was quick to dig into his dessert. Cake was passed out, songs were sung, and many laughs were shared. Eventually, though, lunch came to a close and everyone slowly milled out onto the deck, everyone already knowing what was coming next. Ace, Sabo, Luffy, and Marco all went to their rooms to grab their things, and soon enough they were at the railing, the mini Moby they would be using tied to the railing so it wouldn't float away. It was time for them to leave after being with the Whitebeards for 3 whole years. "You two better take good care of yourselves, and Luffy, make sure your chef knows about how much you eat," Thatch said, sniffling as he dabbed tears from his eyes with a handkerchief. "And make sure you have someone who can stitch. You have a habit of ripping things," Izo said, pointing a finger at the teen who nodded. "And a swordsman," Vista piped up, Haruta shouting a noise of agreement with that. "A navigator too, your direction sucks, doctor, doctors are important." "What about a shipwright? Luffy would get his ship destroyed in seconds without one." The list went on as the worried crew thought of things Luffy would need, and Luffy nodded along to every suggestion, smiling wide and eyes sparkling at the idea of how much fun he was going to have. "Luffy, Sabo, good, you haven't left yet," Whiskey said as she walked over, 2 files in hand as she did. "Whiskey. No, we haven't, we're just about to though," Sabo told the head nurse. "Well, before you go, Luffy, these are a copy of your medical records. When you find a doctor you trust, give them these. They detail everything, from the state you were in when you first arrived here, to your abilities, to every cut, scrape and bruise you've had since you've been here," Whiskey said to Luffy, handing him one of the files filled with papers. Ace took them, putting them into the teen's bag. "If you lose them or they get destroyed, give me a call when you find your doctor and I can tell them about it that way. Sabo, these are yours. I expect you to give them to your doctor as well," she said, handing Sabo a similar looking file which he also packed away in his bag. "Thank you, Whiskey," Sabo said with a smile. "Yeah, thanks Whiskey," Luffy chirped happily, almost bouncing in anticipation to head off. Marco, who had been on the mini Moby making sure things were all set to go, flew back now, landing beside them and smiling. "Ready to go when you are, Yoi," he said to them. Sabo nodded, looking to Luffy who began laughing to himself in excitement. "See you guys later," Luffy called out to everyone, waving as he did and still grinning his D smile. "Bye Luffy. Bye Sabo," the crew called back, loud and rambunctious as they all began waving back. Whitebeard's laugh was loud and rumbling over all of them. "We'll see you again soon my sons. Have fun on your journeys," Whitebeard said to them. "Bye Oyaji," Luffy and Sabo said simultaneously, though Luffy's was much louder than his due to his brother's excitement. Farewell said, the group of 4 began gathering their things and making their way to the mini Moby, the others still calling out their goodbyes and well wishes as they did. Now on board the mini Moby, with one final call of farewell, they were heading off towards Goa Island all the way in the East Blue. Finally, Luffy and Sabo's journeys were going to be starting. They were finally leaving the Whitebeards, finally going to fulfill their dreams. It was bittersweet watching the Moby slowly grow further away from them, and eventually, they couldn't see it any longer. After a 2-month journey, Sabo and Luffy would be watching the mini Moby drift away as well, and then they would be on their own. It was exciting to think about, but Sabo knew he would miss the constant rowdiness of the Whitebeards, the unique personalities of the commanders, the friends he'd made in the 2nd Division, and Whitebeard himself. The man was truly a father figure for all 3 of the brothers now, and time after time he had proven to them that they could come to him about anything and he would sit and listen without question. To leave that all behind was sad, but Sabo had to look to the future. He was going to start helping make a difference in the world, start liberating facilities and actively working to take down the Marines. Luffy was going to become a pirate like he'd always dreamed of doing, one that Sabo knew without a DSORTS of trouble for the Marines. If he didn't know how scummy and corrupt the Marines were, he might actually feel a bit bad for them. As it was now, though, he hoped that Luffy gave them hell with every island and every adventure he had. Knowing Luffy, that was definitely going to be the case. Life on the mini-Moby was relatively quiet. They sailed on through the turbulent waters of paradise, though nothing was as turbulent as the waters of the New World, and they would occasionally dock at an island to resupply when necessary. Luffy's birthday was drawing nearer every day, yet their journey was only yet beginning. They still had most of paradise to get through, but so far they were still on schedule, even with the few setbacks they'd had due to bad weather. As days passed, they became weeks, and then a whole month. Marco would make sure to call the Moby and tell everyone their progress to the island. Ace, Sabo, and Luffy always hearing a commotion as everyone asked how they were, if everything was going alright, or if they decided they actually wanted to come back to the Moby instead. It was the same every time, and Sabo and Luffy would always reassure them that, no, as much as they loved and missed them, they would not be returning to the Moby anytime soon. Groans and protests would meet this answer, but they only laughed about it and ignored it, Ace smirking as he told them all to get over it, that he was the one who should be begging them to stay, not them. By the time they were finally in the East Blue, they only had a couple of weeks left to get to Dawn Island before Luffy's birthday would be upon them. None of them were worried though. Luffy was constantly reminding them that even if they weren't there on his birthday, it would be fine because they hadn't escaped the facility on Ace or Sabo's birthdays. This meant that they weren't exactly in a rush to get to their home island, even if they all were excited to go back. They hadn't been back in a decade, taken from their home island when they were only kids. Now they were adults, save for Luffy, who was only turning 17 in the next couple weeks. Ace and Sabo both were 20 now, and while many on the Moby argued that they were still only kids and their eyes compared them, it didn't change the fact that they were adults. It felt strange to finally be returning to their home, and Sabo was sure Ace felt the same trepidation about returning as he did. There was no need to worry over returning after all. It's not like they were returning for good. They were only going for a short visit and then they would all be leaving again, but the prospect of seeing it all again, the jungle, the animals, Makino, even Dayton and the bandits. It was both exciting and nerve-wracking at the same time. Surely, news of them had reached the island and they all knew the brothers were alive and okay. But what if it hadn't? What if Garp never told them that the brothers were okay, and they just suddenly showed up there without any warning? Thoughts like that, these were the ones that Sabo pushed aside, ones they didn't allow himself to think about any longer than a few minutes. The way Luffy was looking at him, his brother was taking notice of his worrying feelings, but he said nothing, instead giving Sabo a smile and going to sit on the railing, kicking his feet over the water below him. Times like this, Sabo thought that Luffy was much more mature than he let on. But when only a few minutes later the youngest was picking his nose and flinging what stuck to his finger at Ace, causing a fight, he thought otherwise. Marco sighing beside him told him the commander was probably thinking the same thing as him. It was the day before Luffy's birthday that they finally arrived to the island they called home. Luffy had spotted it early in the morning, having been too excited to sleep any longer and going to sit on the deck like he had been doing most of the journey. After running into the room Ace and Sabo were sleeping in and waking them, Ace went and confirmed it was Dawn Island, not that there was any doubt, and all three of the brothers felt their excitement rise at the prospect that they were finally there. None of them went to wake Marco. Instead, they all sat on the railing together, watching the island grow closer and closer, the sun slowly rising in the distance and seagulls flying above them. It was quiet, it was peaceful, and it was probably going to be their last day together in a long while. While seeing the island was nice, and thoughts of a short adventure while they were there crossed all of their minds, this was also the place they would be saying goodbye to each other from. For an entire decade of their lives, they'd always been together, never left each other for no longer than a simple mission from Whitebeard, but now they were about to all separate, follow their dreams, without each other. Sure, they no doubt would visit each other again someday, maybe even relatively soon from now, but the not knowing, the mystery behind when they would see each other again, had never been something they'd needed to worry about before. Now, though, they were facing that reality, the reality that today was a day of goodbyes just as much as it was a day of new beginnings. Eventually, the sun was high in the morning sky and Marco was walking out on deck. He didn't bother them except for telling them that they'd need to prepare to dock soon, and then he left them to sit there silently together. Marco was right, of course, and before they'd even had a chance to eat breakfast, everyone was getting the mini Moby ready to dock. They decided their best course of action was to attempt to dock at the village, seeing as the other side of the island was far too close to the noble town and trash heap filled with thugs and thieves. While the villagers might be concerned, or scared even, to see a Whitebeard ship docking at their small village, it was better than docking on the other side of the island where they'd be at risk for some desperate idiot to wander on board and attempt to steal from the Moby while they were gone. Luffy could already feel the concern and fear from the villagers as they slowly grew closer to the island, and soon enough there was a crowd forming at the docks, everyone wanting to see what was happening firsthand. "So this is where you three grew up then, huh?" Marco asked as he secured the rigging. "Here? Nah. Well, at least, Sabo and I didn't live here. We lived in those mountains up there," Ace told him, pointing to said mountains as he helped Marco. "Ah, makes sense. I was wondering where the giant tigers and bears came into play, yoi," Marco said with a smile, remembering some of the brothers' tales of fighting giant animals for their meals. "And boar and monkeys and gators. Every animal there is giant really." Sabo piped up from his spot on the deck, doing the most important job, making sure Luffy didn't rocket off without them. "Yeah, we gotta catch a gator before we leave. It's been forever since we've had one," Luffy said, fists flying in the air in excitement. "We'll see. We have a tight schedule to keep," Sabo told the teen in an attempt to keep him wrangled in, though even he was excited by the prospect of catching a gator. It had been far too long since they'd had gator meat, and it was always one of the brothers' favorites. "First we have to worry about all of them," Ace said, gesturing to the still worried and scared villagers watching them. In the front, he could see an old man that was vaguely familiar to him as the mayor of the town, recognizing him from the brief few times he'd come to visit Luffy up on the mountain with Makino. Speaking of, the green-haired barmaid was there as well, right beside the mayor as she held her hands to her chest, worry etched into her features, and he felt a bit bad now about not thinking to send a notice ahead to keep this from happening. "Can we go now?" Luffy asked eagerly, attention back on the island he so desperately wanted to step foot on again. Alright, it looks like we're all set. Let's go, yoi," Marco said with a sigh as Luffy cheered, Sabo once again stopping him from rocketing and instead telling him to use the rope ladder like the rest of them. He was met with a pout, but Luffy did it anyways, his smile back within seconds as they threw the rope down and began leave him whoop slap, the mayor of this town. "I ask that you please do not cause harm to this village. We'll be happy to pay you whatever necessary for your cooperation," the mayor said as they walked over to the crowd, Marco at the head. Marco looked like he was about to speak, mouth opening and no doubt prepared to ease the crowd's worries, but he was stopped when Luffy slipped from Sabo's grip and pushed past Marco. "Whoop slap," and Makino, Luffy called out loudly and happily, D smile on his face as he greeted them. The mayor's eyes widened in surprise, and Makino gasped behind him, hands flying to her mouth now as tears formed. "Luffy?" Makino cried as she immediately recognized the teen. Luffy laughed, which was answer enough for her as she darted forward, hugging Luffy tightly as the crowd began whispering in astonishment around them. "I can't believe it's you, and Ace and Sabo too. You boys have grown," she said, some of those tears falling now, but Luffy could feel just how elated the barmaid was to see them. "After all these years, I gotta say, I didn't expect to see you three no-good brats again," Whoop Slap said, eyes still wide in shock. Luffy laughed again while Makino moved to hug Ace and Sabo, the former flushing lightly at the affection while Sabo got a bit flustered himself. He and Ace had never been as close to Makino as Luffy had been, they'd only seen her a few times after all, so it was a bit strange for them to be receiving the same attention as Luffy was. Honestly, they hadn't really expected the woman to remember them. "How are you guys? Oh, and who's this?" Makino asked, finally remembering Marco was there, the man having remained silent as he let the three brothers reunite with the woman. "I'm Marco, yoi," he introduced, Makino smiling to him. "First commander of the Whitebeard pirates, of course. I'm Makino, it's a pleasure to meet you," she greeted, bowing to the man who waved off the formalities. "I've seen your wanted posters and I'd heard you were with the Whitebeards, but I never knew for sure. Garp came every once in a while, but he never said much about whatever it was you three were up to, just that you were safe," Makino said to them, the crowd beginning to disperse from the docks now, though there were still many whispers going around that Sabo could clearly hear. Many of the villagers seemed to recognize Luffy, all of them happy to see him, but they were all curious as to what had happened to him, and not to mention everything they'd seen about him in the papers. There was also the fact that none of them knew Ace or Sabo, as well as Marco, except for the fact that they were all notorious pirates as well. To put it bluntly, the villagers were suspicious of them, which was to be expected. All that was left at the docks was Makino, the mayor, and the group of Whitebeards. "That's true, we've been a part of the Whitebeards for about 3 years now after they, helped us out," Sabo said, Makino and the mayor seeming to pick up on his meaning as they glanced to his wrist. "Yes, we've also heard about this mental hospital you three escaped from. Regardless of whether I think that's where you three brats belong or not, the Marines should know better than to think families wouldn't realize they didn't send their children to these places. I doubt that mountain bandit up there was going to defy Garp and ship you three off," the mayor said with a frown, obviously not believing the Marines' words on where the brothers had been taken. Ace scoffed, arms crossing over his chest at the mayor's words. "I think Dayton would rather get rid of all her alcohol before she would do anything to Garp's grandchildren." Ace agreed, the two nodding with each other at the thought. Why don't we head to my bar? I'll make you all something to eat, so long as you all are hungry, that is. Makino said with a knowing smile. Within seconds Luffy was cheering and running off towards where he knew the party's bar to be, while Ace and Sabo could only blink at their brother. Oi, Luffy, wait for us, we don't know where we're going. Ace shouted at Luffy, running after him while Sabo opted to stay with Makino and the mayor, as well as Marco. It seems his appetite's still the same, Makino said with a fond smile as she began leading the rest to her bar, Sabo nodding to her words. The barmaid had been there when Luffy had eaten his devil fruit, and consequently when he began having a never-ending pit for a stomach when it came to eating food. She almost longed for the days when she could make one plate for the boy and he'd be satisfied, but then Luffy wouldn't be Luffy if that were the case. That's for sure. If anything, it's only grown, Sabo told her with a smile of his own, Marco nodding his agreement. He didn't know Luffy as a child, but since his time on the Moby, it seemed that the boy could eat more and more with every passing day. You boys better tell me about everything you've been up to. Newspapers just aren't the same, Makino said as they all reached the building now, Luffy and Ace sitting at the bar. Of course, Sabo agreed, he and Marco sitting at the bar as well. As much as I would love to stay and chat, I have matters I need to attend to. Don't you brats cause any trouble now, you hear? The mayor said, giving the brothers a stern look, pointing at them accusingly. The three nodded, saying their farewells as the man left. So, how long are you planning on staying? Makino asked as she began preparing the food, giving them all drinks while they waited. Only for the day, Ace answered, and Luffy could feel the aching pull from the woman at the response. So soon? She asked softly, though she was still smiling. Well, Luffy here wanted to set off to become a pirate captain of his own, but he was adamant about setting sail here on Dawn Island. We all decided we would come drop him off so he could visit, but I'm also going to be joining the Revolutionary Army. A friend is going to pick me up here, Sabo explained. Marco and I will be going back to the Moby, Ace added, Marco nodding. You boys are all grown up now, Makino said wistfully, making Ace and Sabo flush again while Luffy laughed and grinned. The brothers shared stories with Makino about their adventures as pirates, told her how Ace was the 2nd Division commander, how Luffy and Sabo were a part of the 2nd Division, how they'd visited islands like Fishman Island and Sabaody. Makino listened attentively the entire time, smile on her face as she did. Luffy could feel the joy, the pride, coming from the woman, and it made him even happier that they'd had the chance to come visit the island. Marco would jump in every once in a while, adding his side to many of the stories and making Makino laugh when the brothers got defensive at accusations Marco would make against them. Eventually, the food was gone, and the brothers were full. The stories came to an end and they all sat in silence, smiles on their faces. Of course, silence never lasts long with Luffy. Can we go see Dayton now? He asked excitedly, Makino laughing at his energy. Sure, Ace said with a sigh, standing from the stool. Thank you for the food, Makino, Sabo told the barmaid as he stood as well. Oh, it was no problem. Now you make sure to come and say goodbye to me before you all leave for good, got it? I don't want you trying to sneak off thinking it's okay to leave me without a proper farewell, she said sternly, narrowing her eyes at all of them. We'll make sure to come back. Sabo agreed, smiling to the woman. She smiled back, nodding. Good, now get going. I'm sure Dayton will love to see you three again, she said to them with a knowing smile on her face. They nodded to her, all leaving the bar now with promises to come back later. So, who's Dayton, Yoi? Marco asked, only having heard the name a few times in one of the brothers' stories, but never prying to find out who the woman was. Ah, she's our guardian, I guess, Sabo said, trying to find a word to fit the woman. She's a hag is what she is, Ace said with a smirk, led Inantains. She basically raised Ace after Garp dropped him off to her as a baby. Then she was in charge of Luffy when Garp left him, and then me when I kind of invited myself to live with these two. Sabo explained to Marco, who was still in the dark. She's a mountain bandit, Luffy told him with a grin. Oh, can't say I'm surprised to know you three were raised by mountain bandits, Marco admitted with a laugh. As they began their hike to the bandits' hut, the brothers felt nostalgia rise within them as they were slowly covered by the jungle. Soon they were walking familiar paths and listening to familiar sounds of animals moving throughout the trees around them. They weren't disturbed on their way to the hut, all the animals staying away from them, and the brothers felt a bit disappointed they hadn't been able to fight anything yet. They didn't have long to feel bad about it, because now they were walking up to the bandits' hut that they all hadn't seen in a decade. There was no hesitation as they walked up to the hut, but once they were at the door, Ace tilted his head in confusion. Do we knock or do we just walk right in? Ace asked, obviously debating his options. While he wanted to just walk in and surprise them all, maybe get in a good fight with the few who would no doubt attack him, he also knew enough from Sabo's drilling of manners that wasn't polite, even if the bandits were anything but. Knowing Dayton, the place probably reeks of alcohol. May as well knock and make her come out rather than go in there, Sabo said, remembering the reek of the place. As a child living in a trash dump, the smell hadn't been bad in comparison, but after living in the open air on a pirate ship, he knew he would think differently now. It does. It smells like dirty clothes too, Luffy said, nose scrunching at the smell, sharing Sabo's sentiments. Knocking it is then, Ace said, already raising a fist to do so. Marco stood off to the side as he watched the brothers, not wanting to interfere in another of the brothers' reunions. He'd done well staying out of the way at the bar, and he planned to do the same here. Well, that was until the door opened and a sword was being pointed at Ace's throat. Give us all your money and you just might walk away with your life, a voice said, not visible to Marco from where he stood, tensed and ready to help if necessary. He knew these people were bandits, practically family to the brothers, but the sword was saying otherwise. Ah, Dagra, perfect, go get the old hag Dayton, Ace said with a smirk, obviously not concerned by the sword at his throat, Sabo or Luffy either. Marco calmed at this, knowing that if it was truly dangerous then the brothers wouldn't remain so calm. Plus, Ace was fire, and here in the East Blue Marco didn't have to worry about a few bandits knowing how to use hockey or being in possession of sea stone. I don't think you heard me correctly. Oi, Dayton, come outside, it's smelly in there, Luffy called, ignoring Dagra as he stuck his head in the hut, yelling into it. Dagra blinked but was ready to attack Luffy when he paused, seeming to finally connect the dots as to who he was looking at. Wait, wha? He stumbled back, falling onto his butt as he did, eyes wide as he looked at the brothers. Marco got closer, interested and amused by what was happening. Who dares call for me? Whatever was going to be said was stopped as a large woman with curly red hair came to the door. Luffy, Ace, and Sabo all grinning widely to her and raising their hands to wave. Yo! They all said simultaneously. There was a moment of silence, Dagra still in shock on the ground and Dayton staring unblinkingly at the brothers. Ace, Sabo and Luffy? She asked plainly, no emotion in her voice as she spoke, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. Good to know your memory's still intact in your old age, Sabo said to the woman, Marco picking up on the teasing in his voice and wondering just what kind of relationship the brothers had with their so-called guardian. Ever since the Whitebeards had known the brothers, Sabo had been the polite one, even around them. Sure, he would sometimes tease them, but there was always an air of politeness to his words when he spoke. Here, Marco could hear none of that, only an uncouth manner as he regarded the woman in front of him. My memory is damn near perfect, and who are you calling old, you damn brat? Dayton roared, making Ace and Luffy laugh while Sabo continued grinning. She. Hi Dayton, Luffy laughed, grin never leaving his face for a moment as he allowed all of the woman's happiness to drift into him. Why you damn brats, she yelled, Marco sweat dropping at the exclamation, said with what sounded like anger, but the struggle to keep the facade up showing him that she wasn't angry at all. The fact that the woman was tearing up now didn't help either. Where've you three been all this time, huh? She asked, Dagra getting up off the floor finally and running off into the hut. Ah, you know, here there, pirating, adventuring. The usual, Ace said, waving his hand around as he spoke flippantly, only giving more fuel to Dayton's fire, some of the anger on her face true now. I expect a full explanation. First you three go missing out of the blue and I've got to tell Garp about it, then I hear you're with the Whitebeard pirates of all people, and now here you are without so much as a letter? She yelled at them, but again, the brothers looked unfazed, Ace turning and walking towards the surrounding jungle. Anyways, nice seeing you again Dayton, we'll go and get you a bear or something, be back soon, he said, Sabo and Luffy following without a word. Marco looked back and forth between the woman and the brothers, not quite following what was happening. Weren't they supposed to be visiting this woman? Talking? Catching up? But instead, they were leaving after such a short hello, heading right into the jungle? Where do you brats think you're going? Dayton called after them, though not doing much to chase after them, tears beginning to form again as bandits began pouring out of the hut. Is it really? They're back? You sure you aren't drunk still? Marco didn't know what to do in this situation, and before he knew it the large woman's ferocious eyes were on him. And who are you? She asked, that anger very much real now as she addressed him. Come on Marco, Luffy's wants you to see Tiger Lord and prove how big he is, Sabo called, turning to look at the commander. Nice meeting you, Marco told the bandits before walking off towards the brothers, still thoroughly confused by what had just happened. Once he caught up with the three they were chatting amicably amongst themselves, entirely relaxed here in a jungle where Marco could hear all sorts of animals moving about. No doubt, the brothers knew what they were doing, knew of the animals surrounding them, and yet they paid it no mind, at complete ease. Nay, do you think the treehouse is still up? Luffy asked, Ace and Sabo humming. Maybe. It's been a while though, and no one's been around to repair it after storms. If it is up, it's probably in shambles, Ace said as he thought about it. Most likely. Hey, what about our pirate fund? You think anyone's ever found that? Sabo asked, smiling. Those idiots in the gray terminal. Yeah right. No one ever went anywhere near our pirate fund, not with all the animals they'd have to go through to get to it, Ace scoffed. Yeah, Ace and Sabo are good at hiding things. I bet no one's found it, Luffy agreed. Marco definitely felt like a fourth wheel, but he didn't mind, not with how happy the brothers looked to be back on their home island, their home turf. It wasn't long after that Sabo was using their silent language to signal that they be quiet, hunching down behind some bushes as he peeked over them towards whatever he was hearing. They all followed suit, crouching behind him and seeing a few large boar moving together a few feet away from where they were hiding. Marco had to admit, he'd never seen boar that big before the New World. Through another series of quick tapping, the brothers concocted a plan, Marco opting to stay out of it and watch. Luffy was quick to slither up into the tree beside them while Ace began circling the boar, heading to the opposite side of where Sabo was. Marco continued watching as the fight finally commenced, the three brothers all jumping out of their hiding spots at once and taking on one of the giant beasts themselves until they were victorious. Grinning ear to ear, they all grabbed onto their catches, obviously intent on taking them somewhere else other than here. Another few minutes walk, and they were walking into a clearing, a giant tree in the middle of it and an old worn ladder stuck to it, leading to an equally old-looking treehouse, though its condition wasn't all that bad save for a few missing boards. Held up better than I thought it would, Ace admitted, throwing his boar into the clearing as he looked up at the house. I'm gonna go look inside, Luffy said, throwing his boar with Ace's before flinging his arms up to the treehouse and rocketing up to it, skipping the ladder entirely. I'll go check if our pirate fund's still there and keep an ear out for that bear you promised Dayton, Sabo told Ace before heading off into the jungle again, but not before leaving behind his boar as well. Ace got to work on making a fire, Marco helping to gather some wood for it before they started cooking the boar. They could hear, and occasionally see, Luffy traipsing throughout the treehouse, laughing ringing through the air as he did. Obviously, the treehouse was in much better condition than they all had thought if it could hold up against Luffy's rampage. Well, that was until a half-hour later when there was a crack and Luffy's foot was visible from the bottom of the wooden house. More laughter rang out, and a rustle from the nearby trees signaled Sabo was back, the blonde shaking his head as he saw Luffy's foot slip back into the treehouse. Honestly, I'm surprised he hasn't fallen out of that, he said as he looked up at the house, a small chest at his side. Oi, look what I found, Luffy called, head peeking out of the window and holding something in his hands. Ace and Sabo's smiles widened if possible. Careful with those, Luffy. Bring him down, Ace called back, Luffy nodding and disappearing before jumping out of the window and landing on the ground unharmed, 3 red sake cups in his hands. I was able to find both a bear and our pirate fund while I was out, but I think Luffy outdid me with this find, Sabo said fondly, grabbing one of the cups and spinning it in his hand as he examined it, a look of nostalgia on his face that made Marco realize these cups held more importance than he had first thought. They didn't say anything more about them though, each placing one of the cups by the chest Sabo had brought back before they divvied up the food. Knowing better than to let the brothers decide his portion, Marco got his own food and watched as Ace and Luffy fought over theirs. Sabo told them where they could find the bear as they ate, Luffy and Ace only stopping in their grudge match momentarily to hear before going back at it again. Pirate fund, huh, yoi? Marco asked, nodding to the box on the ground, talking to Sabo while the other two fought. Yeah, all 3 of us wanted to be pirates, even when we were little before the facility ever happened. Ace and I started collecting money together and called it the pirate fund, and when Luffy came he helped too. We planned on saving up enough to buy a ship, but we never had much chance to do that. Doesn't mean there isn't a good amount in here though, Sabo said, patting the chest with a smile, and Marco wondered if the brothers hadn't smiled since they'd landed on the island. Lunch was done rather quickly, more of a snack than an actual meal seeing as Luffy and Ace had only gotten 1 giant boar each while Sabo and Marco shared one. This was forgotten though as Marco took charge of carrying both the pirate fund and the sake cups for the brothers so they could fight the bear they were now on the way to get for Dayton. As with the boar, the bear was bigger than Marco had ever seen before, but the brothers were able to take it down quickly and efficiently, Ace dragging it on his own as they headed back to the bandits' hut. The walk back was relatively quick, an idle chatter coming from them as the brothers shared stories of their many adventures as children with Marco, and after seeing the island for himself, Marco was able to better picture the giant animals that the brothers were describing. Once they were back at the hut, the 3 brothers didn't even bother knocking this time, instead kicking the door open and walking in as if they'd been here for years. Food, as promised. Ace called out, the room silencing as the eldest of the brothers threw the animal onto the table. It's only because you brought us a bear that I'm not thrashing you 3 for suddenly appearing like you did, Dayton shouted angrily at them, stuffing a handkerchief into her pocket and sniffling, obviously having been crying before they entered. It seemed most everyone in the room had been crying if the red puffy eyes and running noses were anything to go on. Yeah, whatever you say you hag, Ace told the woman, smirking again as he spoke. Dayton glared at him, but Marco could see there was no heat to it as she stared the fire user down. Sit down you brats and tell me where you've been, and introduce your friend while you're at it, she yelled, the brothers laughing again as they moved to sit with the woman, Marco following. It was much like how it had been at the bar, except this time there was a giant food fight happening around them as they spoke. Food flew in every direction as every man fought for his own portion of the meat from the bear Ace had brought. Marco could now see where Ace and Luffy had learned to eat, realizing they had to eat the way they did if they wanted anything at all. He guessed he should be grateful Sabo hadn't been influenced enough to do the same, or else meals on the Moby would have been much more chaotic than they already were. The brothers told Deiden all the same stories they shared with Makino, even going so far as to tell the bandit where they'd been taken that fateful day. Even though the brothers didn't want the woman to feel any guilt for not getting to them in time, they knew that she had a right to know what had happened to them, and if she found out they were trying to spare her feelings by not telling, she would be highly offended. Even though Deiden was an old hag, she was still someone they cared about deeply. Once the story was over and they told Deiden the purpose of visiting the island, they began getting ready to leave. Sabo had called Koala when they'd first seen Dawn Island in the distance from the mini Moby, telling her they would be there that day, and Koala had told him she would be there a little after lunch. Seeing as this was the case, the group was now going to go back to town and say their goodbyes to the blonde, the first of the three to leave. Of course, Deiden wasn't going to show that she was sad about the brothers' departure, and instead, she began shouting at them, telling them to get lost and that she didn't want to see their faces again, but the brothers all knew that that was just the woman's way of showing affection. It really was no wonder Ace had such a difficult time dealing with his emotions when Deiden was the one to have raised him. Farewells were had, and once again the group was off, but instead of heading to the village like Marco thought they would, they headed back to the forest. Luffy laughing quietly to himself and Sabo and Ace grinning mischievously. Deciding to just follow and see what was happening, Marco watched as the brothers headed to a large stump where a tree had once been, and Sabo asked for the red cups Marco was still carrying. Placing them on the stump, Ace pulled out a bottle of sake. Marco realizing he must have took it from the bandits, and poured. "I might not be on the same ship," Ace said as he poured, Luffy and Sabo still grinning widely as he did. "But our brotherhood will always be with us," Ace continued, placing the bottle down. "Wherever you are, whatever you do, we'll always be bonded together." All three of them picked up a cup, and Marco realized, like with many other things today, that this was another special moment for the brothers, one that they'd probably shared long ago on this island when they first became brothers. "We'll always be brothers," Ace said, Luffy and Sabo cheering as the three clinked their cups together before taking drinks from them. Ace and Sabo had no problem with the taste, but Luffy was quick to stick out his tongue afterward. "Blah. It still tastes bad," he groaned. Ace and Sabo began laughing, placing their cups down, and even Marco was trying to stop himself from laughing. Leave it to Luffy to ruin the moment. Done now, Ace collected the cups again, putting them into the chest Marco was still holding, and with that, they headed to the village. The mood much more somber now as it sunk in for them all that one of them was finally going to be leaving. They all still wore smiles, but there were no words spoken, no stories shared, just silence. Luffy could feel everyone's sadness that Sabo would be leaving, but after all his training on the Moby, he was able to block it out relatively well now. That didn't mean he didn't have his own sad feelings on the subject. As excited as he was to begin his adventure, there was that small part that knew it would be lonely for a while until he found his first crew member. Once they reached the village, Luffy could already smell Koala's scent, remembering it from when they'd first met, and Sabo could hear the girl in the bar, talking to Makino. The group headed to the bar at a slow pace, every step reminding them that they were growing closer to another farewell. Walking into the party bar, Koala was sitting at the bar as expected, drinking from a glass as she and Makino had a chat, both women smiling as they did. "Oh, you're back. I was just getting myself acquainted with your friend here," Makino said, gesturing to Koala as she noticed the group's return. "Finally, I was beginning to think you were going to ditch," Koala told Sabo with a smile, though Luffy could feel that the woman was only joking. "Wouldn't dream of it," Sabo told the redhead with a smile of his own. "It's a bit of a journey where we're going, so whenever you're ready we can get going," Koala told him, knowing that her new coworker was going to have some goodbyes to give. Sabo nodded, and Makino sighed, smiling with a sadder look on her face now. "Now I don't know much about the Revolutionaries, but you better write when you can. I don't want you thinking you can get out of keeping me updated on how things are going with you," Makino told the blonde, coming out from behind the bar as she hugged Sabo. "Of course, I'll make sure to do that, Makino," Sabo told the woman, knowing he would whenever possible. When he'd first come here, he didn't even know if Makino would remember him, but knowing now that she had and that he'd worried her, he'd make sure to not do that again if he could help it. "Better knock out some doctors for me," Ace told Sabo as he hugged him next, Sabo nodding in agreement. "That's the plan," Sabo told him, next moving to Luffy who wrapped his rubbery arms around him multiple times. "Have lots of adventures so you can tell me about them," Luffy chirped with a smile, Sabo laughing as he allowed the boy to nearly squeeze him to death. When he was finally let go, he took in a deep breath, ruffling Luffy's hair. "You too, Luffy, you better tell me all about whatever it is you're going to get up to," Sabo said, already knowing that his brother was going to have some crazy stories. "Try and keep Ace from getting himself killed," Sabo told Marco, Ace shouting out in indignation while Luffy and Marco laughed. With him, it's a full-time job, yoi, Marco said with a sigh as if he was already exhausted at the thought, but he was still smiling. With that, the farewells were over, and everyone in the bar began heading out into the docks. With Sabo leaving, Marco and Ace were going to be leaving as well, and seeing as Luffy's birthday was another day away, he would be staying the night on the island and leaving tomorrow. They all watched as Sabo and Koala boarded a small ship, waving to them as they set off and left them. They watched them for a minute longer before Ace and Marco began their goodbyes, starting with Makino and then moving to Luffy. Goodbyes were done in much the same way as they were with Sabo, making promises to see each other again and telling each other to stay safe, and when they were finished, Ace grabbed the chest from Marco, handing it to Luffy. Seeing as Sabo and I don't need this money for a ship of our own, you can have it, Lou. Ace told him with a smile. Before they'd left, many of the Whitebeards had offered to give Luffy money for whatever he'd need, but Luffy had turned them all down, telling them that he was going to do things his own way and without help. Marco had managed to convince him to take his allowance, arguing that the boy had earned it fair and square through chores and it was rightfully his money, but other than that, he turned all other offers for money down. Now, Luffy frowned at the box for a moment before conceding and taking it, smiling to Ace as he did. Then Luffy was watching the two board the mini Moby without him or Sabo to go with them. He and Makino stood at the docks, waving to them until their arms were sore before finally stopping. "Are you leaving today as well, Luffy?" Makino asked the boy, smiling gently to him despite the sadness Luffy could feel in her. He shook his head, smiling back to her. "I'm leaving tomorrow, on my 17th birthday," he told her, and the barmaid's smile widened, Luffy feeling a happiness light up within her. "In that case, you're staying with me for the night," she told him, and the two of them began heading back to Party's bar. That night, Luffy did stay with Makino, and when the next morning came he was filled with even more excitement than the day before. Getting up and ready for the day he grabbed his bag, checking it to make sure everything was still in there. The chest of treasure from Ace sat on top of everything else, and he smiled at it, opening it slightly and smiling wider at the glimpse of red from the sake cups that he could see. Closing both the chest and the bag, he slung it over his shoulder and left the room, heading downstairs to the bar where he could smell both Makino and something sweet. "Happy birthday, Luffy." Makino's voice was full of joy as she presented a small cake with candles on it to the boy. Luffy smiled widely at it, blowing the candles out, and Makino laughed, putting it down and grabbing a knife to slice it, plates and forks already ready. "I was beginning to wonder if I should wake you. Thomas, do you remember him? He's the fisherman that lives in the house closest to the docks," Makino said, Luffy going to sit at the bar as she spoke. He always gave me fish," Luffy said, remembering the man vaguely. "That's right, well, he heard today was your birthday and knew you wanted to set sail today, so he offered up one of his older rowboats. It's not much, enough for just 2 people, maybe 3 if you try hard enough," Makino said as she cut a slice of cake for herself, giving the rest to Luffy. "Thanks, Makino," Luffy said as he dug into the cake. He hadn't exactly thought about how he was going to leave the island, so it was good to know that was no longer an issue. It was also nice that the boat itself wasn't extravagant or anything, just a simple rowboat. "It was no problem. I had a barrel of apples and water put on the ship as well because as much as you don't want any help, I just couldn't let you sail off without food or water," Makino told him, watching with a smile as Luffy finished his cake in the time it took for her to get halfway through ate you breakfast too. "You're not leaving on an empty stomach," she added, Luffy realizing he could smell the cooked food, not having noticed earlier. "Yosh, food, and then I'll leave," he said with determination, Makino giggling again as she left to get the food. Luffy looked around the bar as he waited, taking in everything he could. It looked the same as he remembered it, and it seemed like so long ago that he and Shanks' crew were sitting in this very bar. Luffy accidentally eating the gum fruit and getting his devil fruit powers. He didn't have long to think on it though when Makino was returning, steaming food in hand, and he was chowing down yet again. Luffy and Makino had small conversations as they ate together peacefully, but once it was gone, the two headed to the docks. A few of the villagers were out, and once they noticed Luffy they smiled, waving to him and saying their good mornings to him. Luffy could feel that the suspicion the villagers had felt yesterday was gone, and now all they were feeling was happiness to see Luffy again. When the two reached the small boat Makino had mentioned earlier, Luffy smiled, hands on his hips as he took in the sight. His first boat and soon, the beginning of his new adventure. A hug to Makino and another promise to meet again. Luffy got on the boat, setting sail almost the second he had both feet in the boat. "See you again, Luffy," Makino called as he drifted out. Luffy waved back, laughing gleefully as he did. First it was Sabo, then Ace, and now me. We're all going on our own adventures now, but I'm gonna become the king of the pirates, Luffy told himself in determination. The docks growing further away. Only a few seconds later, there was a shaking and a giant sea king was rising from the water, but Luffy was undeterred, having faced much larger ones in the new world. Jumping up, a quick gum pistol took the creature down, and he laughed some more, watching the stunned lord of the coast fall back into the water. and thus commenced his newest adventure.